In moments of despair or suffering, people turn to the gods for help. In these moments, they will seek deities that are most familiar to them in hopes of their own salvation. Thus, a young man was kneeling and restrained by golden squares, awaiting his judgment for the crime he had committed. Suddenly, the same young man finds himself with his eyes closed, sleeping on a grassy field. Then he slowly wakes up. He was lying in a flowered field with the scenery conveying a desolate and mournful feeling. The protagonist stands up and questions the state of his existence. Upon saying the word system, a window appears before him. His stats were forcibly downgraded and his divinity removed, but he had not gone insane. Then he notices something approaching. It was a boat with two people on board, sailing through the dense fog. On it was someone wearing a top hat carrying a huge scroll on his back. As they approached, the mysterious figure reveals the names of the protagonist's parents and his place of birth. Even hearing his personal data being revealed, he only observes it with indifference. Apparently, Li Changxian was a star who defeated thousands of gods only to be captured and executed afterward. The man in the top hat tries to reaffirm whether he was truly the twilight of the gods, but starts to grow impatient at the lack of response. Suddenly, the protagonist lunges at the mysterious figure. Then he extends his hand. Seeing his throat in danger, the figure quickly retreats and is forced to jump from his boat. While in midair, he prepares his sword to counterattack. Changxian stretches out his hand again as if trying to unleash some power, but he remembers that he had lost his divine powers. So he pulls his arm back, this time preparing his fist to strike. When the two blows collided, a powerful roar reverberated everywhere. The shockwave rippled through the scenery, dissolving the water into 1,000 floating pearls that intertwined with the petals of the white flowers. The mysterious figure couldn't believe he still possessed such destructive power and began to sweat coldly. However, Changxian hadn't even started yet. Both fighters clashed in midair, and with each deflected blow, sparks erupted like lightning trailing behind. Cornered, the man in the top hat had to do something to survive. With a precise movement of his sword, he sliced the water and lifted it into a colossal wave, obscuring his opponent's vision. Managing to gain some space to breathe, the mysterious figure returns to his boat, but he still kept a vigilant gaze, knowing the danger hadn't passed. The droplets of water fell slowly, revealing a demonic Changxian. Wiping his face, he seemed displeased with that water trick. Walking slowly, the protagonist got closer and closer to his opponent. His murderous intent made the air tremble in terror. Suddenly, golden cubes appear in rows. Those geometric figures surrounded the protagonist, making him apprehensive. The divine metal capable of restraining any god now shackled Li Changxian. The protagonist had been careless, thinking those shackles had disappeared after he appeared in that desolate place. Then the mysterious figure introduces himself as Yule, the greatest reaper of the underworld. They were in the world of the afterlife, specifically on the river that crosses the dead, named Styx. Changxian doesn't understand how he still existed, since a god who received divine punishment was destined to disappear completely. The man in the top hat reveals that he was originally under the jurisdiction of the underworld, which is why he was still breathing at that moment. He then promises to tell more details along the way as they go to meet the one responsible for saving him. The protagonist hesitates to accept this strange proposal, but it doesn't seem like he has much choice. While traveling down the river, the Reaper reveals that Changxian's home planet was completely different from Arcadia. An entire human life story was defined from beginning to end in the Book of Life and Death, and this record could only be used in the place where it was written. Changxian continued to listen to this in silence. The man in the top hat reveals that one of these writings was lost, and they searched tirelessly for it, only to find it in Arcadia. It was the protagonist who since then had only brought destruction and chaos to the home of the divine, making it difficult to bring him back intact. Memories of countless battles and wars pass silently through the mind of the one who is the twilight of the gods. Then he remembers when the skies opened over his homeland. The night was split, seemingly inviting him to a new world. That supernatural vision completely changed his life, swallowing his past and completely shaping his destiny. Coming back to himself, Changxian wanted to know the reason for bringing him back to life. Yule responds that it was a decision made by his superiors. By Thanatos himself, the chief of Tartarus and Erebus, also called the king of the underworld. Then they arrive in a port with numerous souls lined up on a long staircase, waiting for their turn to come. A golden aura reminiscent of a star surrounds Yule, and the Reaper asks Changxian to follow him closely. Then the duo flies into the sky like a living shooting star. They fly over the first hell, named the Burning Penalty. Then the second, the Freezing Punishment. Continuing the journey, they spot beings with monstrous appearances, imprisoned by golden objects. Changxian wonders what those were. Yule reveals that those monsters were battle gods who became abominable gods. The Reaper notices the protagonist's interest in those beings. He then explains that they are called fallen stars, and one of Thanatos' jobs is to punish gods and evil spirits. Changxian did not know that. Yule hints that no one goes around talking about this since it would damage the reputation of the heavens. Finally, they pass by the lighter sinners, sentenced to manual labor. Then the falling light lands at an imposing black castle that seemed to rise infinitely when seen up close. Both stop in front of a giant door. Yule introduces himself and says he has completed the escort of the Twilight of the Gods. The massive entrance opens as a powerful gust of wind blows out from within. A deep and sinister voice arises asking them to enter. Instinctively, Changxian stiffens his body as if preparing to face terrible danger. The darkness inside the castle twists and transforms into a pair of predatory eyes watching attentively. Even with nervousness coursing through his veins, the protagonist smiles. It seems things are about to get heated from here on. Changxian finds himself facing a man in long red robes sitting on his throne. He stares, waiting for the scarlet figure to say something. Finally speaking, Thanatos asks if he was truly the Twilight of the Gods. But first, he wants to know if the protagonist knew where he would have gone had he died on Earth. Shrugging, he replies that he never thought about it. It would be hell, says the god. Upon hearing this, Changxian asks why. With a sarcastic smile, Thanatos begins mentioning June 2, 2024. Back in his days as a professional gamer, he raged at a teammate, leaving the guy crying. The Twilight of the Gods is left speechless by this accusation. Yule reveals the punishment for this kind of crime: to endure beyond the limits of his tongue's resistance for 15 days. He abandoned his broken-hearted friend just to keep playing his little League of Legends. Sentence: the hell of a mountain of knives. He killed an ant and blamed the dog for something he himself had done. Penalties: 4 days with venomous snakes and 10 days with a tormented tongue. Now for the worst crime, he went 26 years of his life without holding a girl's hand. 6 days in the hell of darkness. All these accusations deeply offend our not-so-hero, and he screams, asking what the hell they were talking about. Yule looks at him disappointed. Thanatos merely gives a sly grin. The god reveals it was just a joke. Changxian lives an ordinary life as a human, but an extraordinary one in Arcadia. With a snap, a scroll opens before the scarlet figure. In it, we can see the life story of the protagonist, from his normal life as a mortal to his new destiny as a god. Still irritated, the Twilight of the Gods wants to know the reason for still being alive. This time, Thanatos hides his face and does not show his usual smile. He reveals that there is a job to be done. Certain gods have broken the oath and are trying to manipulate humans. The task is to seal him. Changxian smiles discreetly and asks if he will reincarnate. The Lord of the Underworld corrects him, responding that he will only be placed where he was meant to be from the beginning. Then, as if opening curtains with a quick hand motion, the scenery begins to change. The image of countless planets and stars fills the environment. It looked like the very universe had been summoned into the room. The protagonist merely observes it, motionless without emotion. But something sparks a flame of emotion within him. It was the planet Earth. Thanatos is surprised by the reaction of the Twilight of the Gods, thinking his heart was as unmoving as stone. Changxian sincerely says that this was his home. But the god warns him that he will show something that will leave him breathless. The protagonist is startled by this statement. Then the vision zooms in on the image of the blue planet. Now we can see the Korean peninsula. This time the image zooms in on a city. We get even closer to a street. A man carrying a bottle of alcohol was walking across the crosswalk. It was Changxian walking like a beggar. The protagonist cannot believe what he has just seen. He looks down, not wanting to believe what he saw. That was himself from a very distant past in his life. Thanatos reveals that he will return him to his original time before becoming the Twilight of the Gods. Then he gives him his true sentence to seal the gods who broke the oath. Even with all of this, Changxian still does not understand why he was chosen for this job. Because he was a good hunter, reveals the god. A good hunter to hunt some targets named Ohura, Daiba, Chen, and others. After all, that portal that suddenly appeared and took him from Earth was not made by accident. Changxian connects the dots and suspects that someone is coveting his home planet. And they are doing this by approaching slowly, Thanatos adds. To do this, they are using loopholes in the oath. They cannot directly interfere in the lives of humanity, but humans can. This is the flaw in that treaty. Feeling like a hunting dog, Changxian asks if he would be sacrificed after being a good boy. Thanatos replies that it would only be a penal job done and then a new life. The Twilight of the Gods likes what he heard, but he still suspects their intentions. Sensing doubt in his dog, the god of the underworld proposes a deal. Sending him on a dangerous mission with nothing would be reckless, so he offers a reward for a job well done. Changxian wants to know what that is about. Authority. Upon hearing that, he couldn't believe how extreme the proposal was. Giving this kind of power to a criminal is a violation of the oath in itself. Thanatos assures him that it's fine if it is treated as a relationship between a king and his vassal. Changxian smiles upon receiving a proposal with an irresistible reward. With the deal sealed, the god of the underworld opens a long scroll and announces the beginning of the regression. The castle gate opens behind the protagonist as Thanatos orders the gates of rebirth to be opened. Changxian smiles as the castle gate opens behind him. A new future awaited and a new life was about to begin. Yule and the protagonist were traveling on the boat along the river of the underworld. The man in the top hat reminds him that he will return to Earth, not as a god, but as a normal human. The Twilight of the Gods does not seem shaken. On the contrary, he smiles, motivated. Then the Reaper warns him that the true divine metal will still be bound to his spirit and can suppress him at any moment. The duo approaches a huge gate floating in the air. It had a yin-yang symbol painted in the middle, and its golden color was as pure as the seed of a new beginning. Without wasting time, Li Changxian jumps from the boat toward his new life. Standing on a rock, the gate starts to open, releasing a strong light. But before leaving, he gives a defiant smile and promises promises to meet Yule again. The man in the top hat replies that he eagerly awaits that day, but he also wants to give him one last warning. Before he can finish, the protagonist is already diving headfirst into his new life. Even so, he manages to say that he is an envoy borrowing the power of the god of the underworld. Right after, Chang Xian is floating in midair as the gate disappears. Then windows appear announcing that he had passed through the reincarnation portal successfully. The protagonist has a serene expression on his face as if awaiting his new future with pleasure. He closes his eyes, falling into a deep sleep. Now he held the position of administrator. Then he suddenly wakes up on the grass. He was finally on planet Earth. He finds himself in a forest and is surrounded by several people who seemed lost. The protagonist realizes that he has received an achievement for reincarnating, gaining 5 more attribute points and memories of his past life. The group of individuals are frightened by having been swallowed by a portal so suddenly. Chang Xian investigates his surroundings and realizes that those people were Koreans. The protagonist's heart fills with nostalgia for finally returning to his home planet. But of course, he still had work to do. So he gets up. He analyzes his location. He was in the middle of a clearing between the trees of a huge forest surrounded by mountains that didn't seem to have formed naturally. At that moment, he remembers something the god of the underworld had asked. The place where the protagonist would awaken would not be exactly on Earth. Thanatos revealed that this would be necessary to avoid the watchful eyes of the other gods. So he would send Chang Xian into a random dungeon break. Returning to the present, the people trapped there begin to cry out in despair and anguish due to the lack of Wi-Fi. The system reveals that they were in the benevolent forest, and the current number of participants was 431. However, with the addition of the protagonist, that number changes to 432. For each participant, a mission was given according to their combat power level. The group looks at a large mountain. The quest consisted of destroying monsters and climbing to the top of it. Everyone present received an inventory and the ability to use information windows. With the first session open, Chang Xian wastes no time and runs to area 220. The other participants are startled to see a reckless lunatic running like that and warn him that the situation was dangerous. The speedster doesn't care, continuing his run deep into the forest. The group wonders who that careless marathon runner was. Some even found him familiar. But a girl with an emote hairpin seems to recognize him, calling him Tyrant. Now amidst the vegetation, Chang Xian was running, gasping for air. It seems he still wasn't used to being a mere mortal. Because of that, he activates the system to check the current state of his body. His stats were marked with question marks, leaving our hero disoriented. Then a message announcing the addition of the Soul Collector Authority appears. It's capable of burning and absorbing spirits. Other effects were an EXP boost, healing, and the ability to summon the ghosts of captured enemies. The other authority added was the Executioner's Sword, capable of stealing or sealing the powers of deities who broke the oath. This was a powerful ability. There were no limits to how many authorities someone could obtain. Chang Xian is happy to see that the deal was faithfully honored. He acknowledges that the god of the underworld did quite a job making all of this possible. However, there are some problems with using the Executioner's Sword. The Executioner's Sword authority was much more powerful than the Soul Collector, but its main issue was the conditions to activate it. The target must be a god who broke the oath. In the protagonist's current condition, fighting a true deity is asking too much. Suddenly, something approaches, putting Chang Xian on guard. The wet, viscous breathing of a beast breaks the calm of nature. From the shadows, a serpent emerges. It's the Black Mamba. The beast opens its mouth, showing rows of fangs gleaming under a rotten light and revealing a repulsive tongue, red like blood. The protagonist pulls a rusty short sword from his inventory and starts his attack. Just like a chef fillets a fish with mastery, Li Changxian pierces the monster with his small blade. The serpent collapses to the ground, and the tyrant simply smiles without looking back like a cool guy who never looks at explosions. After getting his first kill, the system notifies him that he has acquired new skills, leveled up, and that a hunter constellation has taken an interest in him. Satisfied with his achievements, the protagonist has a confident expression and intends to become the most powerful newbie of all. The appearance of a dungeon was considered a type of large-scale disaster, but also a means to gain a new life. However, it was also a selective method for gods and constellations to choose new envoys to spread their words, or to choose an apostle to carry out their will in the world. That's why people entered dungeons seeking divine aid. But most were sacrificed by the negligence of the gods, who reserved their attention for only a tiny fraction of humanity. There was a very efficient way to be noticed by the heavens. It was to have great hidden potential. After a constellation became interested in Chang Xian, he feels like his butt is turned toward the moon. The deity called Good Hunting Season was another name for the goddess Pablsag. This deity is the daughter of Tiamat, the primordial evil dragon. The tyrant looks at his rusty knife. It seems that his dagger techniques attracted the attention of the hunting deity. Right after, he starts showing off his martial movements with his weapon to entertain his new divine stalker. Then he says to her that this is just the beginning. Suddenly, a strange greenish odor passes in front of Chang Xian's nose. Apparently, the dungeon's theme was focused on monsters and poisonous creatures. With his hand on his chin, he plans which strategy he use. But he is suddenly attacked by 2 black mambas. So he decides on plan C, becoming a snake hunting specialist. With a jump, he defeats the frontline monster. As he gains experience points, the ambition for battles ignites in his heart. With a clean strike, he slays another enemy, growing the power that burns inside him with each level surpassed. He prepares another attack, his steel burning with fury. With eyes tracing the next target, his focus as sharp as a blade. The serpent dissolves in a single gesture. The metallic edge was driven with deadly precision, spilling the monster's life onto the ground. But there is no relief or pause. New creatures roar in waves of wrath, surrounding Chang Xian and ending his brief respite. The small blade moves lightly and precisely, tearing through obstacles in a deadly dance. The sound of fallen beasts weaves a victorious orchestra. After defeating several monsters, Chang Xian looks for more. Now the snakes were pissing themselves in fear just from seeing the presence of the tyrant, considering him a natural enemy. However, the protagonist was still not satisfied. Then he captures some skills, earning the title of Black Mamba Hunter along with its rewards. The sensation of taking the fate of a monster, acquiring new powers through skills, and the adrenaline of battle gave meaning to his life. Even the fear he felt when fighting gods in Arcadia was just an extra spice on his plate. That's why losing all that feeling when receiving divine punishment caused him colossal outrage. He was accused of bringing harm to the world, but the reality was different. There was fear, the fear of a mere mortal being capable of standing above the gods. In the beginning, he had no intention of being something greater than the heavens themselves, but now it was personal. He would seek power to drive those accusers from their thrones and humiliate them with his new strength. Chang Xian bathed in the remains of the Black Mambas, while a pool of chaos surrounded him like a throne forged in war. The show wasn't over yet. Wanting to show even more to Pablsag, he prepares his authority. Activating the Soul Collector, the life essence of the serpents starts flowing toward the protagonist. It gathers in his hand and coils around his body. This way, he recovers 5% of his vitality and acquires the ashes of the Black Mambas. Finally recovered, Chang Xian smiled like a child who just found out that dinner was chocolate cake. Then he runs, annihilating the monstrous obstacles in his path. Seeing the strange ability of the protagonist, the goddess couldn't recognize his skill system. He was confident that Pablsag had no way of discovering how a rookie had received the authority of the king of the underworld. Furthermore, he also believed that she wouldn't be bold enough to violate the principle of causality. Holding his small rusty blade, Chang Xian was gasping after almost putting a monster on the extinction list. Then more Black Mambas started gathering around him. The underworld's data protection was strong enough that he didn't worry about his information being exposed, thinks the protagonist. Defeating the last remaining black serpents, the tyrant opens his status window to admire his progress. With new attribute points and achievements earned, he smiles greedily on seeing that Pablsag was even more interested in him now. Now that he had wiped out an entire species of living creatures, it was time to plan how to hunt the boss of these snakes. After dealing with so many poisonous beings, he gained resistance to poison, though still weak. This fact would help him against the Blood Mamba, the strongest level of this type of serpent. A monster that no participant below level 10 would face head-on nor alone, but Chang Xian wanted to solo this disaster. It was a risky tactic, but one that would be worth it to attract the attention of the gods. However, the most important thing was the venomous fang of this monster, a means to obtain immunity to poison. The main cause of the defeat of the Twilight of the Gods was the use of curses and toxins that severely weakened him. Remembering that, he channels his rage, gripping the dagger handle tightly, determined to overcome the curse of Gaia. Suddenly, the blade shatters. That grip was the final blow to the durability of that weapon. That rusty knife actually lasted quite a while. Then something shines in the sky. This time, a dagger with a legendary appearance and fine craftsmanship lands at the protagonist's feet. The steel of the blade seemed to be of excellent quality and certainly wasn't a beginner's item. The weapon had a scarlet scale pattern on its handle. In other words, a weapon of time herself. Soon after, a wager is proposed to Chang Xian, the failure of which would mean the end of his regression. Even being treated as an object of entertainment, Chang Xian is not intimidated by the challenge, putting his own life on the line. Complaining in his mind about how picky the gods were with their games, he picks up the dagger that had just been sent from the heavens. Now he was a more experienced person and knew how to get a good profit from this situation. Testing the handling of the blade in the air, the tyrant was already cubbing the weapon even without testing it in combat. Thus, he accepts the risky wager and asks what he should do. Meanwhile, in the safe zone that Chang Xian had left behind, someone was shouting for people to gather. Hearing that, the group found it strange and thought little of the guy. Then he shows his credentials, revealing himself as Parcassium, and his document appeared to bear a military seal. He reveals that he is a second lieutenant of the Awakened Forces of National Defense and also a level C player. With an expression that conveyed discipline and order, the officer asked the participants to follow the instructions that would be given. The participants show relief at having someone more experienced with dungeons among them, but they still worry about the well-being of Chang Xian. While most of the group was questioning the protagonist's rush, a young man in a blue jacket was listening to the conversation. He responds that his motivation wasn't money, revealing that the guy in a hurry was already rich. Then he continues explaining that he was the tyrant leader of the SD band. Apparently, Chang Xian was a spoiled rich kid who managed to succeed in life thanks to his good looks and acting in commercials. Someone in the group questions why someone so privileged would dive into such a dangerous zone. The guy in the blue jacket assumes it was an attempt to put an end to everything since our not-so-hero's life was a mess. Another guy in a red coat appears and asks his friend in blue to stop with a heavy topic. Then the system window pops up announcing the extermination of the Black Mambas. Everyone is shocked by the new information. The girl with the hairpin can't believe so many monsters had been defeated out of nowhere since no participant had left the safe zone. However, new monsters were being exterminated, leaving Haseong surprised. until the name Li Changsan appears, catching the officer's attention. The young man in blue can't understand how all this was possible. Then he tries to contain his frustration. Back to the carnage caused by the protagonist, he was collecting the souls of the defeated monsters. While delighting in the essences of his enemies, he receives the hunter certificate. The bet he had accepted was to defeat the Blood Mamba within 24 hours. The reward was the evil dragon's fang and the possibility of becoming an apostle. Changsan looks at his weapon with a certain disdain. Apparently, the reason for so much interest in him was something urgent. Then he remembers the conflict between Bel Marduk and Tiamat, assuming that was the problem. But that was even more motivation for him to continue the plan, expecting a huge profit from this investment. The dagger was a great reward. The weapon was made from Tiamat's tooth, but still had requirements to be fully usable. Changsan is pleased with his current achievements, but he still craved more. With that in mind, he plans to spice things up by adding more conditions to the bet, leaving the goddess confused. 30 minutes. He promises to eliminate the Blood Mamba in 30 minutes and demands an additional reward in exchange. A silence falls. The wind blows, breaking the monotony with a soft whistle. The deity was thinking. Then she accepts but warns that failure would result in a painful death. Changsan is undeterred and goes for his hunt. But he is interrupted by something appearing on the ground. It was a giant worm with a horrendous mouth and breath like a jaguar. The monster hides in the ground to prepare for its next attack. Changsan jumps at the exact moment the monstrous worm bursts from the ground to attack, dodging the danger with ease. He smiles as he feels the thrill of battle being injected into his chest, pumping blood like war drums in his body. The sharp tip of the blade approaches the worm's skin. Taking advantage of the beast's movement, the dagger runs fiercely across the monster's hide. Then he finishes his art with one last stroke drawn across the creature's body, as if the weapon were the brush and death, the paint. From the monster's remains, a repugnant composition forms, but with a dark and grotesque beauty. Suddenly, beings resembling pterodactyls appear, attacking the protagonist. However, that wasn't even enough to make him break a sweat. The tyrant flaunts his martial skills in a dance of destruction, making the gods tilt their heads toward him. Then it finally appeared, approaching from afar. The Blood Mamba itself. He was enjoying the way things were going. Now he had one more great opportunity to show off. While trying to approach the monster without being detected, more notification windows pop up announcing new spectators. Then he reaches level 10 and gets a new achievement for leveling up so quickly. Now he could choose a secret class. Thinking about which class to choose, he didn't want one that was mediocre and hard to evolve, nor one too rare to avoid gambling on luck. So he decides to pick the Berserker, a class that sacrifices sanity in exchange for raw power. Changsan was confident he could win the bet if his decision came true. Then a window suddenly opens, making him anxious to make his choice. The list appears, starting with standard classes like Swordsman and Lancer. However, the more Changsan scrolls down, the more it seems his luck has run out. The Berserker class was not available for selection. Realizing that RNG wasn't favorable to him, the tyrant starts to panic, and the time for the bet was running out. The Blood Mamba was on its silent hunt, with his eyes locked on the destiny of its prey as it exhaled a poisonous whisper, and Changsan was hiding like a rat fleeing from a dinosaur. He had made that bet because he was sure the Berserker class would be available. While the gods showed even more interest, the tyrant had little choice but to pick from the classes that were available. So he chooses Rune Guardian, even complaining that drawing runes was a pain. The transformation begins and intense light envelops Changsan. The numbers in his status constantly change and new types of attributes are added to his profile. Soon after, new rune drawing abilities are created and added. The class choice leaves the gods perplexed. Now the protagonist maintained 2 energy spheres floating in the air. These were the abilities of rune crafting and rune engraving. Finally, with the cards in hand, he can plan his assault. 4 minutes remain before the bet ends. 2 blue circles surround his arm, stretching as 30 points are added to intelligence. After that, another 25 points go into determination. But before he can make more preparations, a murderous gaze stares at the spot where he was hiding, making the protagonist tense. It was the Blood Mamba, hungry for its prey. Changsan tries to run as fast as he can. The serpent chases him, but the protagonist manages to dodge the charge. Now that he has space to breathe, he activates his rune creation ability. Over the silver blade, his palm slides, creating a silent pact between flesh and metal. The moment he cuts his finger, the red liquid blooms, dripping down his hand. The inner blade trembles with thirst as it feels the blood touch its steel. With his fingers dipped in the sanguine ink, he prepares to write his art. Upon the steel, his fingers trace ancient symbols. Each rune is a burning verb, each syllable a Dorn eruption waiting to be triggered. The dagger exudes a red, pulsing halo like the heart of war. Thus, the explosive rune was successfully engraved. Thanks to the well-allocated attributes, the skill's effect increases, making the explosion more powerful for 5 minutes. Even hungry for magical power consumption, he smiles like a sadist imagining his next masterpiece. Both combatants stare at each other on the stage of death, with only 3 minutes remaining until the bet ends. With a roar that tears through the silence of anticipation, Changsan screams with steel and will to find the little time he had left. Then a massive explosion occurs in the middle of the forest, causing a powerful rumble. The noise scares the participants who were still gathered in the safe zone. Ha-seong notices that there had been several explosions earlier, but this was the strongest so far. A black smoke slowly rises behind the enormous mountain. The unexpected situation leaves the group confused. Then a window pops up, notifying that Lee Chang-seon had started the raid on the boss. The people present are left with their jaws on the floor, learning that the boss fight had already started. The guy in the blue jacket can't believe how quickly things were escalating. He's still angry at Chang-seon's irresponsibility for poking the hornet's nest with a short stick. He even reveals that during online matches, the tyrant behaved the same recklessly as now. Then he calls Ha-seong's attention, demanding that he do something. Getting no response, he begs even more. The officer ignores him, then just asks him not to leave the safe zone. He further argues that he wouldn't survive if the formation broke. The guy in the blue jacket goes silent, realizing there was nothing to be done. But something stirs in the soldier's mind, as if witnessing something out of the ordinary. Observing the sparks that look like stars coming from the smoke, Ha-seong reveals that it was the sign of a critical hit. Among the vast black clouds of destruction, countless lights shine like a constellation in the belly of chaos. Realizing that Chang-seon was on another level of power, the officer decides to entrust his fate into his hands. Even unable to understand the phenomenon, the soldier stares at the chaos, beholding it as if it were a starry night. The dense smoke still hid a deadly battle that was not yet over. The tyrant was still fighting the Scarlet Serpent with all the vigor he possessed. His eyes displayed absolute focus, overwhelming determination, and a demonic thirst for battle. Another explosion occurs, dissipating even more of the forest's pure greenery. A sinister silence settles. The stillness is marked by the dense mist caused by the intense battle. Then a window pops up announcing the defeat of the Blood Mamba, leaving everyone relieved. Especially Ha-seong, who no longer had to worry about his responsibility as a player and soldier. Now we see Chang-seon, standing tall amid the destruction he had caused. His back seemed far too big for this small world. The Blood Mamba appeared with the elegance of a nightmare on parade, ready to strike the group of participants. The guy in the blue jacket freezes like a scared goat that just saw a jaguar with a knife and fork. The enormous creature charges fiercely at those poor side characters forgotten by the screenwriter. The frozen guy finally moves, ready to become a disposable extra in a horror movie. But hold on, folks, the beast hadn't been alive for quite some time and was thrown to the ground like last month's garbage bag. Then Chang-seon finally appears, completely unharmed and victorious. Ha-seong is surprised by something when he sees the protagonist. His gaze was different from that of a normal person. Then the soldier introduces himself as a player to the tyrant. Chang-seon reveals that the boss has already been defeated and orders them to eliminate the remaining small fry. Ha-seong offers a place for the protagonist to rest, but he refuses the offer, deciding to rest alone while dragging the Blood Mamba's remains with him. The participants wonder if Chang-seon was really the so-called tyrant and even accuse him of being a demon, but they dismiss the possibility of him being evil. The guy in the blue jacket was distant from the conversation but overheard it, and he becomes furious. Turning our attention back to the protagonist, he was reflecting on what the previous group said about him. Being called a demon wasn't something strange to him, whether in Arcadia or on Earth, it didn't matter. After a window announces a break in the dungeon, Chang-seon carries the serpent to a place far from the safe zone. He embeds an obstruction rune into a nearby rock. Then a square barrier rises from the ground, surrounding the protagonist and the monster's body. He intends to organize his rewards without being disturbed. There were 4 categories of prizes for completed quests and bets, but since he was already satisfied with Tiamat's Fang, he decides to take conquest points, gaining 15,000 karma points. Chang-seon wanted to use this karma to do some shopping later when the shop became available. After all, money is power. Now wanting to check his status, he activates the system window. Realizing he came out on top with several attribute points and new skills, it was definitely worth soloing the Blood Mamba. Then the protagonist notices several windows from the gods showing interest in him, especially from Pablsag. The goddess even intimidates the other deities not to touch her new chosen one. Chang-seon chuckles at the scene. Then Tiamat's daughter offers a list of rewards from the draconic records to pay the bet. Seeing how extremely valuable the options were, the protagonist wonders if it would be worth becoming her lapdog, and he decides to choose nothing, leaving the spectator gods perplexed. Then he receives 1 million karma points instead of the prizes. It seems this was Chang-seon's main plan. Now Pablsag offers him a seat as her apostle. The tyrant refuses the offer and receives another 1 million points instead, smiling greedily, making a divine bet seem more profitable than running a Bitcoin pyramid scheme. The goddess feels incredibly offended by his choices, clearly expressing her anger. For Chang-seon, this wasn't a problem, especially when several notifications start ringing. In front of him, several windows open showing the interest of various gods, securing plenty of support on his side. He also remembers the rumors of the battle against Bel-Marduk. If they are true, more gods on Tiamat's side would seek him out. Pablsag turns her face with her chin raised, offended. The image of an important goddess all pouty is comedy for Chang-seon. Everything was going according to plan, now it's time to move on to the next step. Grabbing his dagger, he prepares to finish his task, harvesting the most important parts of the Black Mamba. While doing this, several gods showed interest in his future, watching very closely. Now we are back with a group of participants standing in the safe zone. The guy in the blue jacket was sitting next to his friend, resting and letting time pass. He thinks he could do this too. Becoming a player, that is. His friend stands up with wide eyes in disbelief at what he just heard, still calling him a lunatic who escaped from a horror circus. But the eyes of the guy in the blue jacket were intensely focused, obsessed with the idea that this place could awaken talent. Then he asks a god to observe him. Suddenly, a window reveals that the owl that pierces the twilight had taken an interest in John Chumja. It seems his friend didn't know about the fact that the guy in the jacket had already taken an awakening test. But before anything else could be said, something bright like the sun appeared in the sky. An administrator was coming. Then a beam of light descends from above, hitting some people upon landing. Amidst the smoke and debris, the silhouette of a humanoid rabbit wearing a hat stood upright. The entity introduces itself as Harold, the administrator of the entire Korean channel. The bunny-shaped person introduces itself to the group of participants. And to finish his greetings, lets out an innocent chuckle. Still cheerful, out of nowhere, he starts playing around with his watch. Some people find it strange for an administrator to appear so suddenly. While cleaning his beloved time marker, Harold apologizes for interrupting their rest. Then he continues and explains that he has something extremely important that needs to be told to everyone. Ha-seong seems to have a terrible feeling about this. Harold proudly says that normally administrators do not interfere with sweet beings like humans due to established policies. All panicked, the bunny reveals that there has been an increase in the transmission rate in the dungeon, irritating upper management. So he has no other choice but to raise the level of this game to a higher degree of difficulty. No one likes hearing that. Harold raises his graceful arm high and with a sharp snap of his fingers, announces his will. The safe zone marker cracks and shatters completely. Windows announce a massive increase in difficulty and the monsters receive upgrades. Despair starts to spread among the people. Even though distressed, Ha-seong looks at it without much surprise. It seems he has experienced something like this before, calling it filtration. Then we see him with a face full of bandages and despair filling his eyes. People were lying on the ground without consciousness and without any will to live. A mountain of bodies in a dark, blood-soaked cave looking like the insides of a beast was before Ha-seong. This was a memory of another dungeon where filtration happened, where the gods tried to discover someone exceptional. It seems that once again he will be forced to watch people being slaughtered like cattle, also that a deity can choose the best cut. But he knew the reason for this. The gods were not interested in that pile of ordinary people. They wanted to test Lee Chang-seon as much as possible. Windows announced that the mission is to gather 99 fire crystals to proceed to the second stage, and in 5 seconds the monster wave will begin. Harold spots Ha-seong in the middle of the crowd. With 4 seconds left, the officer asks how the bunny knows him. With 3 seconds left, the administrator reveals that the administrative office is also interested in him. With 2 seconds left, Harold says he is really looking forward to his performance. With 1 second left and no seconds remaining, the bunny disappears completely. Barely a minute passes and someone starts screaming. A pack of monstrous wolves was chasing people. Everyone panics, some run while others freeze holding their weapons. But Chunja was the only one advancing without fear. His eyes emitted a red aura and his smile showed determination. The owl that pierces the twilight announces its blessings for him, but the deity's window was ominously glitching. Back with Chang-seon, he had already removed the venomous fang of the red mamba. He feels extremely happy for obtaining one of the conditions to gain poison immunity. Suddenly, several windows appear announcing the beginning of the second stage. The protagonist finds it strange since it was too early. Then he concludes that filtration had begun. He thought he would have more time to enjoy his spoils, so he puts the venomous fang in his pocket. Then he opens his status window. His HP and MP were low, but it was still manageable. The problem was his stamina, which was already at rock bottom. Even wanting to rest a little more, he had no time to waste and starts running with his dagger in hand. Suddenly, a huge flaming reptilian being appears at his side. Because of that, Chang-seon starts thinking about the stages of this dungeon. If the first was biotoxin, then the current phase is poisonous fire. Suddenly, the flaming monster starts turning, trying to corner the protagonist. With that in mind, it was easy to conclude that the next phases would use toxic elemental themes. Facing the reptile, the tyrant already knew what he needed to do to beat this stage. The fire lizard exhales a fiery roar toward Chang-seon. He slides around the curve of the attack, raises his dagger and summons the power of flames into his blade. In an incandescent slash, he tears through the side of the beast. The cut ignites the flesh of the obstacle and an enraged scream makes the body writhe. But that wasn't enough to bring it down. It rises as living embers and lashes the air with its flaming tail. Chang-seon, light as a shadow, spins in the air and dodges the attack. Without hesitation, the creature spits a wall of flames. The protagonist charges forward through that hell, slashing the fire in his path. With his blade, he slices the scaly leather of the beast, tracing a long, luminous cut like a thread of dawn. When Chang-seon raises his arm, concluding the lethal dance, an eruption of flames bursts from the wound. Then the monster's head suddenly drops and the beast collapses to the ground. The protagonist stands upright on the monster's body, victorious. But his concern was with his stamina, which was still at a very low level, forcing him to conserve his movements. Placing his own hand over the opening in the creature's skin, Chang Xian tried to grab something, and from there he pulls out the fire crystal. Then he opens his mouth wide. Upon swallowing the sphere, he gains weak fire resistance and 20,000 points of flame energy. As if his stomach couldn't handle so much heat, he burps out a good amount of flames to free up more space in his belly. Now he needs to hunt more crystals to meet the second condition for obtaining poison immunity. With a greedy look, he plans to ignite the embers of the 8 trigrams urn. Then he finds a group of fire lizards waiting to be consumed like firewood for a furnace. Poison immunity, one of the unique abilities of Antares, the scorpion of the 12 zodiacs. With it, he becomes immune to all kinds of toxins and is also able to recreate toxic agents with his blood. The Twilight of the Gods had the necessary power to defeat the Zodiac, but had forgotten an important detail. Having no defense against the curse of Gaia, his divine stats were weakened, and in the end, he was defeated. Luckily, he wasn't extinguished and ended up in the underworld. There, Thanatos offered him a path to learn the secret arts of the falling stars. This knowledge would be important for Chang Xian to defeat the 12 zodiacs, as well as help him in other ways during his mission. The god of the underworld opened his cloak, and within it, we could see something resembling outer space emerging from his arm. Then we see a group of hooded individuals with only one having his face uncovered, standing in front of them all. They were the falling stars, nicknamed the 10 Elders by the protagonist. Each of them offers a technique to Chang Xian. The first was the shortcut to obtain poison immunity. Apparently, the one who kept his face revealed was a father thirsty for revenge, seeking justice for the death of his daughter. Since he was the first to teach him a new ability, the Twilight of the Gods nicknamed him the First Elder. Back to the present, Chang Xian was swallowing some fire crystals. Belching a flame upwards, several bodies of red-colored lizards were piled up behind him. Unfortunately, this level of flame wasn't even enough to ignite the conditions for an ember in the urn. So he runs, searching for the monster's lair, wanting to feast on higher quality prey. Meanwhile, Chunjae didn't seem to be having any problems. He easily defeats a fire lizard using a small dagger. He was still confident that he would surpass Chang Xian, a strangely obsessive confidence. Suddenly, a window catches his attention. It was the dungeon ranking showing the tyrant with 7,500 points. Then he is shocked to discover that he wasn't even close to the protagonist's score. Then the supposed constellation suggests he take a shortcut to become stronger, sparking a bit of hope in the desperate Chunjae. Meanwhile, Ha Xiao's group was panting and struggling. They looked at the ranking notification, starting to feel envious of how easily the crazy guy in the jacket and the drunk pro gamer were succeeding. The officer notices the emotional problem emerging within his team. After all, 2 people who previously seemed ordinary were now managing to defeat monstrosities with just their bare hands. Suddenly, Chunjae announces that he has a new ability, but his expression shows a sadistic and psychopathic spirit. With his face stained with blood, he offers a way for everyone to become a player and survive. Sometime later, at the entrance of a cave, a demonic goat with a flaming collar was running frantically. It was as if it was running from something very terrifying. Realizing there was nowhere else to escape, the monster faces its executioner one last time. It was Chang Xian who was chasing it. With a quick and explosive slash, the creature is swiftly slain. A fire crystal flies into the air. The protagonist grabs it without ceremony and puts it in his mouth as if it were candy. But before he could enjoy his spicy meal, a scream echoes from inside the cave. The girl with the hair clip and emote was running from a giant bear. The animal gets close enough to her to smell the scent of her tears. Before it can reach its victim, the creature is annihilated. Still with his battle face on, Chang Xian saves her at the last minute. The girl cries, afraid of the appearance of another monster. I mean, of the tyrant. After calming her down and explaining that he was one of the dungeon participants, he asks her where everyone is. Unable to hold back her tears, the girl reveals that everyone had already passed to the other world, and they were abandoned by someone named Jian Chunjia. Rolling up her sleeves, she shows a strange tattoo depicting an owl crying from one eye. Chang Xian reveals to the girl that she fell for a scam, and that was not a mark for sharing power, but a pact with the devil. The girl cries upon discovering that she sold her own soul without knowing. Then the protagonist continues, explaining that when a person with a seal dies, their vitality goes to the host and their spirit to the devil. In other words, Chunjae gets stronger by offering sacrifices. But something more important catches his attention. The mark was of excellent quality. Realizing that things were getting very serious and that it could be a demon surpassing the rank of king, he decides to slip away quietly, trying not to move too much and avoiding getting further involved with her. But the girl moves faster than hunger on market day, clings to her savior, and begs for help. Chang Xian finds all of this irritating, not wanting to be responsible for a rookie. The protagonist gives her a little push on the forehead with his index finger. Saving someone from a bear should already earn him some peaceful solitude. Acting like a shaman protagonist who was just rejected by the master, the girl is ready to even wash dirty underwear to become stronger. The tyrant stares at the girl, checking her determination. Noticing the resolve in her eyes, he wonders if she is doing this for revenge. Realizing that she wouldn't be accepted by any means, she makes her greatest sacrifice, offering him a chocolate bar. Chang Xian reconfirms with the girl if she is really willing to do anything. When she says yes, the protagonist decides to start by editing the mark. Meanwhile, Chunjae grows stronger with every sacrifice he receives. Intoxicated with power, he cannot hide the ecstasy of becoming even more powerful. His friend in red was worried and then tries to get his attention. With a cold, emotionless look, Chunjae asks what he wanted. Feeling the demonic aura crawling down his spine, the friend replies that it was nothing and decides to distance himself from him. Then he looks in terror at the red mark that seemed engraved into his flesh. The seal appeared to be limiting his movements, as if something was controlling his free will. Then someone arrives calling for Chunjae. It seems they have discovered the whereabouts of something. Realizing how his friend now controlled people like slaves and sacrifice pawns, the one in red feels like he's in a prison with no way out. Discovering the location of the dungeon boss, the group of people marked with the owl march toward their terrible fate. Wearing a terrifying and vengeful smile, Chunjae's mind focused on Changxian and only on Changshan. Changing scenes, the girl with the hair clip was running at full speed. As she left whirlwinds wherever she passed, several notifications appeared warning about the gods' growing interest in the dungeon. She runs and runs, leaving even more tornadoes in her wake. The skill Run of the Winds was active. Then she runs through a group of undead along the way. The captivation rune activates, affecting the rotting zombies. But before they can make any moves, several slashes are delivered to the backs of the creatures. It was Changxian advancing with his blade, tearing through the dead flesh of the monsters. The girl looks back, seeing how her master was absolutely hardcore. Going back a little in time to when the two were still in the cave, the protagonist mentioned that the girl had talent for running. He decides to engrave the captivation rune on her and use her as bait to attract the attention of the creatures along the path. Then he simply orders her to run as if there were no tomorrow, valuing her legs and the fine art of flee no jutsu. Back to the present, Changxian was easily annihilating the undead. Surrounded by expired meat from last year, he asks his partner if that was the last one. The girl arrives in the blink of an eye, confirming that the job is done. The protagonist asks about the preparations. With her eyes shining, she also confirms that she finished and double-checked the preparations for the next battle. Feeling the weight of her expectant gaze, Changxian asks her to move as far away as possible. Without hesitation or questioning, the girl obeys her savior's request. While she runs deep into the forest, the tyrant prepares for the next step of his plan. A dense and dark mist explodes in front of Changxian, darkening the vision even of the sharpest eyes. Covering his nose with his own hand, the protagonist realizes that the black smoke was poison of the most insidious and rotten kind. Then huge insect claws burst from the ground, causing a huge explosion like a volcano erupting. Changxian dodges the monster's leg attacks, but is forced to leap elsewhere when the ground collapses beneath him. The girl watches in surprise from afar as she observes the destruction taking place and the monster emerging from the wreckage. A huge spider full of eyes emitting a spectral light emerged, standing tall over all that disaster. Changxian had not fallen yet, staring at the final boss of the dungeon with his trusty dagger in hand. Suddenly, he covers one of his eyes. When he removes his hand, a golden glow shines from his eye socket. His pupil seems to have turned into that of a beast. Countless zombies were clustered in a single spot. The cadaveric odor could be felt deep in the soul. But the farther you got from the view, the more the pile of bodies seemed to form the leg of a creature. This was one of the legs of the rotten arachnid plague, the final boss of the dungeon. The enormous spider roars, spitting its rotten saliva and releasing its hateful venom. Changxian faces the putrid breath head-on without moving a muscle, rooting his feet to the ground. The divine throne, the serpent that devours the world, had given him the eyes of the viper, making his pupils yellow and narrow. The protagonist realizes that the gods want to see his performance, even giving him privileges without asking anything in return. Meeting the divine expectations, he activates his eye in search of a weak spot in the monster. The first target was one of the front legs. Changxian's mouth starts releasing flames and his skin becomes more scaly like a lizard. His poison resistance activates. After a while, his tolerance level against toxins increases and the embers cleans his body of toxic agents. His appearance now was almost draconic, and he gains a new achievement, enhancing his fire element. Now that the cards were in his hand, the tyrant advances into the inevitable battle. Climbing the hill of rotting flesh that made up the monster, he prepares his attack with every step. With an arc of light from his blade, the creature's limb collapses. The spider lets out a visceral scream, a roar of pain born from the gargantuan depths of its trachees. Jumping over the arachnid, Changxian searches for something that could ignite the embers of the 8 trigrams urn. Grabbing a branch from a tree tall enough to view the monster from above, he decides that venom would be the best fuel. Using his viper eyes, Changxian searches for his target. The venom gland of the rotten arachnid plague would be the perfect item to complete the urn's conditions. The privilege of Jormungand helps him locate the poisonous organ inside the spider's abdomen. Using both hands on his dagger to prepare a powerful attack, he intended to finish this in one strike. The tyrant strikes his target with everything he has, but the weapon ricochets upon hitting the arachnid's hard exoskeleton. Changxian is impressed by the creature's toughness. After all, a final boss shouldn't be an easy opponent. Heads of undead emerge through the spider's body, vomiting and pooling a green liquid from their mouths. Then they shoot it at the protagonist in a whirlwind of rotten, stinking horrors. Changxian jumps off the spider to dodge the attack. Landing on the ground, he realizes it was acid. He smiles to himself, knowing he's not in the right condition to face that thing alone. So he uses the most powerful defensive skill of all. Legs, don't fail me now. Meanwhile, we see John Chunja running frantically and stopping when he notices something. It was an apocalyptic scene with zombies lying on the ground, completely lifeless and motionless. He gets furious and assumes that this was Chang Xian's doing. No, he wants it to be someone else responsible for that. Then a notification pops up in front of him announcing the dungeon ranking update. His worst nightmare comes true. The point difference between him and the protagonist was like the distance from the sky to the earth. Despair devours his hope, and all he can release from his lips is a faint, nearly inaudible sigh. Then the divine being supporting him warns that it will no longer help him if this continues. Hearing that, Chungja bites his finger. His face shows deep nervousness, his thumb was already bleeding, and his mind desperately tries to invent explanations for Chang Xian's development. To rub even more salt in the wound, another window opens revealing the protagonist's encounter with the rotten arachnid plague. Not wanting to waste time and determined to become the main character of this story, he runs to face the tyrant. Meanwhile, the escape of the real main character continues, descending into a ravine. He looks at the creature and remembers the preparations he asked the bright-eyed girl to make. Chang Xian halts his steps. The spider was chasing him like a hungry predator hunting its prey. Suddenly, the ground beneath the spider collapses under its own weight. With the plan working, the protagonist distances himself a bit more. Several runes are activated in a chain reaction. As the body of the enormous arachnid falls into the trap hole, the explosive runes trigger, and a huge explosion of flames is spat out from the crater. The undead trapped on the spider's body suffer with the burning fire. Another rune is activated and the rock spikes on the trap's walls begin to charge with energy. Then multiple projectiles are fired at the enormous arachnid, destroying a large portion of its body. Facing imminent danger, the creature's survival instinct awakens and it desperately tries to climb out of the crater. While all the action unfolds below, Chang Xian holds onto a rope and reveals that this was just the beginning. The spider struggles to walk, the damage was severe, and the collapse of its body seemed near. Looking upward as if begging for salvation, it notices its nemesis, Chang Xian, hanging from a rope. The tyrant was already tired of this fight and intended to end it quickly. He cuts the line he was holding onto, and several energy spikes are fired. The spider is wounded by numerous projectiles that pierce through the undead on its body. Seeing that it was no longer worth suffering so much for such a small prize, the arthropod starts to flee. However, Chang Xian was determined to get the gland, chasing it down the ravine. Grabbing another rope, now he was side by side with the creature. Repeating the same move as before, several stone spikes appear midair. The arachnid is once again struck by the piercing attack, being hurled to the side by the force of the impact. Chungja's group finally arrives at the scene. He notices something upon arrival. Then he is surprised by what he saw. The final boss of the dungeon, the rotten arachnid plague, was writhing in pain. Observing how Chang Xian fought that monster, he concludes that interfering in the fight would be certain death. Biting the tip of his thumb, he plans to wait for that battle to end to collect what remains from the fighters. Patiently, he watches his rival fight bravely, waiting for them to get tired. But then a new idea comes to his mind. Laughing maniacally, he creates a new plan. Looking back at his group behind him, the idea was to force them to participate in the fight to tire out the tyrant even more. This way, forcing him to worry about the innocents and split his focus from the spider, then finish him off when he's exhausted. Still, for Chunjai that wasn't enough. He wanted a backup plan in case things went wrong. As if the heavens had heard his prayers, the running girl appears, spreading her whirlwind. He's surprised that she was still alive, and he's thrilled to have found another piece for his plan. Chang Xian was determined, with dry eyes devoid of fear or hesitation. His blade was hungry for the next strike. Tearing through the rotting flesh of the fallen, the path opens toward his target, allowing the warrior to advance. The monster's eyes watch the arrival of the reaper that fate had brought, descending upon its head like an angel of death. Gripping the dagger's handle with both hands for a firm strike, he drives the blade into the exoskeleton with a piercing attack. Beams of light overflow from the strike, releasing stars that announce critical hits on the monster. Lights dance like celestial harps, and the stars emerging from the wound foretell the arachnid's destruction. The exoskeletal carcass can no longer sustain the weight of the attacks, collapsing and breaking into shards of oblivion. Now all that remained was the venom gland. Suddenly, a hand grabs the spider's organ. It was Chang Xian, securing his loot. Without even thinking about the disgust of interacting with part of an undead, he swallows that nasty thing right away. After swallowing and savoring his suspicious expired dish, something affects his body. He falls to his knees as windows announce his level up. Then a green puff erupts from the protagonist's mouth. The poisonous breath keeps flowing out of him as he remains still among the giant spider's remains. After receiving several conquest points, the dungeon starts to close. The skies open in a pattern of cubes, as if opening a portal. Meanwhile, Chunja's group waits for the signal from their leader to begin the attack. Noticing that Chang Xian was still on his knees, he assumes he's too tired to stand. Then he commands everyone to attack immediately. Letting his slaves do the dirty work for him, he hides behind his team. But the protagonist doesn't move, doesn't blink, doesn't even pant. He seems to be waiting. Chunjae feels a bad premonition, but it's already too late. Chang Xian's motionless face redraws itself into a smile, a dark laugh challenging the shadows over his face. Seeing his rival laugh, the guy in the jacket starts feeling chills crawl up his spine. The tyrant slowly rises. He wasn't tired, nor was he injured. A window pops up announcing that the group has fallen into a trap. Everyone panics, not understanding what's happening, especially Chunjae, who remained in shock. Chang Xian watches their despair, seemingly savoring the fear that those traitors let slip from their spirits. With a confident smile, the tyrant looked like a villain who had just prepared his plans, insinuating to the group that they had already failed before even trying. The group advanced to attack Chang Xian. The tyrant remained still, waiting for his opponents to approach. Seeing that he had no choice, he decides to act. With a cross slash, he pierces the enemy formation. Then he presses the attack. A sudden mission is announced: escape the trap. Chungjie stays behind his allies, protected by a wall of flesh. But it's useless against Tiamat's fang. With nowhere to run, he decides to face the protagonist head-on. The tyrant goes into guard stance. Blocking the attack, the blade of the primordial dragon shines. Suddenly, Chungjie feels a sudden force hit his arm, and he screams in pain as he sees his limb twisted by the recoil of Chang Xian's defense. The protagonist laughs upon seeing that scene. By a hair, Chang Xian misses his thrust and strikes a rock behind his opponent. But it automatically triggers an explosive rune, blowing up the rocks and sending Chungjie running frantically in despair. Fleeing from his executioner, he blends into the crowd and orders them to protect him. But the tyrant advances mercilessly, trampling those ants who tried to shield the coward. Seeing that he was too weak to face his rival, he begins to crave more power. Haseon watches the scene from afar. He reveals that Chungjie was the chosen one of the gods, chosen to be a toy and used until broken to test Chang Xian. As you watch that young man drown in despair, the officer reveals that this was only a tutorial for the tyrant, and he remembers how all of this was exactly what happened in the dungeon he had survived long ago. The boy in blue starts trying to absorb the life essence of his fallen allies, but the ability fails. Surprised and desperate to see his last hope crumble, he sinks into the unease of disbelief. Chang Xian continued his advance without hesitation and without looking back, a beast without emotion, and delivers a thrust with his draconic dagger. Turning into a flood of red claws, each attack wore down the hope of his victim. No longer able to defend himself, the steel mercilessly pierces Chungjie. The executioner smiles as if mocking his target's struggle. Then a reddish explosion unfolds in the air, painting a picture of defeat and helplessness. He falls defeated and alone, with no one to offer him a saving hand. He screams in pain, clutching what little dignity he has left. He looks at one of his fallen allies and the curse of the seal activates, releasing the vitality from the body. But the energy flows in another direction, away from Chungjie, who can only watch his soul triumph abandon him. The enchantment that once was meant to feed his own power now flows to his rival, Chang Xian. Abandoned, alone, and desperate, he wonders how he managed to steal his ability. The protagonist keeps repeating the name of the defeated one, trying to remember where he had heard it before. Then he decides that it's annoying trying to pull a memory that feels so ancient. Chungjie, with his pride shattered, asks if he finally remembered him. With his hand on his chin, Chang Xian replies that he didn't. A rising fury grows even stronger in the disturbed heart of the defeated boy. Then he screams, blaming the protagonist for his expulsion from the team. Right after hearing that, the tyrant looks at him incredulous. Now yes, he finally remembers. Sometime in the past, Chang Xian remembers a young boy whining about something. He was crying with snot and saliva dripping down his face. In the present, the protagonist walks slowly toward him, asking if that crybaby was really the same person now, and even mocks how the shameful behavior was exactly the same. No longer able to endure the humiliation, Chungjie tries to hold back his tears while gritting his teeth, and attacks immediately after, claiming that now it's different. Now he's stronger, because a goddess watches over him. Then a window pops up, saying that the deity considers her servant a loser. Chang Xian keeps his stoic face as if it was nothing, like none of that would even be a problem for him. With no more support, no companions, and no dignity, Chungjie drowns in his own solitude. Now he realizes that he wasn't the protagonist, or even a side character or a secondary one. He was just a pedestal. The tyrant prepares his dagger. Seeing that, he screams, realizing that the end was inevitable. Then he remembers the envy of not being part of the winner's team, the shame of being left behind. His rival, who didn't even remember him, raised the team's trophy while surrounded by applause and praise. And he regrets it, regrets having followed him to the portal. Then Chang Xian's blade takes the spirit of that young man to his last breath. Now he falls to the ground, expressionless and empty. Without looking back, the tyrant gets rid of the last remnants of the one who had fallen. There was no compassion nor forgiveness in his movement. A macabre and funeral energy begins to emanate from Chungjie's body. This was the life force of many sacrifices now escaping from the empty shell of his hosts. The survivors could only watch that grotesque scene unfolding before them. But all that sinister power was heading toward Chang Xian. Everyone was surprised to see the power change owners so drastically. A strange circle near the protagonist's face seemed to be absorbing part of that energy. It was a scarlet vortex, resembling the seal of a black hole. Some time ago, when Chang Xian was carving the mark on the girl with the hairpin. After modifying the seal, she had now become a host, and the same red circle from before was in the owl drawing. He had engraved the rune of the path on it, allowing her to receive a small portion of the sacrifice's power without suffering the side effects. Back to the present, the rune of the path was activated and sucking most of the energy that would go to the girl. But thanks to the demonic nature of this ability, the life force was impure, putting Chang Xian at severe risk. He compares this sensation to when he drank the 100-year elixir, but with a much worse taste. After digesting everything, he realizes that the suspicious god was giving him a tutorial and testing him to see if he met the expectations. The mysterious being decides to reward him with a surprise gift, and at that moment, the survivors' seals start going out of control. They are all pinned to stakes of dark energy, looking like a scene worthy of Vlad Tepes. Chang Xian doesn't seem very fond of his reward. The people are still alive and begging for help, and two windows with yes and no appear in front of the protagonist. Ha-seong watches closely, and the whole scene feels familiar to him, way too familiar. He fears that the tyrant will act the way the gods want to avoid being completely erased. Chang Xian remains standing, looking at his choices. To the soldier, the look in that young man's eyes was cold, distant, and monstrous. He will definitely choose the path with the most benefits and profits, like a machine programmed only for efficiency. The tyrant's finger makes the choice. It was no. The god with the hidden name finds that decision bizarre, but Chang Xian replies that he wouldn't trust someone who hides. The divine being then declares himself as the great demon who pursues the abyss, surprising the protagonist. The deity notices his surprise and asks if he already knew him. The tyrant tries to fake it, pretending to be surprised by the title. This being was Mephistopheles, one of the most powerful demons capable of directly challenging Tiamat. Chang Xian wonders what a reclusive god like that was doing there. But someone interferes with the great demon's interests. It was Pablsag, protesting and claiming the protagonist as hers. The protagonist feels relieved that someone stepped in to deal with the big shot from hell. Then the countdown to the dungeon's closure begins. But someone calls out to Chang Xian. It was the girl with the hairpin who still had the rune of captivation active, attracting several suitors to her along the way. She wanted the protagonist's contact information, but the tyrant simply throws the piece of bone he used to edit the devil's seal. The teenager catches it in midair. Then he reveals that there was an address carved into the bone piece where she could completely remove the stigma. And he promises that one day they would meet again. With only a few seconds left, a great wall of light illuminates Chang Xian's back. The girl tries to reach him, but she is stopped by the intense brightness that blocks her vision. After the dungeon's destruction, she slowly opens her eyes and hears the screams of the rescuers. She is surprised by the sudden change in scenery. She was now in the middle of an ordinary city, the survivors were beside her, and several people were seeking help. But a familiar sight catches her attention amid that whirlwind of sensations. It was her parents running toward her, worried for her safety. The reunited family hugs, with tears and words of comfort, relieved that their daughter was safe. But of course, she couldn't get the image of her savior out of her mind, and she searches for him in the crowd. His presence couldn't be seen anywhere, disappearing like a ghost who had fulfilled his duty. The girl holds the piece of bone tenderly, hoping that one day she might see him again. Hours pass, and Chang Xian is admiring the full moon in his solitude. Or at least he wished to be alone because two more gods were on his tail, the snake and the devil. But that doesn't stop the nostalgic feeling he has of finally coming back home. Chang Xian was walking through the city, a deity of the good hunting season growling at her two rivals. With the sun illuminating his steps and cars passing by on the street, the protagonist silently listens to the snake's mockery as it responds to Pablsag. While the other two argued, Mephistopheles was only interested in knowing his answer. The goddess grows impatient and demands to be heard by the other gods. The devil insists on being answered, as if wanting to cover his own ears with his pride. He admires himself for getting the attention of so many gods. Perhaps this is the first time a rookie has managed to attract so much divine attention since the portals and dungeons started appearing. As he continued on his way, the mission to choose a divine patron is activated. Pablsag immediately makes her offer of the first arrow. Then came the world-encircling serpent, Jormungandr, offering the role of prophet of wisdom. The great demon who pursues the abyss, Mephistopheles, wants to offer him the role of final observer. Thinking about other options, he realizes that there were no better choices than this trio. There were three extremely powerful deities, to the point that others became redundant in comparison. No, there was still one more. A window opens and the fourth deity reveals herself. The owl that pierces the twilight shows interest in the protagonist. This was the true Minerva, the goddess of justice. It seems he gained her attention after rejecting the devil's offer, shifting the scales of his karma. Now he had to endure four voices filling his head, all demanding an answer and his attention. Then the time to choose a divine patron runs out. Chang Xian remains standing, looking at the sky, and had chosen no god. Upon achieving the achievement, a charming man who rejected the god's offers, he removes his hood and looks at a large apartment while enduring the furious divine complaints, calling him a disgusting, greedy man. Switching scenes, we see a building belonging to the CMJL Association, which stands for World Council of Players for Freedom, an organization created by the UN to manage and control the damage caused by the portals and dungeons that appeared. It was a group that could enjoy various freedoms depending on the time, being able to operate in numerous countries and investigate as they pleased. Inside the building, two people were talking in a room lit by the glow of computer screens. A man was working tirelessly on his keyboard, complaining about the media ratings trying to defame the association. After seeing all the complaints, the woman in a suit slams the table, revealing that she had suffered during the field work in the Jamsil dungeon. This was Xia Yevian, not believing that the news didn't care about her efforts to ensure the citizens' safety. Then her colleague asks her to look at an article further down, mentioning someone called L. The woman grabs her cigarette, grumbling about who was the audacious one that leaked the data. The man reminds her that smoking wasn't allowed there. Clenching her fist in fury, she shoots a glare capable of knocking down buildings. The poor guy, panicking politely, gulps and apologizes. Then she reminds him to block contacts coming from the outside, but it seemed that was easier said than done. The good thing was that the media was more interested in making a tabloid than talking about the guy who soloed the dungeon and disappeared. Yaya, now with her cigarette lit, looks up and thinks about that strange civilian, and concludes that she must find him before the other clans. Suddenly, a shout breaks through the air like a journalistic thunder, announcing that they had found the guy, nearly causing her soul to leave her body from the scare. Pulling herself together, the smoker asks where he is. Home. He's at home. Chang Xian walked into his house and took off his shoes while an ugly, fluffy little dog barked at him. Soup was cooking on the stove, releasing a warm and comforting aroma that filled the air with tenderness and lightness. A woman asks if he had already eaten, but she notices something about him. With his clothes a bit dirty and most of his face hidden by the hood tightened by its strings, Chang Xian seemed strange. It was as if the smell of food ignited something in him, a feeling dormant for centuries, reminding him that he was still human. The ugly little dog taps him with its paw, trying to get his friend's attention. Then he picks up his pet lovingly, letting the poor thing cover his face with desperate licks of longing. The woman smiles, seeing such a heartwarming scene, and lets him know that the soup is almost ready, and asks Chang Xian to take a shower. Hugging his old friend, a familiar warmth envelops his soul, making him remember that he was finally back home. The food rested on the gray and cold table, the heat from the dishes trying to create a welcoming atmosphere on the icy surface. The family remained silent, dressed in formal social attire as if the clocks insisted on speeding up time toward the start of the workday. This feeling of distance was what made Chang Xian stay away from home as much as he could. The two young people, the blank expressions, get up from the table and say they are heading out. His father's family owns a large hospital, and his mother came from a lineage of diplomats and judges. Yua asks her two children if they would be late again that day, and both respond that they had commitments. His older brother graduated in medicine, while his sister is a renowned musical artist. Chang Xian feels isolated, even having disappeared. It seemed that no one cared about the weird gamer. So he starts eating, trying to fill the emptiness he felt inside his own home. Suddenly, a masculine hand hits the jupgarak on the table, complaining about the youngest being so quiet. The tyrant doesn't understand what his father wanted with that. Yua tries to intervene to calm her husband, but in vain. Then Jomyeon continues, mentioning how he left the family worried after the appearance of the dungeon in Jamsil. The protagonist listens to that without showing any emotion, even after hearing about the efforts of his older siblings to find him. His father stands up from the table, irritated with the lack of consideration and explanation from his youngest son. The tyrant keeps the same expression as he swallows his food. Then Jomyeon threatens him, saying that if he continues like this, it would be better to leave the house to avoid causing more problems. His mother joins the conversation, defending Chang Xian and begging him to say something. Unable to take it anymore, his father grabs his briefcase and rushes off to work. He holds back his tears as he walks out of the house. Chang Xian notices this and starts to feel a little guilty. The door closes with a lonely thud. Reflecting on how his old self used to be, he looks down and realizes that he had left a painful knot in his family when he went to Arcadia. His mother asks him not to take those words to heart. The man was angry and speaking without thinking. Then Chang Xian breaks his silence, just to confirm her request. Right after, he carefully observes her face. Her hair was silky and well cared for, her eyes still showed genuine kindness, but age had already left its marks, and he realizes he was being a negligent son. Remembering his gamer life when he spent days locked in his room playing, he had never tried to get close to his own family. So Chang Xian apologizes. His mother doesn't understand what she just heard. Then he promises that he will be more careful in the future. Right after, he enters his old room. Many bottles and trash were scattered across the floor near the computer. Starting to clean that place abandoned by Hope, he couldn't believe he used to live like that. Then he notices something that had followed him all the way there. It was the ugly, fluffy little dog. Picking up the ugly one in his arms, Chang Xian reflects on how to fix his messy life. Then he thinks it's best to start with cleaning. Switching scenes, a yellow sports car speeds through the streets at high speed. Someone was very surprised to be in such an expensive car. It was the CMJL Association duo, Cha Yayun and her co-worker, who still couldn't believe how she managed to buy that. Ignoring his complaints, the woman only cared about meeting Chang Xian. Returning again to the protagonist's house, his room was now spotless and organized. While he was resting on his bed, Pableside and the snake were still pestering him. Remembering his family's reactions, a shadow of sadness falls over his black eyes. Getting up determined, he plans to show his family that he is a changed man. He intends to focus on being a good player, hoping that his relatives' hearts will open because of that. Reflecting on how his early game was very fruitful, the second plan was now more within reach, especially since Hyuju was also on Earth. Now we have a flashback between Thanatos and Chang Xian, talking about the first target. The god of the underworld reveals that this traitor is residing in the human world. The Twilight of the Gods immediately asks who the enemy was. It seems it was someone quite familiar to him. His name is the tiger submerged in adversities, Hyuju. Upon hearing this, veins bulge from his neck and a malicious smile forms on Chang Xian's face. Back to the present, he was making the same kind of expression, but with such an evil vibe that even the ugly little dog gets scared. This deity was one of those responsible for sending him to divine judgment. But what he couldn't forget was the bastard's laughter echoing in his ears. And he agrees that it won't be easy to capture him. The scoundrel was cunning and attacked from ambush. Then a notification appears on Chang Xin's phone. It was the White Tiger clan announcing their recruitment. Since the day the portals started appearing, several deities turned their attention to Earth, creating clans of devotees and creatures. For example, Hyuju was the one sponsoring the White Tiger clan. While researching on his phone, he discovers that they were ranked first in Korea. Knowing that he didn't have enough power to start a war, he plans to attack stealthily and eliminate his target little by little. Chang Xian decided to go to the park near the Han River and reassures his mother, saying he wouldn't be back late. He arrives at a mountainous location, quite remote and outside the city. The protagonist is left behind by his taxi, which drives away toward the horizon. He ventures deeper into the dense forest, leaving the road, and quickens his pace. He didn't want to be interrupted by anything in his next plan, not by people or ugly fluffy puppies. However, it seems that the kimchi soup made a censored carnival of horrors and insanities in his stomach. Wanting to solve things quickly, he intends to do a magical cleanse on his body, but thought for a moment before doing that, and decides to do it the old-fashioned way. From the democratic throne that neither judges nor condemns the gourmet tyrannies of those who sit on it, echoed liberating, forbidden sounds. Now finally free from the clutches of nature's call, he was ready to continue his journey. With no time to waste and feeling lighter than minutes ago, he runs like the wind toward his goal. We are now even deeper inside the mountain and its vast greenery that cover the entire view. Chang Xian finds an ideal spot to do what he intends to do. With his dagger, he runs the blade across his palm and draws a line of blood. Using the liquid as ink, he engraves runes onto the tree trunks. A barrier rises and the stealth rune is activated. Then, little by little, it becomes more translucent, hiding what was inside. Taking off his clothes, he now stood with his body as free as a baby meeting his doctor for the first time at birth. With a gesture of both arms, he opens his inventory. Moving like a tango dancer, he accesses various types of materials at a steady rhythm. As he released the items, more of them appeared in the air, all of them possessing some toxic property. To give the final touch to this poisonous adventure, he regurgitates the venom gland of a spider. The arachnid organ was still pulsating with putrid venom, even after having been collected long ago from its original host. At that moment, Chang Xian remembers what he had been taught. The shooting stars said that poison was the best fuel to create a powerful blaze. The first elder explains that his fire was capable of repelling toxins from the body and evil, a purifying flame. Then continues, revealing that the stronger the harmful substance, the greater the fire. And to release the embers of the urn of the 8 trigrams, you would need to create a great bonfire. When the urn is activated, the inserted poison will be destroyed, completely purifying the body. Back to the present, Chang Xian begins his ritual by stabbing the venom fang of the blood mamba into the origin of his body's pulse. The toxins quickly spread through his body, making his own blood a danger to himself. As time passed, the situation worsened and the protagonist agonized over his choices. Even with so much pain, his body absorbs the properties of the fang and can now produce harmful substances. But that wasn't enough. This time he damages his insides with the burnt claw of the flaming tiger. All this process worries Pablsag. While enduring the toxic damage inside his body, he still had to put up with his divine stalkers talking. Mephistopheles was waiting for an answer. Now it was time to use the scorpion's sting. At this moment, Chang Xian was almost close to seeing Thanatos again. Then to finish this horror scene, he crushes the spider's gland and drinks its liquid. His body looked like that of a zombie. Veins bulged across every inch of his skin, and his eyes were black from so many chemicals. Then the tyrant waits. He waits patiently as the Reaper's sight seemed to touch his spirit. His body was already close to collapsing when a small flame lit within him. That little blazing light grew more and more, a hope amidst the poisonous chaos. Something awakens inside him. A fire that was once dormant now rises. A huge blaze erupts from him, enveloping him like the embrace of a loving mother. The fire did not burn him, but healed him. If someone passed by at that moment, they would think they saw a person suffering, but this was not the case. Then the flames devour all the evils and harmful substances in Chang Xian's body, becoming stronger and fiercer. After burning as much as possible, the ancestral sacred flame is activated, and the power of the fire of the urn of the 8 trigrams is acquired. The flames die down, revealing a new, stronger, and healthier body, with no trace of poisoning or injuries. Showing an expression of victory, our hero internally celebrates his achievements and gains immunity to the 10 poisons. Like a player getting a new set of equipment, he opens the status window to see his gains. Staying his build on a new elevated level, Chang Xian decides that he only lacks new weapons. Meanwhile, in the building where the protagonist's family lived, someone asks about his whereabouts. As Shay Yuan and her colleague enter the apartment, someone calls them slow. 2 men, one muscular with a fake mustache and another skinny with sideburns, were standing near a woman. The skinny one with the serious look is Wu Youngjun, the Black Shamshir. The muscular one is Xiu Zhangwan, leader of the second-raid team of the White Tigers. The CMJL agent bites her lips in frustration, realizing she acted too late. Switching scenes, we are now in the Sungsu neighborhood, also called Shoemaker's Alley. Melted cheese oozes from a dough snack. Chang Xian was devouring so much fried food that it would make any liver suffer from overwork. Then he remembers the conversation with Thanatos, reminding him of one of his old divine traits, King of Weapons. The god of the underworld recommends finding a blacksmith who can meet his expectations for weaponry. The protagonist doesn't believe that someone like that exists on Earth, but the deity assures him that such a person does exist. While savoring his snack, an old man calls Chang Xian's attention to visit his little shop. Then he informs him that the store where he was standing, waiting, had been closed for 5 years. The door was locked with a massive padlock and thick chains, definitely looking like it hadn't opened for half a decade. Chang Xian stands still in front of the shop, but notices something strange about this story. He gets closer to the entrance and literally starts sniffing around. There was a smell of divine fire coming from the building. Paddlesag suddenly appears, intrigued by the smell of steel being worked. It seems someone is working inside. They certainly weren't fully closed, so he breaks the chains. Upon opening the door, various weapons with an abandoned appearance come into view. The goddess of the hunting season starts getting excited like a child in a toy store. Chang Xian invades the establishment, with her following, greedily eyeing the products like it was Black Friday. She gets a bit too excited and lets out a squeal of hesitation upon seeing so many high-quality materials. Among all the forged steel piled in that mountain of weapons, a sword bathed in abandonment rests on the wall. Chang Xian holds it delicately, examining every detail. This irritates Paddlesag, who finds that charred toothpick pathetic. But the protagonist notices something special about it. Suddenly, someone appears and interrupts the two's fun. The silhouette of a hairy man holding the leash of a Doberman watches Chang Xian, but there was something different about that old man. He was blind. Switching scenes, a hand places a plate with sliced apples on the table. Yua asks them to eat and smiles politely. The quartet of idiots are impressed to witness such elegance. But the silly atmosphere is broken by Zhengguan commenting on how newbies are so in demand these days. To the point where the leader of the raid team and a department head are sharing the same room, the mustache man finishes. Yeon explains that this is obvious when dealing with a super rookie. Apparently, that man with the fake mustache was considered the person with the highest battle power in the country. Meanwhile, the other was the director of the Human Resources Department of the Osum Sword Clan, which had been rapidly rising in recent years. She then thinks if these two powerful individuals came just to see a rookie, there was something very special about Li Changxian. This means they are willing to eliminate the competition by any means necessary. Yeon stares at them and questions what men as busy as they were doing there, raising her voice like a razor's edge. Zhengguan stands up defiantly, asking if the association's agents were going to get in his way. The tension reached such a blazing climax that sparks of anger cut through the air. An explosion of violence was already a certainty. Yuva asks if this was about her son. The two idiots turn and confirm that they wanted to recruit him. Then they start offering an enormous list of benefits from their own organizations, trying to convince Chang Xian's mother. But the mature woman puts a stop to that conversation and says that the one who should decide that was her son himself, not her. But first, she wanted to know one thing from them. Both stay quiet, waiting for the question. What the youngest had done in the 5 days he spent in the Jamsil dungeon. We return to the blind blacksmith's shop. The protagonist was with Ao Yezi in the living room. The old man is curious to see a young guy wanting to place an order with a man without sight. Chang Xian stays silent while Paddleseg expresses her disbelief in that old man, and the snake gets irritated, telling her to shut up. Grabbing a leash of his guide dog named Wilson, he thinks this was just some kid's prank and decides to leave. But the protagonist notices that the furnace is still being used, and how his hands were full of calluses from working so much with metal. Yezi quickly turns around, wanting to know what he meant by all of that. Then Chang Xian also comments about poor Wilson swinging his own legs as if he were on an island without food or money. The blacksmith says nothing back. The tyrant makes his offer, starting with 10 million won for each order and 50 million when everything is done. Hearing those numbers, Yezi remains still, staring at the door, his panting dog still by his side. Even after receiving 10 million in his account, he still looks at his bank balance in disbelief. With an investor's smile, Chang Xian reveals that this is just the initial payment. Seeing that his new client was more serious than the tax office's line looking for mistakes, he asks for more money. The protagonist doesn't seem to have heard that very well. The blacksmith wanted an extra 5 million to pay the rent. Money is sent. Receiving the deposit notification, Yezi decides to discuss the commission. But upon hearing the word boss come from Chang Xian's mouth, he gets confused. Then the protagonist explains that he is the contract sponsor. Therefore, he will be obligated to work only for him from now on, becoming his permanent boss. They both discuss a huge list of weapons to be created. But Yezi confesses it's way too much. Chang Xian immediately warns that if he breaks the contract, he will have to pay back 3 times the amount received. Realizing he fell for a scam, he curses his new boss, calling him crap. The tyrant just walks away, not caring about what he says. Even so, the blacksmith doesn't think it's very healthy to trust people right from the first meeting. Chang Xian agrees, but also says that if he's paying, it's because he wants to pay. Hearing this, Yezi decides to accept the order but warns him that it will take a long time to get used to the work again. And worst of all, there was a big problem. Chang Xian asks what it is, but The blacksmith used a special hammer to work his furnace, but he lost it. Upon hearing this, the tyrant wants to know if the tool was stolen or something like that. Then he reveals that one of his father's most experienced apprentices stole the hammer after the old man's death. It seems the predecessor didn't have a good eye for people. Anyway, the protagonist asks who this traitor ran away to. Hayoff. Chang Seon wasn't familiar with that name. Yezi is surprised to see how he doesn't recognize the name of one of the 10 largest clans, but that doesn't matter. The tyrant plans to go get the hammer back, asking where the item was. This leaves the blacksmith even more surprised. Attacking that place alone would be madness. But Chang Seon guarantees that if there are no witnesses and he escapes before reinforcements arrive, there won't be any problems. Yezi completely glitches in surprise, seeing that young man behaving as if he were made from Red Bull and a NASA secret project. If he's really all that, then he'll get everything. Then he reveals that the hammer is in a tomb in Seoul on Manhwa Mountain. Time passes, night falls, and the lights of the big city illuminate the nighttime chill. It seems we are in a construction with an ancient appearance, with cylindrical buildings and rounded tops resembling towers. Someone arrives at that location. It was Chang Xian, who already starts by watching a group of guards at the entrance to the tomb. According to Yezi, the High House wanted Jin Dao Huan, the traitor of his father, to open a dungeon and clear its resources. Apparently, the final room of that dungeon was locked, and they needed someone to forge the key. A secret locked place and a pile of guards at the entrance. Chang Xian concludes there must be something great inside. Looking at the moon's position, he concludes that it's already 8:40. So as not to worry his mother, he starts typing a message to her, saying that he will be back after dinner. Then he searches about the Haihoff clan, discovering several violent news articles. They were also suspected of other heinous crimes ranging from human trafficking to selling illicit drugs. So he decides he's going to hunt them down and eliminate another evil in the world. Minerva liked what she saw and granted him a special benefit, unshakable heart, gaining mental immunity. Chang Xian sends a fake thank you to the goddess since his intentions had nothing to do with justice, and he would have preferred other benefits. The protagonist prepares for battle, pulling something out of his jacket, while the divine stalkers are back with popcorn to watch the action. He pulls out the smiling Ha-Ho mask. This item allows him to hide his own identity and is capable of blocking recognition. Equipping the item, he arms himself with daggers made from the feathers of the ice eagle and plans to bring disaster to his enemies. When he throws the blades, they cut through the air with the fury of a blizzard. The guards sense the danger, but it's too late for a defensive reaction. One of them is struck on the forehead, and an explosive ice flower bloomed on his brow, unfolding in a glacial kiss that stole his breath. One after another, the soldiers met the same fate, encased in icy sarcophagi, turning the environment into a cold and desolate graveyard. Chang Xian lands. He draws Tiamat's fang. As he swings his weapon, shards of ice erupt violently, launching sharp fragments throughout the area. The tyrant moves with lethal precision between the ice tombs, his dagger dancing as it spreads destruction upon the frozen. The smile of the mask overflows with calculated cruelty, reflecting a primal hunger for more suffering. Then he makes blood drip from his hand. Creating poison from the wound, he infects his victims. The toxins spread through their bodies. As he walks toward the entrance, an opera of terror echoes behind him, a visceral melody composed of misery and despair. The masked openings release a dark energy as if his own spirit radiated joy at witnessing so much suffering. As he climbs the stairs to the tomb, Chang Xian hears the gods delighting in the scene soaked in cruelty. The doors open. The tyrant is now inside the tomb of Bestla. The mask activates, granting him enhanced vision. Apparently, this equipment was a gift from Yezi to help him in the dungeon. Chang Xian assumes that the hammer thief placed the brazier near the final chamber to try forging the keys more easily. Several windows pop up announcing the start of the quest, and Pabelsag wastes no time declaring her expectations. The protagonist suddenly stops in his tracks. He looks to the side and asks the presence to show itself, but nothing happens, leaving even the goddess of the good hunting season confused. Seeing that it wouldn't reveal itself, he decides to leave and promises to pass the reporting rights to another administrator. The presence doesn't like what it hears and decides to reveal itself. It's heralded with his mischievous smile. The rabbit introduces himself with his hands squeezing his chubby cheeks. Pabelsag is shocked to realize who it is. With a mocking tone, he says the goddess is kind of slow, and the other gods had already noticed his presence. The hunting deity doubts what he says, but the anthropomorphic creature wasn't lying. The other gods mock their stalker companion's ignorance, leaving her embarrassed and Harold awkward. Then Chang Xian ends that little divine chat and asks if the rabbit is there to write the report. The administrator is surprised to see someone familiar with that subject. The tyrant mentions that he finished the tutorial, so it was obvious someone would show up for this. Harold is once again surprised that a newbie knows so much about the evaluation written by the administrator's department. Putting on his workout outfit and pulling out a notebook from who knows where, he starts adding this new information to the document. For some reason, the rabbit shoots a sharp look at the protagonist. Chang Xian stands still, silently watching the little animal do his work. Harold reveals that there was a lot of interest in the tyrant, and that he was being pressured to write a report about him. But he starts sweating nervously at the thought of losing the reporting rights to another administrator, and he cries in despair. But Chang Xian allows him to continue with his work. The rabbit turns, happy as can be, with an air of hope fluttering in his turquoise blue hair. But the protagonist wasn't going to let him do that for free, so Harold asks what the price would be. The tyrant replies that he'll think about it later. The ears of the anthropomorphic animal droop in concern, this doesn't sound like it will end well. Chang Xian reassures him, saying it won't be anything difficult. The rabbit accepts the offer, but warns that he will only do things within his jurisdiction. With a mischievous smile, the protagonist seals the deal. A clicking sound echoes between the two, signaling that the mana contract is made. If the oath is broken, it will no longer be possible to use magic. Harold is intrigued, realizing that he is no longer dealing with an ordinary newbie, but perhaps a super rookie. Then Chang Xian starts to walk away after having done everything he wanted. The rabbit quickens his little steps to try and catch up with him. The snake delights in seeing someone smarter than the administrators. Meanwhile, deeper inside the dungeon, we're in a forge and someone yells that they've made another failed key. Then someone punches the wall, complaining. It's the head of the High Hot's conquest department, a large man named Li Jia-sung. Outraged by the failure, he falls into despair, fearing the punishment of being used as a sacrifice. Then he demands they bring Ji Da-huan. Two men appeared, bringing a person with messy hair, asking for someone to save him. The big guy asks if he failed again. Then the hammer thief begs to spare him and stutters in fear. But he manages to continue, asking for more blood and promising that he will have better chances of success. Suddenly, Jae-sung uses his massive leg to push the messy-haired man away. After taking the hit, Da-huan wipes his mouth, looking fearfully at his superior. The big guy complains and says he had already given him everything, and the results were always the same: nothing. Kneeling with his head down, the former blacksmith apprentice responds that the fire provided was of poor quality. Jae-sung feels offended, as if that old man were blaming him. Da-huan panics and tries to explain, begging for more blood and time to finish the job. Then the superior looks at him with disdain, asking if it was really just blood that he needed. It seems the traitor blacksmith had managed to open the second layer of the lock and would need more fuel to open the last one. The big guy accepts the request but warns him that this will be the last chance, and he will hunt his family if he fails. Right after, he shouts, asking why the supplies weren't arriving. Suddenly, the system window pops up, announcing a ranking update due to a new participant. Jae-sung looks at the 57th place named Li Chang-xian and wonders what was happening. Meanwhile, the soft paws of some animal were typing tirelessly. Completely exhausted and sweaty, Harold was writing his report on the great feats of the protagonist, an unparalleled rookie. Then he looks to the side and realizes he had already lost sight of him. While Chang Xian was advancing quickly through the dungeon, the rabbit struggled to keep up with his accelerated pace. Traps appeared, but the protagonist merely stared at them without fear. Nothing stopped his advance, he simply cut through the obstacles placed before him. This was a difficult dungeon. Even the administrator Harold was afraid of being hit by the debris. But that was a rabbit dedicated to his work. Even though he was exhausted and in tatters, he kept writing his report. There was fierce competition among the gods to make the protagonist their apostle, and the situation would only get worse from here. Then the anthropomorphic animal notices something familiar in what he was writing, pausing even his typing. And he looks shocked at Li Chang-xian. That back makes a specter of the past emerge. Every movement and breath he took showed a shadow of what once was. It echoed in his memory of someone who transcended all limits, a demon whose incandescent fury was capable of destroying the stars. Harold feels that this will bother the gods a little, but it will be worth the risk, and he starts typing. The twilight of the gods, the being who alone managed to create chaos in the divine plane. Like he had disappeared without a trace and had never been seen again, until now. Chang Xian was on his knees, immobilized by true cues. His eyes stared at his arch-enemy like invisible daggers, a silence that bled hatred. Finally seeing the twilight of the gods receiving his divine punishment, he just smiled like a tiger catching its prey. Then the protagonist heard something repugnant to his pride. The bastard laughed and belittled him, making sure to humiliate him, thus leaving a deep scar in the protagonist's heart. Back to the present, the tyrant easily dodged the giant axes of a trap. Escaping unharmed, he landed on the ground. But Pablesag warned him of a rotten smell in the air. The odor of coagulated blood and the dense evil aura hit Chang Xian in bursts as if it were the very breath of terror. He enters a room full of victims lying on the floor. The scene enrages the goddess of justice, Minerva. Thus, the protagonist discovers that his enemies are using sacrifices to create the key. Then something was approaching, with authoritarian shouts echoing through the room. Two men were leading a group of prisoners who were begging for help. One of the pair was threatening the chained ones. The tattooed one asks his partner to calm down and avoid doing anything stupid before completing your task. Suddenly, an icy explosion freezes the tattooed man, scaring the other who was nearby. Upon seeing the unexpected attack, he doesn't understand what is happening. The attack had erupted in a flash, and for an eternal instant, the other man's mind refused to decipher the logic of that moment. Then another guard succumbed, distorting into a frozen sculpture, making even his last breaths turn into crystals in the air. Chang Xian makes his blade a partner, breaking the living ice statues not with force, but with the elegance of a god of death. But from his shadows, another executioner emerged, tracing a lethal arc toward his target. Fast as a predator's reflex, the tyrant retaliates. His counterattack moves like lightning, piercing through his enemy's fate. With his injured shoulder, he lets out a sharp cry of helplessness and confusion. Looking like the very incarnation of a demon in contained fury, Chang Xian takes quick steps, while holding his dagger, a hungry silver fang. And then, with the precision of calculated violence, the tip of the steel kisses the opposite shoulder of the enemy. Realizing any chance of victory slipping away, the man asks who he was. However, he is frightened by a horrifying sight. The gaze of that masked man was that of a demon. Letting fear invade his heart, already weakened by pain, the man cries and begs to be spared. Chang Xian asks him if he wants to live. Then he begins an interrogation, wanting all the information about his group and what they were doing in the dungeon. A few minutes pass and the man finishes selling out his allies. The protagonist realizes he will have to deal with 30 enemies and one more dangerous person called Li Jiaseng. Finally finishing his answers, the man waits for his reward, being allowed to live. Chang Xian looks at him with disdain. He equips a dagger made from the fang of the fire tiger and reveals that he never said he would spare his life. With a quick and precise strike, the protagonist takes the breath away from the poor wretch who just wanted to keep breathing. After claiming another kill, the tyrant levels up. The serpent is amazed by the wordplay and Mephistopheles delights in the death. Soon after, he activates his soul collector authority. The body crumbles into ashes as it is drained. As more fallen enemies burn, the prisoners grew increasingly terrified, able only to watch that scene in horror. While the spiritual fragments were absorbed, the protagonist remains still in an intimidating manner. Then he suddenly looks to the side. The sacrifices are terrified by the gaze of that demon. Chang Xian resumes his walk with slow steps. The trails of ashes still followed him, devouring every cell of his enemies down to the atoms. The individuals were paralyzed by the dark presence of that thing in human form, and as he walked away, the people stepped aside, and they questioned whether that was a ghost. Time passes, and now we are at another point in the dungeon, where a group of people was discussing Li Changshan. As if they had summoned calamity itself upon them, the tyrant chased them like a tiger after rats. The screams of terror being played by the gleaming blade and the surprise of the evil that appeared were heard behind the stone walls. Then an explosion marks the end of the deadly symphony. The noise and turmoil of chaos reverberate through the walls of the room where Jae-sen was. Unable to endure the terrifying sensation of abandonment, he asks where his subordinates were. The ranking window suddenly pops up, eager to deliver the terrible news. The name Li Changxian was rising rapidly in the ranking, like hurried steps approaching their target. Seeing that name only 2 ranks away from first place, Jae-sen desperately screams for his allies. Then he realizes, too late, that he was completely alone in the dungeon. However, someone arrives asking for help. That image, appearing like a zombie, only made the heart of the person responsible for this operation grow anxious. Jae-sung tells Sun to pull himself together, but he notices something very terrible about his co-worker. Red runes spread all over his body, now beginning to activate. An intense glow starts pouring out through the openings, and a sudden explosion throws Jae-sung far away. Something burns him intensely, causing a horrible sensation. He had been impregnated with poisons. He tries to grab a capsule with a green cross symbol and attempts to open it, but something was approaching through the incandescent flames. It wasn't hope or his salvation coming, it was something much worse. It was Changshan. The protagonist advanced with his weapon in a thrusting position, but the blade is stopped by another, larger blade. There was a giant claymore blocking the advance of Changshin's dagger. Even while debilitated, he swung that huge piece of metal as if it were nothing, forcing the protagonist to retreat. His eyes were closed and probably blinded by the poisonous explosion, yet he still seemed to track him. The tyrant is surprised by the tenacity of that man, fighting even without being able to fully see. But the clock was still ticking and Jae-sung's HP was already dropping almost completely, forcing him to stop. Chang-san stays on guard. That guy was way too strong for someone at level 30. There was something more to this story. The strangest thing was how they managed to perform sacrifice rituals of this scale in a country like South Korea. Surely this mystery goes beyond mere wealth, igniting the protagonist's interest in the secrets of the High-Hofs. However, he couldn't stay long. Enemy reinforcements must already be coming. And he also thinks about the state of the victims who should be in that place at this very moment. The scene shifts to another location, where a man was asking everyone to enter a room. With everyone inside, he slams the door shut and asks if this is what that masked man wanted. The eyes of this man seem to recall something that happened very recently. The memory was of a young man who saved people from a sacrificial ritual and left without giving any answers. However, as if he had changed his mind, the supposed hero decided to turn back and head towards the victims. The masked man revealed the location of a door and ordered them to hide inside it, and warned them not to come out under any circumstances. Then he left along with the trails of ghostly ashes that followed him. Back to the present, the group locks the door and waits for rescue. Chang-san hopes that everyone understood his commands. Either way, his enemy was a dangerous opponent in close combat, so he adds more points to strength and agility. Soon after, he throws the antidote capsule at Jae-sung's feet. The desperate man opens the container, but finds nothing. Chang-san takes advantage of his enemy's distraction and quickly advances in a sneak attack. Rage clouds his vision and his fists tremble with fury. That little gain wasn't funny for the High-Hof member. Then he swings his claymore in a furious motion. The tyrant moves like a leaf in the wind and counters the charge with a leap. At the apex of the jump suspended in the void, his blade weaves a violent whirlwind, each thrust firing a silver ray that shredded the air. Even with darkness filling his eyes, the leader of the dungeon expedition defended himself as much as he could using his reflexes. But a stronger strike came, breaking through all the desperate defenses he had raised and sending him flying. Even though he didn't take direct damage to his body, the impact hurt him enough to make a scarlet thread drip from his mouth. But that doesn't make him give up the fight. The demonic eyes of Chang-Xian focused on his technique. In a sequence of fierce attacks, the sparks of colliding steel lit up the place and Jae-sung was pressured against the ropes. Then he pauses his sequence, pulling back Tiamat's its fang to prepare for his strike. In a quick blow reminiscent of a serpent's bite, the dagger strikes the claymore's metal. The blade can no longer withstand so many injuries, shattering into a million gleaming shards of defeat. Now that his enemy was defenseless, Chang Xian begins his true assault, starting with one slash. Then 2, 3, and countless others trace trails of pain across Jae Sung. Delivering the final strike to complete the masterpiece of his steel brushstrokes, the tyrant's eyes gleam like a specter. He throws his blade in an arcing motion, ridding himself of the remnants of the battle the metal had witnessed. A red explosion of a demon's fury erupts behind Chang Xian, like a volcano releasing despair into the sky. Now Jae Sung collapses to the ground, wondering why he, of all people, had to suffer something like this. The protagonist finds those words strange, and mocks his fallen opponent, saying that he merely reaped what he sowed. Then the Soul Collector activates, disintegrating Jae Sung's remains. Absorbing the ashes of his enemy, it regenerates some of his vitality. Minerva congratulates Chang Xian's heroic deeds and rewards him with a new privilege, Serene Spirit. The protagonist is surprised to be rewarded with such a powerful psychic ability, capable of granting him mental immunity. Now that he had unshakable heart and serene spirit, he felt like a monk who had achieved nirvana. Then he laughs at the irony of the situation. He was once called a cruel, brutal, and demonic god. In other words, a malevolent deity who brought evil to the cosmos. And he is amazed at how the goddess of wisdom and war rewards him so easily, without knowing his inner motives. Pablsig grows anxious at the possibility of losing her potential apostle and starts searching for a reward of equal level. After some time, they finally arrive at the door leading to the dungeon's final boss. The protagonist equips a bone spear made from the fire goat and throws it without even looking at his target, striking precisely an individual who was hiding. It was Dawan, the traitorous blacksmith. He collapses to the ground, dropping the stolen hammer. The protagonist approaches him, calling him a rat. The tyrant picks up the fallen tool. It was impossible to decipher its characteristics. All that was known was that it had been forged from a meteorite. Chang Xian finds the material used to craft this item quite interesting, but there was no time for that. He needed to open the door that the High-Off clan wanted so badly to open. Even though he didn't have the key, he had an even easier method to get what he wanted. Then he calls for Harold. The rabbit appears in an instant and is quite nervous, as if he knew the reason for being summoned there. Not wanting to accept the truth, he asks why he is being called to this place at this exact moment. Chang Xian reminds him of the contract they made earlier, demanding that he open the door. Harold tries to play dumb, saying that administrators cannot interfere with dungeon missions. But the protagonist no longer wants to hear those lies. He reveals that these rules change constantly, and he adds more spice to the threat, saying he won't grant the right of report, thus preventing him from making the report. Harold fulfills the request, even complaining that he might receive punishments. The stalker gods laugh at the administrator's situation. The door begins to open, following administrative authority. The rabbit sees something that was inside the room, and tries to hide his evil laugh so Chang Xian won't hear it. Right after, he confirms that his part of the contract is complete. Trying to hold back his laughter as much as possible, he urges him to enter quickly. The tyrant notices the strange behavior of that rabbit, sneakier than a viper, but enters anyway. The door closes and Harold can finally unleash his sadistic laughter. Now Chang Xian was in the final room of Bestla's dungeon, and his enemy was already in front of him waiting. It was a shapeless being looking more like a spectral mist than a living creature, with countless eyes staring at him. Then, from within its monstrous pupils, something activates. Because of that, Chang Xian begins to be influenced by a curse. The dungeon mission is announced: resist the mental attacks of the boss and break the sacred crown. But the announcement does nothing to warn the protagonist, who is now fighting the monster inside his mind. The living mist twists and shifts, wrapping around the tyrant as if trying to possess him. Hearing the noises from the final room, Harold couldn't stop laughing. That scene was worthy of an ironic comedy. Then he mocks Chang Xian's attempt to fight the final boss of this dungeon, and reveals that the objective was simple: resist the mental attacks of the tomb's ruler. But this would be anything but easy. That creature was an abnormality by itself. It was a massive cluster of Bestla's negative energy. The rabbit dances with joy, imagining how a rookie could handle such a complicated enemy, especially against mental attacks. For him, this was nothing more than a petty revenge for having his pride hurt in his role as administrator. Having had enough fun, Harold decides to leave. Then two messages pop up. Unshakable heart and serene spirit activate, forming the indomitable human spirit. The anthropomorphic animal is startled by this message and doesn't want it to be true. He turns back to look at the door, which is still closed but with countless windows announcing Chang Xian's overwhelming victory. Harold couldn't believe what was happening. The dungeon starts to crumble before his eyes, and the rabbit remembers something. The protagonist was a rune master, a class that required an unparalleled mental will to be used. With 1 second left, we can see that the dungeon's reward was a golden key. Claiming his victory, Chang Xian simply looks at Harold from afar without saying a single word. Then the dungeon closes, leaving only those two survivors as witnesses. Some time passes, and it's a full moon. We are now in the industrial alley of Sangsu. Feeling the familiar weight and texture in his hands, Uyezi wonders if this was really what he thought it was. Then he insists on the question and keeps pointing at the hammer. The protagonist scolds him, asking to be called boss. Eating his banjo pang, the tyrant asks the blacksmith if he can now work with the tool in hand. The old man confesses that he's a bit out of practice, and that a month wouldn't be enough to produce the requested items. Hearing that, Chang Xian reduces the deadline by a week. Yezi retorts, saying that not even the whip would be ready in 2 weeks. Then the tyrant orders him to produce the whip and the spear in 1 month, promising to pay triple for the job. As he leaves, he warns that he'll return to pick up the order within the deadline. He also picks up a sword covered in rust and asks if that object is for sale. The blacksmith looks surprised at that. He didn't want to sell that item. It was a family relic passed down through generations. Receiving 100 million won in his bank account, his only reaction is to scream crap and let Changxian take the sword. Now richer and with his honor as a craftsman restored, Yezi wanted to know more about who his new boss really was. But Wilson arrives, barking happily at his owner. Well, none of that matters now. There's only work to be done. Then the forge door opens. The furnace was still alive with its bright and powerful flame. Yezi takes off his shirt. Revealing a ripped body and wearing his protective glasses, the blind blacksmith prepares for work. Already outside the city, Changxian recalls a conversation with Thanatos. It seems that Yezi had been killed by Capricorn. The Twilight of the Gods asks whether the blacksmith was a deity or an ordinary human. The god of the underworld corrects him, saying he would be far too old if he were alive today. That doesn't answer the question he asked earlier. Then the god explains that Yezi was a title passed down to his successors through generations. But after the incident of the Capricorn, many secret teachings were not passed on, and with each generation, the quality of the items deteriorated. Even so, compared to other blacksmiths, the equipment produced was still of high rank. Changxian finds double satisfaction, having under his command a servant of relentless efficiency and allowing Choi Bu-yang to inherit the legacy of Yezi. Someone was holding a golden key with a huge gem at its tip. This was Peter's key. The protagonist finds it strange. Since the tomb belonged to Bestlet, it made no sense to have a key named after someone else as the final reward. But he intends to leave that mystery for later. Now he needed to go home before it got any later. Changing scenes, a muscular hand slams on the table, asking if they found the person who cleared the dungeon. Not getting the answer he most wanted, he demands that his employees keep searching. This person was the head of the High Ops Conquest Department, Go Sung-won, and he wanted to recover that key immediately. He fears that the real owners of Mount Manhwa, the White Tigers, will find out about the mess. The act of sacrificing lives was risky business, so the High Off clan was hired as contractors to clear the dungeon. With no time to waste, he decides to go to the place where the dungeon existed, ordering a vehicle. The men prepare to carry out their life or death mission. If the White Tigers found out that someone unknown had taken the key, being fired would be the most optimistic outcome. Wanting to protect his family and his own life, someone was determined to change his fate. Changing scenes, we are now at the apartment where Changxian's family lived. Jung Wan was receiving new information from an agent. Then a fury ignites within the mustached White Tiger. His body increases in size, a golden aura radiates from him, and he seems to be preparing for battle. He still couldn't believe what he had heard, creating a beast of energy that roared upwards, frightening everyone present. Yeon tries to stop the brute, calling his full name. Yua only watches the scene, without moving a finger, paralyzed. Young Jun also calls out to the pile of muscle, asking what he thought he was doing. Jung Wan realizes his mistake and how reckless he was being, then dissipates his power. The head of human resources warns him not to use the tiger's aura near civilians. Feeling guilty, the mustached man looks at the poor woman who had witnessed all that horror. Luckily, Yeon had protected her, preventing severe harm to her well-being. Changshen's mother looks at the grown man as if he were a misbehaving child. Then the mustached man steps back, deciding to leave, ashamed of his actions. The CMJL agent worries about her physical state. A normal person could die just from being exposed to the aura of a high-level player. Maintaining her composure solemnly, she assures them that she is fine. This was the first time she had seen and awakened. And she also discovers that her youngest son was part of this world so alien to her life. Then she informs them that Changxian only pretends to be strong, hiding a fragile person inside. Thus, she asks them to leave her house, kicking them out in a subtle way. Now the trio was in the elevator. Yeonjun blames the fake mustache for the embarrassment. Scratching one of his nostrils, he still intended to meet Changxian no matter what. But the itch intensifies as he remembers his niece, Wu Haibin, asking him to recruit the protagonist for the clan. Being polite, he offers coffee to the two CMJL agents if they decided to wait for Changxian to arrive. Jin Seok-tao wastes no time and immediately orders a hot caramel macchiato, but takes a karat chop from his coworker. Yeon steps forward and says they were busy with other matters and intended to return another time. Her friend was about to say something about it until he received another hand stab. The woman thanks him for the coffee offer. The head of the Human Resources Department shows a calm and polite smile, saying goodbye. The elevator finally arrives at the first floor. It was time for them to part ways. While the pair of CMJL agents left, the other one remained at the location. Then Seok-tao notices something about his colleague. She was unusually serious. His phone suddenly rings in his pocket. He turns on the screen and discovers that they had found living victims of human sacrifice at Mount Bangwa. Seok-tae is shocked by this, but there was no time to stand still. The scene shifts to some corner of the big city. Changxian was swinging the rusty sword, testing its movements. Pablesag didn't like the fact that he brought that disgusting thing. Ignoring the goddess, the protagonist knew that this was something special. After all, it was the legendary divine sword called Yuchang. This was one of the 9 supreme swords created by the first Uyezi, the divine blacksmith. Unfortunately, it was impossible to see its effects. Such blades were so coveted that when one of them fell into Arcadia, a massive war broke out to obtain it. That war ended up destroying 2 empires and 6 kingdoms. Chang Xian couldn't believe that something so powerful had been used just to stoke a fire. Furthermore, Yu Cheng was originally a weapon used by assassins, and its appearance was not very well known. He finds it ironic that a divine blacksmith, famous for hating the sight of bloodshed, would create a weapon for assassination. Regardless, the weapon's characteristics have been forcibly erased, as if someone wanted to destroy it. Suddenly, Chang Xian's admiration is interrupted by something. He opens a window while hearing Pabilsag complain about the rusty sword, and Minerva express her satisfaction. He raises his hand to shoulder height, palm open. He comments that it would be great to have all 9 supreme weapons for himself. Then he equips the dagger made from the fang of Fire Tiger. Chang Xian stands still as if waiting for the movement of his new stalker. Seeing that nothing happens, he throws his weapon. The dagger tears through the air toward its target. It was aimed at a tree in the middle of the garden. It strikes firmly into the wooden trunk. It seems that young Jun was camouflaging himself but failed miserably at the stealth check, and was still a bit annoyed at being attacked, even though he narrowly dodged it. Suddenly, Chang Xian quickly advances, not wanting to give his new opponent any chance to counterattack. The protagonist's eyes were as dark as a demon god of war. That gaze surprises the Xianshi swordsman, when Tiamat's fang was just a few centimeters away from touching him. He draws his weapon. The blades collide in a violent greeting of steel, forging a sudden sun that shatters the darkness of the night. Young Jun struggles to hold back Chang Xian's heavy attack, unable to believe how a rookie had so much power. The protagonist prepares another strike. Holding his scimitar, the black Shamshir tries to create space between them by retreating, but the tyrant dictates the pace of the fight with his attacks. The black swordsman realizes that his opponent had no martial technique or any recognizable pattern. Even so, he couldn't find any flaw in his fighting style. Young Jun tries to deflect his sequence of attacks, impressed by how Chang Xian fought more like an assassin. Then he reflects. The protagonist moved more like a veteran of the first generation of players. Counterattacking with his scimitar and failing to land any blow, he reveals that he only wanted to test this supposed rookie. However, at this rate, he might very well fall to the ground if he doesn't fight seriously. So he clenches his teeth, knowing that he might end up irritating his niece with what he intended to do. Now he wanted to take this duel to a new level, awakening a blue aura on his sword. Young Jun was serious about this. This would be a legendary battle. Chang Xian notices the change in his opponent's behavior. Even so, he doesn't hesitate. The attacks of the 2 combatants were about to collide, until someone gives up. Young Jun stands with his hands up and his scimitar on the ground. Chang Xian gets irritated that his fight was interrupted so abruptly. With a fox-like look, the black Shamshir realized he was going too far and reveals that he only wanted to test him. The protagonist looks at the sword on the ground, disappointed that his excitement for a worthy opponent was wasted. Young Jun lowers his head and apologizes, confessing that he was finding it a bit fun. Pabilsag provokes the tyrant to continue the fight, but Chang Xian was more interested in knowing who that man was. The Sideburns guy gets slightly offended by the protagonist's informal tone, but prepares to pull something from his coat, and shows his business card uncomfortably close. On it are his name and the revelation that he is a member of the Osun clan. With a cordial smile, the swordsman invites him to the clan. Chang Xian remembers that they served the nameless giant whose true title was Yuapwang, a deity of fortune. The protagonist responds that he didn't like the violent approach and asks how they found out about him. Young Jun reveals that he was already quite famous among the clans. Hearing that, the tyrant didn't expect his fame to spread so quickly. Wearing a cordial smile, the black Shamshir prefers to leave this conversation for another day when Chang Xian is calmer. As he walks away, Pabilsag still wants to see blood. Jormungandr tells her to stop and go fight somewhere else. The goddess gets offended and blah blah blah. For some reason, that man in black clothes seemed familiar to him. But a thought popped into Chang Xian's mind. If one of these guys came looking for him, it means something worrying. Thinking about that, he runs back home, knowing that other recruiters could be looking for him too. Before that, we see Young Gun's hand bleeding and all bruised. The swordsman smiles, looking like he wanted to fight even more. Chang Xian arrives home, and his mother immediately asks if he's eaten yet. With a slight serene smile, she asks if the youngest has something to say. The protagonist calls out to his mother again, and intended to say something to her. Somewhere at an unknown time and in a distant land, the evening sun illuminated the skies with its splendor. A man with a tired appearance was standing, and his killing intent was already noticed by someone. He looks back with nearly dead, exhausted eyes, telling the old man to leave, but is met with insults. The man gets irritated, asking that old geezer to shut up. Then he takes a sudden hit from the elder and falls to the ground. Before losing consciousness, the last thing he saw was that bastard's smile. Then he wakes up with his phone beeping. Next, his ugly little dog. He doesn't get up, looking like he's drowning in deep nostalgia, even knowing what he needs to do. His mind questions that dream, but there's no time for it. Today is the day of the interview with the White Tigers. The White Tigers were holding their recruitment at a large sports stadium, and we can see many people entering it. Inside, various participants were making their preparations for the test. A bald evaluator with sunglasses asks someone to place their hand on a measuring device. The arm of someone with a familiar colored sleeve approaches the machine. As soon as it touches, the machine releases a huge burst of smoke, scaring everyone nearby. Then we get a glimpse of who that guy was. needless to say who. The device sparks and repeatedly says it's unable to measure. The hooded figure seems impatient, but it's hard to tell from afar. This mess catches the attention of some people, especially a bandaged guy with a spear on his back, who seemed to be watching the incident closely. After receiving a new device, the evaluator asks Chang Xian to place his hand again. A pair of twins of different heights hear that name, which sounded familiar to the girl. Then she remembers with a surprised face, and recognizes her Appa the Tyrant, even though he was wearing a hood. Amid the crowd commenting about the ex-professional gamer, only the bandaged guy remains silent, staring at the protagonist. A pair of jealous men start saying nasty things about Chang Xian, and the girl calls them dried squids and tells them to look in the mirror. Apparently, those two intended to thin out the competition, starting with the protagonist. But after revealing the Terrence level 25 and magic rank at SSS+++, that group is left utterly shocked. Meanwhile, the bandaged guy seemed to be grinding his teeth beneath his wrappings. Chang Xian remained quiet, trying not to attract attention, but numbers don't lie, and the crowd isn't blind. Screams echo through the stadium. Those who try to justify their envy give up in fear, and the evaluators rush to call the directors. Meanwhile, in the Conquest Team 2 office, Jungwon was sitting, looking at a tablet. With his fake mustache exaggerated upwards, he was deep in thought, and looking at the news about the resignation of the High-Hof Conquest Department Chief, Go Sung-won. Chaeyeon, the Iron Witch, was making a public statement revealing there had been 21 sacrificial attempts over 7 years, and promises that the High-Hof clan will be punished. The White Tigers are also moving, declaring war on them and releasing access to their investigative news outlet. Jungwon is pleased that his clan managed to use the scapegoat well. However, there was also the mysterious fact of the man with the Ha-Ho mask who saved the sacrifices and took Peter's key. Whoever that was, the White Tigers needed to find him to recover the reward from that dungeon. A bald evaluator suddenly bursts into the room, shouting that they found a super rookie. Jungwon doesn't really care, but the bald man warns him that 2 directors were already heading over to see the participant. That gets the mustache guy's attention, finding it strange that all this fuss is over one person. His subordinate mentions the name Li Changxian, the rookie he had been waiting for alongside the Black Shamshir and the Iron Witch. Remembering that, the matter finally catches his interest. Then the evaluator continues saying that the protagonist had registered, passed all the tests, and his magic rank was SSS+++. Something sparks in the fake blonde punk mustache guy, and he decides to recruit him right away. We change locations. Now we are in the test application area, which looked more like an arena. The news of the Tyrant's return is already spreading on social media. Chang Xian was talking with an evaluator. It seems that all examiners need to be bald to work in this. The protagonist gets irritated with the audience, remembering his pro-gamer past, and still has to endure the comments from envious people who couldn't do anything. But the tone of the conversation changes as many participants ended up regretting coming on the same day as him. Pablsag was already acting like a proud mother with her child receiving compliments, but Chang Xian notices 2 figures in a part of the bleachers that was completely empty. He seemed to understand very well why those seats had no one. Then a golden aura starts to take shape. It even gains the appearance of a large feline with fierce eyes. Chang Xian smiles as he sees his target appearing before him. The examiner starts talking about the next test. He says it will be a hunt where the participant can choose 2 monsters as targets. The protagonist wanted harder options. The most they could summon would be a dragon. This idea pleases the tyrant. The audience can't believe that he so easily accepted to fight such a high-level monster. The summoning of the creature begins and a giant magic circle appears in front of Chang Xian. The head of a beast emerges. It was a drake with scales as black as the fear of oblivion, with a face more demonic than reptilian. The monster was already looking at the protagonist, seeing him as prey. Then the submerged tiger, through obstacles, announces its interest in that battle. The audience already felt the creature's fear sinking into their hearts. It seemed too much for a recruitment test. Meanwhile, Hyuju seemed to be getting impatient, thinking that Chang Xian was frightened to see such a beast before him. But no, this went far beyond mere fear. He remembered the day of his judgment, humiliated and on his knees. The protagonist couldn't forget that face, that damn smiling face of that limping tiger, and the humiliating, unforgettable sound that wounded Chang Xian's ego. Hyuju's laughter. More motivated than ever thanks to his flashback, the protagonist's eyes shine with determination, and he challenges that fearsome creature to a face-to-face fight. The drake charged forward with its mouth like a living abyss and fangs that birthed oblivion. Chang Xian, standing silently, let time arm itself like the string of a bow about to snap. Then he pulls out a black cylinder from his inventory and throws it into the air. We go back a little in time and see the protagonist meeting someone. One of the first things the tyrant noticed was how tired the other person looked. This was Uyezi, with a worn-out appearance as if his life energy had been completely drained by work. He hands the black case to Chang Xian. We can also see that Wilson was well-fed, maybe even too much. The protagonist seemed a bit demanding about the quality. This irritates Uyezi, who asks him to test it himself. From inside the cylinder, 2 metal tubes and a roll of coiled ropes come out. Holding his new equipment, Pablsag and Jormungand are left speechless by the quality of those items. Chang Xian grabs the 2 rods and joins them together, with messages appearing revealing that it was a double-pole spear. A blade emerges from the tip of the weapon, and at the other end, another sharp point appears. The tyrant tests the equipment by doing several tricks, and the goddess of the hunt falls in love with his martial talent and praises the blacksmith. Fu Yeze carefully watched Chang Xin's spear movements. This time, the protagonist was practicing shadow fighting with his new weapon. With every thrust, it became even more evident. He is a master in the art of spear combat. Back to the present, the case was in the air and the dragon continued its attack. The audience couldn't take their eyes off that scene, which promised a horrifying end. The drake's attack hits the ground with force, scattering countless debris into the air. But something strikes the monster, and it hit right in both eyes, forcing the creature's head to recoil. The spectators couldn't see how the beast was injured, but Hyoju seems to have noticed. Park Sang-ho, leader of the first team, was observing the battle and realizes that Chang Xin's levels do not match his abilities. Furthermore, the mastery he demonstrated with his weapons made it clear that he could win even with a bow. Then he looks more closely at the back of that splendid warrior, and decides that he would recruit him at any cost. Chang Xin was focused on the fight and released the ropes tied to his bracelet using his magic. Windows pop up revealing that it was a whip nicknamed the Nameless Nine-Tail Feline. One of the spectators was curious. First a spear and now a rope, such a strange combination. The lines intertwined with the equipment embedded in the monster. As they came out, the blades tangled even deeper into the flesh. The dragon screamed to the skies, now blind and without the will to continue. But Chang Xin was not finished. He now pulled the ropes with all his strength. Taking advantage of the elastic force of the whip plus the support of the blades lodged in the drake, he jumped high into the air. In midair, he activated magic on one of the threads. The weapon's tips unrooted themselves from the monster. Suspended between the sky and the monstrous terror, Chang Xian summoned the fragments of the weapon back to his hands. He joined the rods together with lightning-fast precision. The enormous creature tried to flee, but it was useless. Chang Xian had already calculated where to land. Chang Xian danced through the air as gravity pulled him toward the beast's skull. Suddenly, a red fountain erupted into a rain of blood. The protagonist's thrust burst forth, forging a constellation, tracing an arc of stars born from Genesis. Then he used the monster as a catapult and jumped away. Upon touching the ground, the air shimmered in sync with the spear, which in Chang Xin's hands danced like a river of liquid gold. Even at the brink of death, the dragon entwined death into its tail, and with one last breath of fury, tried to whip the protagonist, but in vain. The tyrant's foot skidded across the ground after dodging the feral whip, generating a dry impact that echoed through the surroundings. The audience couldn't believe what they were witnessing. The battle was one-sided. On one side, a young man landed critical hits as if it were nothing. On the other, a dragon so wounded it looked like a limping lizard. Being called a monster, Chang Xian couldn't care less about those people. Activating his poisonous blood, he planned to end it once and for all. The creature suffered under the paralyzing effect of the poison produced by the tyrant. Before the end could steal its last breath, the dragon attempted a desperate attack, a final act of a calamity that refused to end. The protagonist responded with the same intensity, and delivered the finishing blow to that poor animal. The target of the attack exploded into a bright star, as if it were the incarnation of a celestial body on Earth. Shards flew gently through the air. Moving in a whirlwind, the monster's remains drifted in the explosion's wind. While leveling up, Chang Xian wore a smug face, showing that miserable tiger what he was capable of. The golden aura of the great feline analyzed him carefully. Then it praised his feats and started desiring him as an apostle. Sang-ho was filled with anxiety, wanting the young man, and ordered someone to bring him over. But a beam of light suddenly passed by his side. It seemed to be someone familiar to the leader of the first team. Chang Xian sensed the new presence approaching and witnessed the tiger's eye hunting him. Then a beam of light descended from the sky like a powerful shooting star. Zhang Guan introduced himself with an explosion of muscles, attacking the protagonist with a sword strike. With a feral smile overshadowed by his ridiculous mustache, he was impressed with Chang Xin's block. The protagonist felt disgusted having Hyoju's power touching his spirit. Then the muscle beast began to show his genuine interest in the tyrant's strength, and continued his ferocious attack, wanting to show what it meant to be a tiger. Chang Xian held back the attacks as best he could, wondering whether he should fight or save his energy until the Crimson Mountain range. The duel was interrupted by another voice. 3 claw marks fell from the sky like angry lightning. The powerful strikes separated the two duelists firm and far apart. Electrifying his aura even more, Zhang Guan challenged the new opponent. Park smiled at the challenge, saying he was being disrespectful to his Xianbei. The auras of the two tigers clashed simultaneously, creating a vortex of deadly energy. The audience stood in awe, watching the duel of wills between the two leaders. However, 2 more leaders joined the fight. Now the arena was in chaos, filled with roars and resolutions. None of them wanted to give up on recruiting the new super rookie. Chang Xian simply watched, smiling, hoping they would kill each other to make his life easier. The leaders kept fighting with their auras. They wouldn't give up, constantly challenging each other. The protagonist just watched them. If they killed each other, it would make his job of capturing Hyoju easier. Then a powerful aura interrupted the tigers' clash. The power was so strong it even made one of them bleed. Even Park and Zhang Guan were immobilized by the force. Hyunjin recognized it. A silhouette was hidden by the intense light of the newly arrived aura. This was the executive director, Oh Si-won. Chang Xian looked at that old man and started to feel a little intimidated. But it was no wonder. This old man was the second in command of the White Tigers, someone not to be underestimated. Suddenly, the protagonist's nose starts bleeding due to the sheer pressure of power, and he realizes why he was called a high ranker. As Si-won walked around lecturing his subordinates, Chang Xian couldn't see any way to defeat him. Jang Won was already near his limit trying to withstand the old man's aura, thinking he had an advantage in securing the recruit. Then the executive director tells everyone to leave. However, the mustache guy remained optimistic that he would be favored. But the slate old man decides to recruit Chang Xian for himself, and even makes up a lame excuse for it. The quartet of idiots stands there, jaw-dropped at the audacity of the damned old man. Some time passes after all that mess, and now we are in the executive director's office. The protagonist was changing clothes, and the gods were quite interested in this scene. But it wasn't just the deities looking at Chang Xian's body. The sleazy old man was also admiring his physique. Si-won finds it curious to see so many scars and well-defined muscles on a rookie, assuming he had a lot of experience. Beyond being interested in his physique, he was also curious about his past. But that wasn't the topic now, and he calls the tyrant's attention. As the guardian patron of the clan, he was interested in him, and the old man asks what he wanted. Chang Xian now wore clothes very similar to those of the Twilight of the Gods, and he thought about the question he had been asked. He reveals that he had enough money to live for the rest of his life and could spend as much as he wanted. So he asks to go to the future strategy department, and insinuates that he wanted to be the head of that section. Si-won makes a terrifying expression and asks what he meant by that. But right after, the old man starts laughing and releases his aura. The more he laughed, the more energy came out as if he wanted to intimidate Chang Xian. The worst part, it was working. Then the executive director understands that the young man would only stay in the clan if he could be a leader. He even liked seeing such ambition. He then explains that this department was the marrow and brain of the clan, and he would need to do something to earn that position. Chang Xian offers to achieve a new record in the Crimson Mountain Range. There was a dungeon in that place used to test new members, and the protagonist wanted to prove he would be the best of all in terms of score. Si-won asks if he wasn't aiming to be just the best among the rookies in the clan, but rather the best of the entire dungeon. The tyrant confirms. That way, no one could oppose him becoming the head of a department. Chang Xian notices something strange about this conversation. The old man was stalling. Then he understands there was something more to gain from this offer, and he adds another proposal. He will clear the dungeon. This catches Si-won's attention significantly. With a different sparkle in his eyes and a mischievous smile, he says it would be a great idea to switch dungeons for training rookies. Chang Xian looks at that expression and knows he was right to suspect this conversation, promising that he will do the task in secret. The old man insinuates that this won't be the last covert mission he'll undertake. Now that the pieces were on the table just as he wanted, the protagonist makes another request. He wants to use the clan's library. Seeing that this young man doesn't just waste time watching TikToks, he likes hearing that and allows him to use it. Some time passes and rumors about Li Changxian are already circulating all over the internet, including the one that he cleared the Jamsil portal. Interviews even began with the survivors of that portal, starting with the hairpin girl who wanted to see him again. Besides her, they also interviewed Park Ha-seong, who, for some reason, was entirely censored as if he were part of Rule 34. But back in the executive director's office, a male voice was shouting, looking for the man. It was Jung-won himself, crying like a girl wanting to see her K-pop idol. Si-won reminds him that this is still a clan, and he could lose his position if he keeps insisting like that. Then the mustache guy asks why his request had been denied so many times. The old man calmly says that a guy like that is impossible to stop, but promises to offer the mustache one an observer position. That nonsense was enough to convince Jung-won, who now stopped crying. But he still wanted to see him and asks where the man went. Si-won replies that he locked him up in a place inaccessible to a brute like him. A few days later, somewhere outside the city, someone arrived at that place. Chang Xian was staring at a gigantic mountain range, contemplating the idea of completing that dungeon. Then he notices something strange. Behind the mountain, there was something that looked like a purple wing moving. The protagonist seemed to recognize it. However, something was lurking among the leaves. Someone was watching him. The strange creature leaps from the top of the mountain. It lit up the sky with a slightly red hue, and Chang Xian just watched it from below. The wind unleashed by the beast blew dirt and leaves into the protagonist's face, who now turned his head away from the countless debris. But that didn't stop him from witnessing its majesty and figuring out the shape of the strange creature. After all, that thing was the target of the mission, which consisted of eliminating a magical power that deformed creatures. Even so, the protagonist had time to admire the entire mountain range in red. However, that color brought him macabre memories of Arcadia. At least he wasn't alone appreciating the scenery. Someone or something was stalking him using the skill of gentle breeze. A frustrated man with a messy look and a blazer was hiding behind the trees. Chang Xian reveals that he was one of the stalkers who had been watching him in the library and now followed him through the mountains. It seems the executive director didn't trust him that much after all. A few days earlier in the massive library of the White Tigers, the protagonist was admiring the size of that place. And he remembered a conversation with Thanatos discussing Hyoju. The god of the underworld wanted to know more about the behavior of the Tigers' followers. Chang Xian replied that they probably mimicked the behavior of their patron deity, creating adversity wherever they went. But Thanatos revealed that they also plundered their enemies and put them on display in a single place. That place was the White Tiger's own library. Then he even offered a list of things that might be useful to him. The protagonist immediately refused and decided to do it alone. But the god assured him that there would be something very interesting in that offer. Then he mentioned the 12 zodiac houses, the Sagittarius step art. Chang Xian was impressed to hear that. This was divine authority capable of transforming the user into pure light. The god of the underworld spoke of a list of movement skills from that art but highlighted the advent call. Sagittarius would go to war if it knew someone had that technique. The protagonist asked how he found out about this. Thanatos insinuated that it was pretty obvious who leaked it, so it really came from a falling star. Back to the library flashback, Chang Xian knew what to search for, but realized it wouldn't be easy. The advent call was a powerful skill capable of gaining control over a region and projecting one's divinity there. It would certainly be useful for the protagonist to obtain such authority. The problem was he was being constantly watched. But even so, he needed to proceed with his search. Until someone started explaining how the library hours worked. A guy in a suit approached Chang Xian, explaining the rules. And right after that, he asked for an autograph. But the tyrant realized the guy was just a guard placed there by the executive director, and he ignored him. Remembering Thanatos' recommendation about the exhibition room, which was a copy from the Single Horn clan, Chang Xian activated his unshakable heart, and then immediately activated the serene spirit. Now he focused like a college student finishing their thesis at the last minute. A few days passed. Siwan's watcher was still continuing his stalking, and all he learned was watching Chang Xian pick up martial arts books and other random ones. He went as far as reading books about movement techniques to books about myths, but sometimes he just grabbed them and put them back. Then he started to worry about what he would report to the executive director. But there was indeed something he could say. Chang Xian seemed to be trying hard to look like he was doing something, but actually did nothing. Tired of this stalker job, he cried in frustration, hoping the protagonist would just leave. While the other was getting frustrated, the tyrant remained still and quiet. But his immobility only hid a mind consumed by concentration, absorbing knowledge. The knowledge was so vast that warnings started popping up, advising him to rest his mind or insanity would take over. And even so, he continued his studies and received an achievement, leveling up his stats related to intelligence and willpower. But more importantly, his knowledge about the tiger submerged in adversity increased. Right after that, a window from Hyoju appeared, announcing that he was closely watching him. With an ironic tone inside his head, Chang Xian called him an idiot. The goal was only to find the advent call, but the protagonist also wanted the skill trees of his enemy. For that, he needed to find clues about the White Tiger's powers in the books written by members of the clan. This way, he could piece together everything and figure out the weaknesses in Hyoju's combat capabilities and those of his allies. Then messages popped up, notifying the creation of a new skill. Chang Xian was creating a technique specifically designed to defeat the Divine Tiger, but he was already tired and had a sore neck from reading so much, deciding that it was enough and there was nothing else to learn in that section. However, that still wasn't there. The advent call wasn't in any of the available sections. It was probably in restricted sections 1 and 2. Anyway, there were still 3 hours left of free access to the library, so it was better to use the time and search more. The unshakable heart was reaching its limit, but the serene spirit strengthened his mindset, pulling more from his mental capacity. Then, while searching through the books, he felt something strange and sinister. It seemed he had finally found what he was looking for. A cookbook with monster meat recipes. With childlike eyes, he began reading the book, literally upside down. But he discovered something different from the advent call. Thus, Chang Xian started deciphering the message. A person with a feminine appearance and long white hair was kneeling on the floor, bound by long black rods. Their eyes were bleeding, and they seemed to want to leave something behind for someone. According to the book, Mun Xiong betrayed someone who was very close to him, someone who called him brother. Chang Xian read that name, and seemed to recognize it very well. He was the Tiger of the Celestial Sword. This man was one of the 9 strongest swordsmen in the world, one of the founders of the White Tigers, and an apostle of Hyoju. Chang Xian found it strange that someone referred to this person as a brother. Mun Xiong's origin was said to be that of a mercenary who became an apostle, but if the book told the truth, then his origin was a lie. The story continued. The entity revealed itself as Hanyu, the older brother of the Tiger of the Celestial Sword, but then contradicted itself, saying it was no longer his older brother. A long time ago, he was the successor of a little-known clan and a swordsman who trained his swordsmanship every day. But one day, something changed in his routine. His master adopted a much younger disciple. It was a boy with delicate features, thick eyelashes, and a serious expression. However, the tutor was already too old and became sicker every day, forcing Hanyu to take care of the young boy. There were 2 regrets from that seemingly peaceful time: not knowing what was hidden in little Xiong's heart, and not knowing the intentions of the guardian star of his clan, the tiger submerged in adversity. Unfortunately, that divine feline was a lover of war and conflict, something Hanyu could not accept in his policy of seeking peace. That God could end everything and choose another apostle. However, Hyoju still depended heavily on that clan's support, and this became evident when his apostle drew his sword. Seeing his older brother release all that energy just by unsheathing the sword, Xiong was impressed. Then that burst of light turned into a whirlwind in the form of a projectile. The tiger was forced to defend itself. At that moment, it wasn't capable of choosing another apostle. apostle, and the only thing it could do was grit its teeth in frustration. Hanyu was certain he had chosen the best path, but his younger brothers seemed to have other plans and decided to do something. Chang Xian remembered a rumor about Hyoju having gone through a period of weakness and concluded that in reality he had been sealed. Apparently, the tiger was paralyzed for 100 years due to this incident with the Celestial Sword clan. The religion of that divine feline spreads chaos and disaster across the world, leading Hanyu to adopt a policy of peace, the protagonist assumes. His library stalker was still watching him, finding it bizarre to see him reading a book upside down. Back to the story of the monster's grand one, the coup plan against the clan had been brewing for a long time. Without realizing it, Hanyu had been slowly poisoned throughout his life, and was dying slowly to the point where he couldn't even lift a sword. But at the moment of reckoning, Mun Xiang left him alive, and simply abandoned him in a cave, limiting his movements and stripping him of his magical power. Hanyu cried for his brother, tears of loneliness, abandonment, and pain from the betrayal of his former relative, and realized that the tiger's star was changing owners, creating a new apostle. After that, he was forced to witness the traitor receiving the title of Celestial Sword and destroying his home to build the White Tiger's headquarters. He even disobeyed the final order from his master to never step out into the world, causing chaos and terror for another 10 years. But one day, something was calling him. Directing his weakened gaze toward the entity, a voice reached him. Chang Xian grew curious to know whose voice that was, but the book ended there. So he assumed the rest of the story must be hidden somewhere in the library. Suddenly, a window popped up right in front of his face, saying he had found a hidden piece. Then he received the will of an unknown being and had an increase in the progress of his skill creation. Chang Xian couldn't believe that the development of his technique increased by 12% just because he deciphered a hidden mystery. Another message appears, asking him to find the other hidden pieces. The protagonist realizes he's not dealing with a puzzle made by a mortal. He concludes that whoever is probably was the one who spoke with Hanyu. But there wasn't much time left, only 2 hours remained. Starting to run like crazy, he assumes the books must be coded so they wouldn't be discovered by the tigers. But they were made in a way that if one was decoded, the rest would be easier to find, so they should be in the same section. As Chang Xian moved so fast that he created afterimages, his stalker was still crying for not getting an autograph. The tiger's window suddenly appears, saying it believes in the protagonist's potential to be its disciple, without realizing what was happening. Now he touches his shelf and feels something strange. He had found another piece. The voice said that Hanyu was like him, someone who was betrayed by someone close, devoured by his own son, only to be reduced to a wandering evil spirit. These two tragic beings had the same enemy. Chang Xian widens his eyes, wondering if that was Hyoju's father. Then he grins sinisterly, uncovering a hidden truth buried long ago. Excited by his discoveries, he continued reading. It was revealed that the tiger submerged in adversities was a monster who devoured his own family to achieve godhood. The entity's voice wished for the downfall of that monstrosity, and thus it could finally rest in peace. So Hanyu was taught techniques to destroy the divine feline. Using this knowledge, he recovered to the point of regaining his vigor. From there, he began his training, practicing the techniques he had learned and reforging his body. As soon as his brother returned from a trip, he knew what had to be done. This time, with his new blade and refined powers, he would eliminate him without hesitation. With a gigantically long saber attached to his forearm and a sharp, confident gaze, Hanyu challenged the tiger submerged in adversities, then began his quest for revenge in the middle of the night, jumping from rooftop to rooftop. Landing on a terrace, his heart was still unsure whether he could kill his former brother, who was his beloved disciple and also his former adoptive son. So he left his wish encoded into countless pieces, a hope for the future. And thus, one day, a new Avenger might continue his vengeance. Chang Xian closed the last manuscript with a strong expression on his face. It seemed that the will of that being had taken root in the protagonist's heart, giving him some compassion for that story. Then he received a new authority, the first claw of the god of the Black Mountain, granting him 4 abilities. First is mass bleeding, capable of causing incurable wounds to the enemy. Second is chain attack, allowing the use of abilities consecutively, without worrying about cooldown. Third is accumulative impact, buffing his attacks while casting abilities successively. And lastly, permutable skills, which allow him to hide his skills within others or combine them. But even with all these abilities, Hanyu's fate seemed more than certain that night. He would be defeated by the Celestial Sword. But setting that story aside, Chang Xian analyzed this authority and concluded that these were counterattack techniques, and planned to use them together with the abilities acquired from the White Tigers, combining aggression and passiveness. Since both came from the same origin, they should create a powerful combination. Even so, the skill carried deep resentment as it came from a dead divinity whose name was no longer remembered. But the biggest problem with using his new powers was the mana cost. Chang Xian could only use one of them without exhausting himself too much. So the protagonist began his journey planning to get elixirs at the training institute. Unfortunately, the advent call would have to be left for another better opportunity. Back to the Crimson Mountain Range, Chang Xian walked through the Red Forest, heading towards the dungeon, thinking about the quest's difficulty and the mission given by O. However, something never left his sight, even though he really wanted it to. The library stalker was still following him using the gentle breeze skill, looking like a cockroach sneaking around the trunks. The protagonist felt a bit irritated, wanting to get rid of this spying insect. Song Yoo-jun realized he had been noticed and simply told him to pretend he hadn't seen him and focus on training. Chang Xian couldn't get rid of him without raising suspicion, so he planned to do so when the first opportunity arose. After walking a bit, he finally arrived at the dungeon's safety zone. Not even a minute passed before he became the center of attention. The protagonist lowered his head, enduring the wide-eyed stares of those who recognized him. Others repeated the same mix of fear and a certain admiration they had when watching him during his test. Chang Xian starts analyzing the people around and realizes that only 3 people would be useful there. The twin girl from the trio of idiots notices the gaze of her idol and blushes, leaving her brother and the other teammate embarrassed. She lets out a scream so high-pitched with excitement that it could shatter glass, even making the protagonist uncomfortable. But another participant catches Chang Xian's attention. It was the strange person with long hair and a bandaged face. The tyrant remembers something about this individual. His name was Bak Gyao. Apparently, he had received another blessing from some deity, or so the rumors said. Suddenly, an examiner, bald obviously, calls the participants' attention. Everyone falls silent and is seen as profound as a silent film playing at maximum volume, serving only to waste space in the chapter. Then the wax head announces the start of the 26th White Tiger recruit training. Meanwhile, elsewhere, the news of the tyrant participating in the test was already arriving on someone's phone. A familiar ponytail appears grabbing the smartphone, and it seemed that something concerning was about to happen for him. Young Jin was sitting at his desk with a very serious face until he heard someone calling him uncle. Nervous and trembling, he responds, saying he would get autographed photos of YTS. Then the voice gets irritated and says she hates him. The black chanter panics and tries calling her repeatedly, but the call of it's hung up in his face. Then he slumps, placing his hand over his forehead. Having watched his niece grow up, he felt like a second father to her. And the day he heard about her disappearance in the Jamsil portal, Young Jin was extremely shocked. It was impossible to save her beyond the dungeon's collapse. So he started praying to his divine patron as much as he could. Then one of his subordinates came with good news, saying his niece had returned alive. He spun dramatically in slow motion, with snot and tears gushing from his face like a faucet, relieved. Now recomposed and with his dignity clean from the snot, he meets with Haibin and asks who had saved her. The girl realizes that Chang Xian didn't want to be bothered, thinking it was better to wait for him to show up to reward him. So Young Jin plans to look for him as a recruiter and later thank him for saving his dear niece. The teenager hears the idea and happily says that her uncle is the best in the world, cheering up the old man. Back to the present, he remembers the moment he first met the supposed hero. And the first impression was, let's say, quite shocking and metallic. He even considered fighting for real, activating all his abilities. And because of that, he probably irritated him. At least he hoped to get a call after giving him his business card. He agrees that doing only that was a terrible decision for networking. He regrets it even more after seeing him join the White Tigers and learning that he was an SSS+++ rank. Curiously, for someone as strong as Young Jin, he didn't notice Chang Xian's power that day. But the worst of all was receiving calls from his beloved niece, saying she hated him for losing her savior. Continuing his dramatic monologue, the swordsman blames himself, saying maybe he was too lazy in his recruitment. But the issue that filled his schedule was the accident with the Haihoff clan. Otherwise, he would have tried recruiting the Terran already. The problem now was getting close to someone as famous as him. Back at the Crimson Mountain Range, a female voice echoed like a car alarm gone wild, all because she was noticed by her Xian Bei. Drooling and with starry eyes of fascination, she wouldn't mind dying of happiness. Her twin brother mocks her expression, saying her appa wouldn't want a drooling girl staring at him. Well, she couldn't help being like that after having the luck to be near her idol. Then the boy notices something about his group leader, Kim Hyun-jun. He had a grim expression. Noticing his shorter friend's gaze, he simply responds that it's nothing, and changes the subject, saying they are about to reveal the training guide. An examiner announces that he will talk about the most important parts of how the training will be conducted. Then a window expands, showing 10 rules for all players to follow. In the first months, they will also learn 3 basic techniques of the White Tigers. In this test, everything is allowed as long as it's not illegal. First of all, it's time to learn the abilities. 3 scrolls, auras, steps, and calamity of the tiger are distributed to all participants. The twin trembles, holding that in his hands, finally feeling like part of a renowned clan. The examiner instructs them to tear the items to absorb the knowledge of the techniques. Without hesitation, everyone obeys the command. The 2 brothers and the other people are excited about their new powers flowing through their veins. Then the bald man was about to start a presentation on how to use their new abilities, but something interrupted him. There was Chang Xian raising his hand, saying that he had already mastered everything. All of them are impressed by such a bold statement. The protagonist reveals that someone can skip the safe zone phase if they are able to perfectly use the tiger's abilities. None of the participants believe that. The bandaged one was just watching from afar, silent amidst so much conversation. But he seemed a bit interested in what Chang Xian had said. Once again, the girl from the Three Stooges turns into a bootlicker and starts drooling over the protagonist, making her team leader jealous. But Hyunjun was sure that the tyrant was just putting on a show, and he reveals that he is the son of an executive from the White Tigers and was informed that the protagonist hadn't acquired the scrolls beforehand. So he assumes that Chang Xian was just overconfident, thinking he could do it on the first try. Right after, he throws a strange look at Shin Unseo, imagining her reaction when she sees her appa failing miserably. The protagonist takes a deep breath and exhales very slowly. Something surprises Hyunjun. A huge golden energy envelops Chang Xian, who had activated the tiger's steps and aura. All this power condenses into the form of a massive golden feline, gaining mass every second. The people around couldn't believe it. Mastering so many abilities in such a short time was unbelievable. Hyunjun was the most shocked. But there was still one more ability to be shown: the tiger's threat. A fierce creature made of pure energy emerges from Chang Xian, scaring the people nearby. Even Beg, who previously behaved like a stoic worthy of respect, couldn't take his eyes off that power. The Stooges trio also watched with their jaws dropped. Then the protagonist performs a slash with his dagger, releasing a huge wave of energy during the movement. The attack was heading toward the poor evaluator, who didn't even have hair to stand on end from fear. Fortunately for the bald man, the strike missed by a few centimeters. That technique caused a huge explosion, spreading shrapnel everywhere. 3 giant marks appeared on the ground next to the examiner, looking like the claws of a giant tiger. In the background, the slash hit a victim, a monster that was hiding near the safety zone. In all these years in the recruit industry, it was the first time the bald man had witnessed someone of this level. Chang Xian shrugged, revealing that this was his first time doing this. The evaluator was left speechless. The participants reacted with a mix of envy and surprise, but everyone there came to one conclusion: that man had a self-esteem that defied gravity. Feeling a light breeze, Chang Xian looked, already knowing who was revealing themselves. Yujong dispelled her magic and showed her presence, asking if this was what he had spent so much time in the library for. Even feeling envious of seeing the guy mastering so many techniques that he himself took 10 years to learn, he began to admire him. Admiring his focus on studying even strange fields to develop his own talent, trying to go beyond the norm. Then he apologized for having misjudged him, thinking he was just wasting time in the library to pretend to be something he wasn't, and lowered his head, admiring the effort of that genius. Chang Xian remained silent, knowing that it was kind of a misunderstanding, but since it worked in his favor, why go against it? Everyone there swallowed the story as if it were true, thinking the problem was a lack of effort. Little did they know about the protagonist's privileges. Unseo didn't care about any of that. She was already hypnotized by the presence of her idol, as if he were covered in psychedelic glitter. Hyuju showed satisfaction in seeing his future apostle dedicating himself so much to mastering his talents. Meanwhile, Pavelsad just watched from the back of the theater, feeling isolated. Chang Xian pretended ignorance towards the goddess. Now that the demonstrations were done, the protagonist asked for permission to proceed with the dungeon. Having his evaluation approved, he arrogantly walked out of the safety zone. As he disappeared into the horizon, the rest of the participants stood silent, watching him leave. But a suspicious group seemed to have other objectives. Objectives far from benevolent. Some time passes, and we are deeper into the Crimson Mountain Range. Chang Xian arrives at a place, surrounded by a supernatural atmosphere, with twisted vegetation and full of crawling creatures that move like living shadows. The tigers seemed to know about the conversation with Siwon regarding clearing the dungeon, leaving the protagonist a bit apprehensive. The forest didn't help, the air made his body heavier, and the environment was extremely gloomy even during the day. Realizing that this wasn't the level for an ordinary player, he activates his 8 trigrams Earn Fire to cleanse his body of curses. Right after, he uses the Unshakable Heart to protect his mind from attacks. Then, while assembling his spear, he uses the Serene Spirit to stay calm even in the face of adversity. The serpent was already watching closely, curious about what Chang Xian was planning. A silence settles in the air like the last breath before thunder. Tattoos of black claws appear on the protagonist's face. He had discovered something nearby. He activates the tiger's step and starts channeling power. Using a spear technique, he throws a spinning thrust in one direction, then fires an energy blast from the tip of his weapon, causing a massive area explosion. From that explosive destruction, a grotesque monster emerges, screaming in pain. It seems Chang Xian hit the right spot of the one-legged ghouls. Immediately afterwards, several one-legged creatures flee, hopping far away from the protagonist. As a swarm of horrors fled behind him, the protagonist realized he had found what he was looking for. Then a black, sticky-looking aura starts leaking from his body. As the dark power coursed over his skin, something began to change within him. Now his eyes were those of a beast focused on its prey, and he decides to test something before searching for his objective: the claw of the Black Mountain God. Chang Xian prepares to unleash his new power. With a swing of his weapon, a wave of black magic is thrown forward, and the army of fleeing creatures is completely disintegrated, even though he had just finished performing his move. The attack continued for a long distance, destroying everything in its path like a war tempest. As he watched the consequential flames from Chang Xian's actions, the tiger found it marvelous, not realizing the origin of the technique. After that test, the protagonist lets out a tired sigh, having spent half of his mana in the process. Now that he saw the power of the Black Mountain God's claws, it was time to search for what he wanted. Suddenly, a ghoul emerged emerges from the fire, performing a surprise attack, but is easily defeated by Chang Xian's sharp whip. Then he activates his viper eyes. Wielding his weapon as if it were an extension of his soul, he made it dance with the deadly grace of an enraged serpent. The more monsters he defeated, the more loot he collected. Then after finishing his massacre, he activates the Soul Collector. While absorbing the ashes of his fallen enemies, something else catches his attention. A strange flower with open eyes was watching him, and then quickly hid, returning to normal. With eyes wide open like two fried eggs and mouth nearly drooling like a dog staring at a barbecue, he spots his meal. The plant trembles in the presence of that omnivore who looked at it like a hungry predator on a buffet Black Friday. But hiding its eyes is useless when its roots couldn't move, and in the end, it was grabbed by the stem. Without a single drop of mercy, Chang Xian pulls it until all the roots come out, performing a botanical fatality. Every petal of the screaming flower threw slaps with the precision of a drunken kung fu master and the fury of a clumsy anteater. Watching the effort of that small living being reminds him of something from the past. When he spoke with the elders, one of the old men called him crazy for wanting to increase the fire of the 8 trigrams urn. Then he removes his hood, revealing an elder with a bizarre appearance and an eye patch, saying it was madness to turn that sacred healing item into a weapon. But even so, he agrees to teach a method for that madness. In reality, the idea was simple. It would only require adding more fire to the fire. However, he explains that the additional flame would need to be strong and cruel, and he points to a monster to be used in this process, the Spectre of the Obstinate, also known as Jigui. While holding tightly the flower with bulging eyes, Chang Xian remembers the creature the elder mentioned. It's the same being he saw at the peak of the mountain in the Crimson Mountain Range, a specter that moved like a living flame, flying toward an unknown destination. With a thirsty smile, he had already set his next target, but he would need to increase the embers of the urn to turn them into raging flames, so he would need to eat poisonous flowers. In a horrifying scene for sun worshippers who use photosynthesis, Chang Xian devoured the plant in one bite. But that wouldn't be his only pot to eat. An enormous botanical buffet awaited him to fuel the fire of his goal. As he chewed the roots, he rejoiced in having his magical capacity increase and his bonfire ignited. Far from being the end, the flowers screamed the end of times with the arrival of the vegan shark, Li Changshan. As he walked through the forest, he annihilated all the ghouls and consumed the flowers he found like a T-Rex that had just discovered soy meat. Ignoring the pleas of his divine stalkers, he looks up and is impressed by the size of something. It was a tall mountain with waterfalls cascading over the rocks, standing imposingly like a sleeping giant. Chang Xian climbs it until he reaches the top, and finds the nest of a huge creature. This was the resting place of Jigui. Looking at it, he remembers the teaching of the second elder, telling him that this beast had no form and at the same time had one. The protagonist asks if this Schrodinger's abomination was some kind of undead. The weird old man thinks for a moment it would be better to define it as a living colony of specters, representing fire and death. Then Chang Xian asked if it had some kind of core, and the second elder replied that there was something that behaved like a core. The red eye of this beast was the resentment of thousands of ghosts crystallized into a gem. The protagonist wanted that gem to change the properties of the embers in the 8 trigrams urn, so he starts his plan, setting some traps around the nest. Meanwhile, someone was looking at a list of those approved. A hairy examiner is shocked by the rookies approved this year. They seem to be influenced by Chang Xian somehow. But elsewhere in the forest, the silhouette of a trio of men was asking if they were in the right place. One of them confirms that this was the trail of destruction left by the tyrant. But one of them was impatient and orders the others to think of a plan to start the hunt for Li Changshan. Something was moving quickly through the Red Forest. It was the group of envious ones who were hunting for Changshan. Two of the group argued about the protagonist's powers, whether they were real or just a privilege they didn't know about. The chubbier one asks if the clan's supervisors wouldn't interfere if they found out about their plans. Then the one with the scar on his mouth reveals that the white tigers only pretend to be defenders of justice, but are actually mercenary assassins. In the player industry, the term assassin was used to define an organization of people willing to kill for pleasure or money. The one with the goatee was already coveting Changshan's money and his family's wealth. However, the chubby one reveals his hesitation, not wanting to mess with someone who had done nothing to anyone yet. Upon hearing that, his two companions glare at him with the fury of a beast. This scares him, forcing him to stop. Then he tries to explain, saying that causing trouble without reason would only bring bad consequences to the original plan. The main objective of that group was to steal the Pearl of Illusions. With that item, the High House could rise again against the White Tigers. But the two feel offended, thinking their chubbier ally was underestimating them. Releasing a red aura from their eyes, they glare at him and ask if he prefers to die or to kill. Upon hearing the answer, kill, both calm down and promise to wipe him out if he keeps talking nonsense. Then they continue on their way, leaping with their power. The chubby one still thinks it's a bad idea, but he had no choice but to follow them, and he jumps trying to keep up with the pair. Meanwhile, during the night of a waning moon, we are in the mountains of the Crimson Mountain Range. A loud noise echoes in the air, followed by a massive explosion. Chang Xian had captured another monster in his trap, But it wasn't just one. Other creatures also started getting caught around the mountain range. Even having captured more than a Pokemon master, the main beast still hadn't appeared. 10 days had already passed without a single sign of the obstinate specter. The only conclusion to be made at this point was that the beast had left. Realizing he wouldn't gain anything there, he would have to search for the monster on his own. Suddenly, he jumps off a rock. It seems he decided to finish what needed to be finished. When he landed on the pile of straw, a massive explosion rose into the air, and a human sound came from the wreckage. There was someone else there with Chang Xian. It was the bandage boy, Bet Gaio. Staring at his new challenger, the protagonist asks what he wanted in that place. Regardless of the answer, the young spearman had seen too much and would have to be eliminated from this world. Making a devilish face, he threatens him and prepares his attack. Like a lightning bolt slicing through the fog of fate, Gaio's blue eyes capture the flight of the metal heading toward his forehead. But he manages to raise his arm with sudden strength, clashing iron against iron and creating an anthem of sparks between dagger and spear. The two metals intertwine in a symphony of annihilation, blowing chaos into a unison chant. Chang Xian admires the spear skills of his new challenger, believing he is at level 36. Immediately after, the protagonist gains the advantage, advancing through the gaps in his rival's defense. Unable to withstand the steel hurricane of his opponent, Jiao retreats and grows apprehensive with his throat being targeted by the red dagger. Sensing his opponent's mistake, the tyrant launches his blade in a final attack. This time, the bandage boy had no way to block the strike, so he activates a black aura in his hand. Seeing that, Chang Xian steps back. Jiao takes advantage of the situation and prepares his attack against the protagonist. A blast of dark energy is fired, but misses by an inch. The tyrant dodges the attack, throwing the bandaged one off balance. Chang Xian grabs a different weapon in his left hand, then prepares to counterattack. The blade comes very close to Jiao's ocean-colored eyes. Then a lightning strike explodes the bandages off his face. Still with his eyes closed, he feared for his uncertain future. But he realizes that he is still alive, with his face intact and a completely rusted sword touching his neck. Chang Xian begins to ask a question, asking how he is capable of using the authority of the Shadow's secret technique. Jiao is surprised to meet someone else who knows that name. The protagonist didn't want to reveal the truth, remembering something from the past, when his life was nothing but daily fights and wars in Arcadia. There were people he couldn't trust his back to. But one day, they abandoned him after he went insane, yet he still considered them a precious memory. The goddess of slaughter and destruction, the 1,000-year sleeping dragon, the lion of blood and iron, and Xerxes, the wandering shadow. Xerxes was a peculiar deity who mastered only one authority, being unique in the universe. Recalling an old memory, the power of his former friend could not have been learned by anyone else. So he finds it strange that this dying boy possesses this ability. Chang Xian believes that Hyoju wouldn't recognize the authority due to the inferior quality used by the human. The bandaged one insists on getting an answer to his question, but the protagonist wants to be answered first. Furious, Black Gaio decides to force the answer out of his rival's mouth, determined to learn what he is hiding. The long-haired bandaged man roars as he attacks. Firing multiple thrusts infused with black aura, he forces Chang Xian to deflect the attacks. Besides repelling the storm of black steel, the protagonist dodges the spear's advances. Irritated, Jiao demands answers. The tyrant joins his long weapon and decides not to kill his rival until he tells him more about how he obtained his friend's authority. The two weapon tips clash, creating a wave of energy capable of waking the entire forest. Jiao gets distracted seeing his opponent drawing his spear. Chang Xian takes advantage of this opening and jumps toward his rival, preparing a vertical strike. The long-haired bandaged one has no choice but to block. The attack is so strong that it bends the shaft of his weapon, but it was too heavy to keep blocking. So he retreats, letting his opponent's spear hit the ground, generating a massive explosion upon impact. However, by doing this, he only left space for Chang Xian to prepare his ability. The protagonist had combined Calamity and Tiger's steps into a single power. Immediately afterward, he activates the tiger's aura, creating a huge golden feline out of his energy. While preparing his attack, gripping the spear with both hands, he once again combines Hyoju's talents. Jiao no longer saw a human in front of him, it had become the true embodiment of the term Great Feline. Chang Xian advances quickly. His spear is blocked, but the sparks of his power manage to hit his opponent's spirit. Unable to bear the weight of the strike any longer, the bandaged man screams and is sent flying into a rock. The impact causes a chain reaction, sending waves of kinetic energy into the stone. Then, from within the smoke, Jiao emerges but heavily wounded, and the first thing he sees after being defeated is his opponent's blade pointed at him. But the tyrant pulls the weapon away from the disfigured face of that man, and Chang Xian looks down at him, victorious and imposing, like a master looking at his servant. Suddenly, the protagonist explains that he is a ghostborn, a hybrid between a human and a ghost. Jiao asks how he knows about this. The tyrant retorts, asking if knowing that is really important. Reflecting to himself, Chang Xian concludes that this power wasn't something he learned or stole, it was innate. And the power was genuine, pure from Xerxes. However, it was greatly weakened, as if his old comrade were losing his divine powers. Either way, Jiao was still a remnant of his precious friend, so he decides to adopt him for a while. Chang Xian hits the mark by revealing that his plan to use the Spectre's gem to cure his condition wouldn't work. The Ghostborn gets irritated and calls him ignorant, but the protagonist replies that he knows more than he does. The eyes on the disfigured face lose focus, still doubtful about the words he had heard. The tyrant argues that just by exchanging blows, he learned about his peculiar conditions, and that should be enough as proof. Then Chang Xian explains that the burn-like wounds are not something that the eye of the obstinate Spectre can heal. To begin with, those wounds did not come from the genetics of a fire being. Besides that, Jigwe is closer to the element of death than fire, having a ghostly ki much stronger than normal, so he asks if he really wants to go through with this. If he continues, he will either become a true ghost or a monster. Gyovo looks down, wanting to divert his gaze from the truth. Chang Xian notices the movement and guesses that he already suspected it wouldn't work. Then the disfigured boy kneels and cries, desperate for a cure to his condition, not knowing where to go. Amidst his tears, he hears a voice of hope saying that he would be healed. The protagonist offers the cure but wants something in return. Yael still couldn't process the speed of the events happening in that moment. Chang Xian wants the information he gathered about the obstinate Spectre and also offers a temporary alliance. The protagonist assumes that the Bandaged One had studied much more about that creature's routine, even more than himself. Suspicious, Gaio wants some guarantee in this contract, but the tyrant already offers him an upfront payment. Upon hearing that, all the young disfigured man can exclaim as a loud "what?" Then Chang Xian asks for his hand. Slowly and hesitantly he raises his fingers, but he is still in shock. The protagonist mentions that the distrust could be mutual since neither of them knew each other. While Gaio's arms still moved slowly, Chang Xian suddenly and firmly grabs his hand. He warns him that things are about to get a little spicy. Suddenly, a flame ignites, spreading throughout the Ghostborn's body. He starts wanting to scream in desperation, but Chang Xian warns him to grit his teeth and avoid messing up his magical circulation. Surrounded by fire and holding his lips as much as he can, he endures the hellish challenge. A message appears saying that the Ghostborn's status is being altered, and the curse is being slowly removed. For the first time in his life, Jael feels relief on his skin, which before only conveyed pain and shame. It was close, the sacred flames were almost reaching his Ghostborn heart. Just a little more, just a few centimeters left. But the embers had no strength left to continue, fading slowly. Not being used to this alien sensation of finally having skin, he is left perplexed and paralyzed by surprise. The protagonist helps him return to the real world, asking him to look in his own face. Bet Gaioel was now a reborn man with a face delicate like snow and hair like the veil of a blizzard. Observing his hand and its graceful details, that young man admires finally feeling normal. Even the two usual stalkers, Pavelsav and Jormungand, agree that the change was extraordinary. Chang Xian warns him that the curse wasn't completely removed, requiring constant treatment. But he explains that if he helps him hunt the obstinate Spectre, he will be able to increase the power of the divine embers and cure him completely. He even offers a mana contract as a form of guarantee. But Jiaowol refuses, saying that just being partially cured was enough to earn his trust. Chang Xian is satisfied with how things are going and grows interested in what he could do. Then his new companion asks how he should help. First of all, the protagonist asks him to speak more formally with him because it's strange that the son of his friend is treating him like a gamer buddy. With a surprised and disappointed face at such a mundane request, the Ghostborn accepts the order. Then they begin their hunt for the Jigwe, and Jael starts by teaching how to learn about the creature's habits, and explains that this monster behaves like a crow. Thus, the duo investigates the spectral beast's nest more thoroughly. Chang Xian's foot is the first to step into their target's hideout. Both discover a huge treasure filled with weapons, jewels, and gold. The protagonist assumes it was the loot from Jigwe's hunted prey, and Pavelsaid looks at it with greed in her eyes. Yael explains that Jigwe can differentiate high-quality items to bring to its nest, but tends to forget about them over time. Therefore, if they analyze the items buried there, it will be possible to discover the creature's next move. Then they discover a bow in the middle of that sea of shiny treasures. The weapon was the White Sparrow bow, capable of firing an arrow that pierces anything and shooting quintuple shots. Liking the forgotten arsenal of Jigwe, Chang Xian plans to put what is useful into his inventory and sell the rest. But there's another interesting item in that place. A floating orb releasing a macabre aura seemed to catch the protagonist's attention. It emitted a rotten stench that disgusted the tyrant. Even so, he collects it, and a window pops up explaining that it is the Pearl of Illusions, causing an effect of eternal fear. Endless fear, falling into a pit of hardships. It seemed like something that suited Hyuju. Then Jael appears saying that he discovered Jigwe's whereabouts. It seems that the beast was focused on hunting for food and had spent a lot of firepower doing it. Chang Xian assumes the monster went inside the mountain, hunting beings with stronger life force. Now with a clear objective, the protagonist is impressed by the skills of his temporary protege. Some time passes and the duo runs through the Crimson Mountain Range. Then 4 days later, they are in a necrotic territory, with twisted bones and monster remains scattered across that rotten ground. Seeing that scene, Chang Xian remembers something the second elder had taught him. That beast possessed an enormous thirst for greed and gluttony, far more than anything else in this world. And this was reflected in the bite marks on the massive fallen creatures in that place. Suddenly, a sharp, monstrous scream pierces the duo's ears. When they went to investigate the source, they came across a terrifying scene. A giant spectral bird was enjoying a monster in its mouth, making even Pablsag thirsty for a good hunt. Without delay, Changxian activates his viper eyes and draws his bow. Upon identifying 2 black spots on that beast's neck, he prepares 2 arrows. The tiger, submerged in adversities, considers them valuable enough to grant them a privilege. This even startles Changxian, surprised by the sudden reward. Then he starts to feel that all his senses became even sharper. Now you could see Jigwee's form in more detail. Apparently, Hyoju's powers seem more focused on enhancing a fighter's physical aspects. Pablsag has a meltdown, wanting to reward the protagonist with something above the tiger's level, giving him her own authority as a privilege. Poor girl, it seemed like she lost her mind for granting something so powerful to a human she barely knows. The divine ability was perfect aim, capable of reversing causality and always hitting the target no matter what. Then Changxian prepares an electrifying attack with his bow, firing 2 bolts of lightning that roared through the skies, illuminating the night with their flashes. The 2 projectiles were close to hitting their target. At the moment of impact, the enormous spectral creature writhes in pain, paralyzed by the electricity. Jiaol just watches with his mouth wide open. It was a battle far beyond his capabilities, and he merely transforms into another spectator in the background, as if watching his favorite action movie. Pablsag had offered him the best ability at that moment, covering the gaps that were missing in Changxian's arsenal. As he observes the wounded beast, the tiger's privileged beast sense activates in the protagonist. Now that his senses were sharpened, he quickly realized that Jigwee intended to flee. The tyrant follows the monster, running without a word. Gyeol breaks his serious facade, which he had kept until then, and starts running, trying to keep up with Changxian, and he was excited that they might actually defeat that creature the size of a mountain. However, the protagonist notices invaders approaching. 2 beams of light descend in front of the duo, and land with a destructive explosion, forcing both to stop their pursuit of Jigwee. It seems they were 2 bald examiners preventing rookies from entering a restricted area, and they weren't there to play around. The obstinate specter was still being bombarded even far from Changxian. The reason for this was the spear the protagonist had lodged into the beast during the arrow attack. Each strike was a critical hit, draining Jigwee's life even further. Realizing it was in a risky situation, the creature screams in desperation. Meanwhile, Changxian and his protege face the 2 examiners blocking their advance. One of the bald men intimidates them, saying they were entering a restricted area. Gyeol steps forward, arguing that they had been hunting that thing for 4 entire days. However, it was useless. Seeing that the 2 participants weren't backing down, the examiners activate their auras and warn them that they are authorized to use force. The Ghostborn witnesses an imminent and inevitable battle about to happen. Suddenly, one of Jigwee's wings opens, and it intended to flee, preparing for takeoff. Gyeol pushes his argument even further, realizing that he couldn't stall any longer. This time, the examiners draw their swords to prevent the duo's advance, even in the middle of that chaos of wind and debris. Then the enormous spectral bird rises into the skies, lifting its claws from the ground. The Ghostborn had a desperate expression as he watched his target fly away, but Changxian remained quiet and indifferent. Then he looks back, searching for his stalker from the library, and demands an explanation as to why people were interfering in his mission. The agreement was to clear the dungeon without any interruption from the tigers. However, Yujun simply disappears without giving him an answer. Changxian comes to the following conclusion. There was much more to this story that hadn't been told to him, and he still suspects there is some connection with the Pearl of Illusions collected from the monster's nest, assuming that the creature had gotten rid of someone who carried the secret of that dark sphere. So surely more agents were sent to destroy the object that might have been evidence. With all that in mind, he decides that he should investigate more deeply. Thus, Changxian asks the instructors if it's okay to move freely outside the restricted area. They confirm his question and ask him to leave, but Changxian smiles confidently, knowing he wouldn't even need to step into that protected place. Jigwee descends from the skies like a fallen bird. The 2 examiners are startled by the enormous spectral beast coming down on their heads. When the creature landed on the ground, the impact generated a dust explosion strong enough to shake the bald men to their cores. But the monster was still alive, thrashing and trying to run like a desperate chicken. At that moment, Changxian activates his soul collector, starting to suck in the spectral essences of that ghostly bird. Immediately afterward, he lights the embers of the 8 trigrams urn from inside his mouth. The fire spins in a whirlwind, sucking all the air toward it. With both authorities active, he begins feeding on Jigwee's spiritual flames. The process is happening quickly, as if a bonfire had come to life and started hunting for fuel itself. Let's go back a bit to the past. Changxian was near a carcass, assuming that Jigwee had offspring. It was strange for the beast to suddenly leave its nest and start eating with such ferocity. It would make sense if it were feeding a hatchling. The protagonist wanted to use this as part of his plan, since dealing with a monster of that caliber could be dangerous. But since he had nothing concrete in mind and his protege had a few ideas but wasn't sure if they would work, Changxian reflects that a mother would need to hunt nutritious food for her offspring. In this case, traps were needed in a location with better prey. Back to the present, the protagonist was still absorbing Jigwee's massive soul. The soul collector is an excellent authority to counter the spectral beast, which was made of malicious spirits. The flames of purgatory create a chain reaction, burning the specters of that beast in a domino effect. The monstrous bird tries to thrash free one more time. Gyeol could barely stay on his feet amidst the gusts of wind and fire generated by Jigwee's wing beats. At that point, he remembers a conversation with Changshan. The spectral beast was starving and attacking anything that served as food, preferring dead prey. So he plans to poison a corpse with freezing, paralyzing poison. Back to the present, Gyeol warns that Jigwee was no longer able to fight off the toxins in its body. Changshan smiles and says, all according to plan. He still remembers that the obstinate specter had the ability to consume souls and use them as fuel for its death flames. A truth that wasn't revealed to his protege was the fact that he hadn't absorbed the soul of his bait. When it was consumed by the spectral beast, it would become part of it, and when it tried to escape, Changshan would use the soul collector to keep it pinned to the ground. From there, he would burn the trapped spirits inside that bird, using the fire of the 8 trigrams urn, starting a fire within the creature. Then the protagonist would absorb Jigwee's ashes and its very flames. Unfortunately for that monster, the Tyrant had all the tools needed to be its natural predator. While absorbing the beast's energy, his stats increase and the embers of the 8 trigrams urn acquire the destruction element. His magical circuits also grow at an alarming rate. As his strength increases, his body tries to adapt to the new changes, modifying its limiters every minute. However, everything reaches the maximum attribute limit, and now his biology tries to seek a new transformation. Then an achievement is unlocked, He Who Devours the Sun. Receiving new points in his parameters related to magic and gaining additional magical circuits, the Soul Collector also levels up. But now is not the time to gloat over his build. Jigwee attempts one last, desperate attack before leaving this life. The examiners are the first to tremble in fear at the incoming threat. Changshan is delighted because this is a great opportunity to draw Yuchang from his inventory. The new destructive flames of the 8 trigrams urn burn away the shell that sealed that sword. As soon as the blade is engulfed in eternal flames, a transformation occurs and the fire awakens. With that, the requirements are unlocked and Changshan can finally use the divine artifact as if it were his own. In the midst of the destructive flames, the silhouette of the worthy sword forms like a light of hope in the middle of hell. One of the methods to hunt a being as powerful as Jigwee was to release the powerful sword Yuchang from its 2,000-year prison, and one of the requirements for this was an enormous amount of fire capable of destroying the world. Best of all, the blade was still alive and hungry for flames. However, there was still one more requirement to release it. Changshan grabs Tiamat's fang and presses it against the skin of his hand. The final requirement was blood. These are the 2 keys necessary to awaken Yuchang from its millennial slumber. The weapon had acquired the fire element after being near a divine brazier for many years and also gained the status of demonic for being wielded by many assassins. The flame awakens the blood forms. The necessary requirements to release the artifact were fulfilled. Since the keys came from Changshan, he was confident that his name would be engraved on the sword. Small cracks form on the surface of the weapon, like a butterfly trying to break free from its cocoon. Roar screams the protagonist as he releases the magical enchantment. The scream seems to have been the final trigger for the blade's transformation. Then a shell of centuries made of rust and oxidized blood shatters into countless shards of oblivion, revealing a beautiful short sword like the moon. It was a short jian, emanating a dark aura that seemed to be trying to say something. Suddenly, several skulls with crowns of kings are released from the blade, demanding to be freed and wielded. The protagonist prepares for a mental and spiritual attack. A storm of evil spirits surrounds Changshan, speaking random words and trying to invade his mind and body. The other 3 who were just watching couldn't see anything that was happening. From their perspective, the Tyrant was inside a macabre and violent tornado. The tormented souls of Yuchang approached Changshan more and more, touching him and whispering in his ears. With a serious and expressionless look, the protagonist orders them to be silent. With just one word, the spirits are dissipated like mist carried away by the wind, until they are completely eliminated from this world. Then his name is engraved in runes on the blade of the short sword, and he becomes one with his new weapon. Without hesitating for a second, he decides to test it immediately. With a swing in the air without using much effort, a blast of fire is released with each swing of the sword. The flames are launched like massive eruptions, of molten steel being released from the blade's tip. The slash reaches the obstinate specter, dealing double damage from a massive critical hit. Missing a part of its wing and with its life hanging by a thread, the creature tries to flee. Changshan was far from finishing the test of his new weapon. This time, he prepared a real strike. Unleashing a combination of 2 tiger attacks, a whirlwind of energy explodes from the protagonist's attack, striking the monster's back, incapacitating it even further. To finish his experiment, he activates the authority of the Black Mountain God. With a fierce and shadowy look, he savors his target and unleashes a gigantic wave of energy at the creature. Jigwee receives the blow and shatters into thousands of pieces. Its life energy scatters into the air, but a hand reaches out from within that glowing chaos, and Changshan begins to absorb Jigwee's ashes. Then the jewel from the right eye of the obstinate specter appears. It was a gem that granted the ability to observe various worlds, such as the human world and the spirit world. Since Yuchang fell into 2 categories of swords, long and short, the protagonist received mastery of both. It rose so high that he acquired Swordmaster Mastery. Then the weapon begins to emit a glow, and a window with a long explanation appears, telling the artifact's story. The secret mission of Uyazi is created. Basically, if Changshan wanted to fully unlock Yuchang's power, he would need to obtain the other 8 supreme swords. Suddenly, the blade's steel dissolves into pure energy. until the sword's form disappears. Then it begins to enter through the protagonist's palm and merges with his arm. This made Chang Xin's right hand become much stronger. The dagger, Taimat's Fang, reacts to Yu Chang's presence, shaking rapidly like a child throwing a tantrum. The protagonist finds this behavior strange, as it's the first time he's seen it do that. But that wasn't important now. His magic power jumped to 221, an impressive level up considering it was only 76. Unfortunately, the problems were not over yet. There were still other examiners remaining on the scene. The bald man with the tattoo couldn't believe that the goal of his mission would be stolen like this. They were tied down and couldn't just leave and end the day. Their mission was simple: hunt the Jigui and retrieve the pearl. But now neither of those objectives was an option. However, only one remains: defeat Chang Xian and steal the item from him. The other thinks this is madness. The guy just defeated the dungeon boss literally right in front of them. His ally argues that the protagonist and his friend are probably exhausted from the fight, so this was the best opportunity. The goal of the two bald men was simple: ask about the pearl, and if they didn't get an answer, take their lives. One of them feels sorry for having to break the executive director's favorite toy, but there's no other choice. However, a third group joins the game, even catching the attention of Chang Xian and his protege, the assassins from the High Hofs. The assassin team stares down the examiner team. The bald men ask how they got there. The one with the scar on his mouth replies that they slipped through the gaps in their flimsy defenses. Both members of the White Tigers were nervous about having to deal with so many problems at once. Those are the mace demon Yang Xinha, the serrated blade knife Park Ki-pyo, and the scarlet target Ba Wook-young. The examiner was having a terrible day, having to deal with the tyrant and now these three of all days. However, this only means one thing: that the rumors about the research facility had been leaked. Xinha starts swinging his spiked mace with a chain, revealing two spheres, spinning one above his head like a deadly helicopter. The examiner with a tattoo over his eyes sees this situation as unfavorable and decides to change tactics. So the duo of examiners decides to split up. One would call for reinforcements and the other would try to buy time. But Ki-pyo has other plans and intercepts the fleeing examiner and attacks him with his serrated weapon. The bald man is forced to stop and deal with the enemy in front of him. With a predator's gaze, the goateed man reveals that the game was only beginning. Some time passes and one of the maces makes its move. The weapon was chasing one of the bald men who was trying to flee. Seeing that there was no way to escape that weapon, he blocks it with his sword. But the strike was too powerful and shatters his blade into millions of sharp shards. Xinha was already preparing the next attack and strikes the examiner's shoulder. With an evil grin, the mace demon continued his combo. A spiked sphere quickly approaches the bald man's face, and he would never see another tomorrow. Seeing his victory come so easily, he laughs sadistically and belittles the strength of the White Tigers member. His ally warns him to avoid eliminating their sources of information, but Xinha reminds him that there's still the other one. The surviving examiner takes advantage of their argument and lunges forward with his sword. However, the scene shifts to our main duo, facing off against Wook-young. Gyeol was already showing signs of exhaustion and wanted to know what they wanted with them. The chubby man dodges the question and simply replies that he was there to take the air out of their lungs. Chang Xian flashes a smug smile and says he didn't intend to let that happen. His protege looks at him in surprise, wondering if this madman actually had a plan in mind. Then an aura bursts from Wook-young's eyes, resembling fiery red glasses preparing to attack. But the protagonist simply points upwards with his index finger. With a smile so arrogant it looked like a drill challenging the skies, he asks if they think they can dodge that. Xinha is the first to notice it. Ki-pyo and the examiner were the second, and Wook-young the last. Upon seeing the impossible coming from above, the untouchable spectral being appears with her unbreakable form behind Chang Xin. Who else could they think it was if not the female Jigui, worried about the disappearance of her partner? The other Jigui roars a scream of vengeance at her crawling enemies. As she flew above the men who were fighting, she unleashed a storm of fire blasts upon her enemies. The flaming rain falls like meteors on the ground, creating an explosive wildfire of hatred and resentment. The enormous bird hunted the survivors. The High Hof's team had no choice but to flee from that hell. Shika screamed in desperation to throw the meteor hammer in one direction and tear the scroll afterward. But the colossal monster was already upon them like a bird hunting worms on the ground. Suddenly, a huge explosion erupts in the area. Battle cries echoed through the skies as Chang Xian simply watched the chaos with his feet firmly on the ground. The protagonist explains to his protege that it was normal to assume the appearance of the female after her partner was put in danger. Once again, Gyeol is impressed by the cleverness of this guy he barely knew, and asks where he intended to go. Of course, the tyrant reveals that he wanted another eye jewel and was going for another kill. The Ghostborn warns him that he wasn't fully recovered. With the time that had passed, Chang Xian assures that his health was better than ever. Gyeol still insists that it was dangerous. Upon hearing that, the protagonist grabs the jewel from the defeated Jigui and says he has a way. Then he eats the gem as if it were candy. Chang Xian remembers once again the conversation with the second elder, who said he would need to digest the jewel as well. The strange old man taught him that he could change the fire attribute of the 8 trigrams earned depending on what he absorbs, and still gives him good news. Once he swallows the gem, he would be able to become a persistent specter on his own. As his form changed, Chang Xian's appearance became more and more like a phantasmal beast. Thus, he becomes a personification of the Jigui, with his physical attributes greatly enhanced. His face was wrapped in a purple spectral entity with sharp teeth resembling those of a beast. With his transformation complete, Chang Xian flaps his wings and flies into the skies. The fight against the other Jigui was still happening amidst chaos and terror. The protagonist approached quickly with his winged specter form, and with a face that could no longer be called human. Getting closer, we can already see the High-Hoffs trying to survive against the beast. And now they despair with the arrival of the second monster, Changxian. The protagonist activates one of the mountain god's claws, causing a massive explosion and releasing waves of dark energy. The dust of destruction begins to settle, and the only one standing unharmed is the tyrant. Xin Hao lay on the ground, fatally wounded by burns. Changxian activates his soul collector and absorbs the ashes of that wrongdoer, then looks to the side. The Jigui had also already fallen motionless. All that was left for Changxian was to take its soul. Another crystal reveals itself. The protagonist picks it up and immediately consumes it. His magic power increases, the eternal flames of the Trigram's urn grow stronger, and his control improves. The buffs gained are smaller compared to the first time he ate the jewel, so there is a limit to how many times he can do this. Another achievement is obtained, the one who hunted the Bikyo, allowing him to use spectral illusion, which increases the power of his Jigui transformation. Now that he defeated the kings of the Red Mountain Range, he assumes the rest of the participants and examiners must be in an uproar. But there were still some things left to do. Wookyoung was in a critical condition and would probably face a very slow end. He couldn't take it anymore and wanted it to be over quickly. Changxian offers him help with his death certificate if he answers some questions. Gyeol manages to catch up with his companion and starts to feel his heat as if he were close to a fireball, or the sun itself. After getting some answers, Changxian discovers that the High-Hoffs allied with the White Tigers to open the 7 Books of San. Wookyoung confirms it. The protagonist remembers that the clan serving Hyoju suddenly rose in power 13 or 14 years ago, but it was only 20 years ago that they managed to find one of the enigmatic Books of San. So far, they've only obtained 3. Soon after, Changxian tries to extract more information, wanting to know how all of this connects, but Wookyoung was already suffering too much. Then the protagonist promises that whether or not he ends this depends on the answer to his question. The chubby man cries but tries to continue. He explains that each book has unique content, each teaching how to use the power of the ancient constellations now forgotten. Upon hearing that, Changxian remembers the term forgotten stars. When light first emerged during the creation of the universe, there were only a few constellations. Even though they were weak at the beginning, each possessed a powerful divine force, leaving traces of their existence scattered across the cosmos and the world. But to think that their power could be invoked through a few books, it wouldn't be strange to think that Hyoju was doing this with some divine accomplice. Wookyoung continues, explaining that 2 books had already been deciphered, but something important was still missing. Changxian connects the dots and remembers Peter's key, which would be the fundamental piece to unlock the other books. Then he asks what their team came there for. It didn't seem like they were there just to cause terror or out of revenge. He reveals that they want to find the Pearl of Illusions. Now it made sense the protagonist White had such a bizarre aura. In the first book of Sam, it taught a way to create an unstoppable warrior. The method involves removing a person's soul and filling it with starlight, thus creating an obedient divine warrior. The Pearl of Illusion would be the key piece to make these soldiers, and the Crimson Mountain Range had the necessary ingredients to create it. This explains why this place is being used as a training institute. They could easily manufacture that sphere and use the bodies of promising recruits to create the slaves. Even if someone disappeared, they could blame the participants, saying they died due to negligence. The main cog behind all of this is probably the executive director, Oh Si-wan. But since Changxian sealed Bestla's tomb and managed to steal a key, the White Tiger's plans went down the drain. The protagonist assumes that the orb could be the spark for the world to discover the truth about the clan. Wookyoung confirms, but with much pain. Well, since he had already told everything he knew, Changxian decides to fulfill the promise using his dagger, and so the deal is sealed with a single stroke of the weapon. However, there was still an even better source of information. The examiner was still alive. Changxian smiles at the thought of finding out more directly from a member of the White Tigers. He approaches the bald man who was already on his last legs. Touching his forehead with a tone of superiority, the protagonist threatens him to spill what he knows. The examiner asks if he wasn't afraid of Hyoju's wrath. Changxian looks at him seriously and asks if that damned god really cared about lowly minions. Soon after, the deity in question already confirms what the protagonist said. He no longer cared about a failed follower. The tyrant looks to the skies, saying that Feline only wanted powerful and chaotic followers, and not a dying nobody. Something shattered into splinters of existence, as if the claws of an apocalyptic titan were tearing the flesh of the past and future, or just the pieces of clothing that Changxian was tearing off to undress his protege. Soon after, he orders him to sit in the lotus position. Yaewol asks if they are going to do that. The protagonist answers yes, they're going to do that. The Ghostborn's eyes shine with excitement for finally doing that. Both were sitting face to face. Healing the remnants of the curse would not be easy and would take some time, and he warns him it may take 1 or 2 hours for the treatment to finish, but in his perspective, it may last months. In other words, it is a difficult process. He also asks him not to give up halfway, otherwise he will enter the process of demonization. Yaewol understands that if he can endure the procedure, he will no longer be human. Changxian confirms his protege's premonition and gives him another warning. If the protagonist notices any sign that he has become a monster, he will get rid of him immediately. The tyrant would not want to see an out-of-control Xerxes wandering the world, causing an apocalyptic calamity. However, the Coastborn accepts his possible end with a serene and accepting expression. For the first time in this story, Chang Xian shows a more human face as he is surprised by such a gentle smile. It reminded him of his old friend and his indomitable will. Then he rolls up the sleeve of his right arm, activating his healing flames. With a swift movement, he throws them onto Gyaol's body as if it were sacred salt. The young man burns, enduring the pain. Even suffering from the heat, he tightens the determination in his heart not to give up. If someone were watching from afar, they would swear they were seeing a large-scale fire happening. But now let's dive a little deeper into the soul of this Coastborn. In a desolate, snow-covered setting, a male silhouette walks through the icy wind. Gyaol wonders where he is. Then he sees something familiar in the distance. A lone boy dragging his feet through the dense, cold layer tries to withstand the blizzard by himself. That boy was Gyaol himself. Unable to endure the cold and the desolate feeling of the white snow anymore, he collapses to the ground. Someone runs to rescue him and takes him to a safe place. The Ghostborn realizes he was inside his own mind and was reliving a time he never wanted to remember but could never forget. As soon as he finally found a warm place to stay, he was quickly kicked out by someone else and called a monster because of his wounds. Desperate for food, he opened trash cans trying to find anything edible to sustain himself. On the days he tried to sleep, he attempted to warm himself with pieces of cardboard he found, but there was always someone tormenting him. People would come and kick him out, forcing him to curl up in a fetal position to try to protect himself. Then he began to think that if he hadn't been saved in that blizzard, he would never have had to relive these memories, nor feel lonely again. Suddenly, a voice with a dark tone calls out to him. The silhouette resembled Gyaol and said it had been waiting for him. It extends its hand, warning that the winter will get worse, and invites him to leave that place. The Ghostborn was tired of being alone, having no one to talk to, isolated from human tenderness. That hand formed by shadows seemed to offer a warmth he had never felt before, an escape from all the coldness of this desolate world. Gyaol slowly approached, having a silent dialogue with himself, saying it was okay to let everything go. But was this the path he should follow? No, maybe it wasn't. Don't lose your way inside your mind. Don't give up. The shadow asks what was wrong, but Gyaol's indomitable human spirit knew this was not the path he should take. Meanwhile, Chang Xian remained on guard for any sign of the rebirth of a new uncontrollable Xerxes, but he feels relieved to see that the most critical moment had passed. Gyaol's heart remained determined and refused to leave. Now the only thing left was to wait. Then Chang Xian activates his stealth room and creates a barrier around the Ghostborn. No one else would be able to observe that place. Now would be a good time for the protagonist to pay a visit to the research facility. But first, he intends to hunt some rats that have been following him since the library and activates the beast's sense, and starts hunting Song Yujun. Leaves scatter quickly as if kicked by hurried footsteps. A trail of energy resembling the wind rushed through the scarlet forest. It was Song Yujun, intending to reveal the truth about Chang Xian as quickly as possible. He took advantage of the protagonist treating Gyaol to make his sneaky escape. But none of that worked. The tyrant was already catching up. The stalker looks up and sees his hunter following his sprint. Chang Xian was licking his lips, thinking of various ways to catch that stalker cockroach. A shockwave of golden energy explodes as the protagonist lands. Yujun is lying on the ground in a position of pure defeat, but he manages to recover and face his opponent. Seeing that, Chang Xian seemed to like what he saw. The desperate stalker draws his sword from his inventory, intending to fight. But before he could unsheath his blade, the Tiamat Fang had already made its strike. The protagonist shoves him and pins him to the trunk of a tree. That charge was so powerful, it could be said Yujun was embedded into the wood. Savoring the scene, Chang Xian shows an ironic happiness at finally catching that cockroach. Then the protagonist reveals he was planning to squash the insect with a slipper, but changes his mind since that would only alert the executive director. Yujun doesn't quite understand the situation, anxious about what he will do. Here's the good part: there was an easier method to make a snitch behave properly. The stalker had to swallow that pearl as if it were a rotten egg. Silence falls over the two. Not even the red forest dared to make a sound, no leaf even considered falling. Yujun, or what was once Yujun, falls to his knees as if losing his ego, and all that remained was an empty shell. Chang Xian orders him to stand up. Slowly, the body rises. Chang Xian closely watches the effects of the Pearl of Illusion, wanting to verify if it left the vessel empty or fully possessed the soul. Either way, some experiments needed to be done. The protagonist gives commands as if ordering a dog. Yujun obeys all orders like a good boy. But that wasn't enough. Chang Xian wanted to be sure he wasn't pretending, so he orders him to put an end to everything. Obeying the command, he places a hand on his throat and begins to activate his mana. Seeing that the pearl had effectively done its job, he calls off the act. The protagonist approaches and looks into his eyes, impressed with the teachings of the first book and curious about the contents of the others. Then he orders him to inform O Siwan that Chang Xian was showing no suspicious movements and to act like nothing had happened. To check that everything was clear, he asks if he understood the commands. The body confirms that it understood everything. Clapping his hands as if closing a hypnosis show, the protagonist tells him to leave. With life returning to his eyes, Yujun thanks him and activates his skill, preparing to depart. Suddenly, Chang Xian tells him to wait. The body obeys and asks if there were more orders to follow. Finding that power interesting and seeing its usefulness, he decides that he wants to learn it and teach it to Gyaeol. Yujun explains that the skill is called Chasing Winds of the Flying Tiger, a variation of Tiger Steps. Since they didn't have a scroll, he informs his master that the learning process might take a little while. Chang Xian replies that he will be able to learn somehow. Then his body starts moving in countless steps with his magical wind. The protagonist watches the movements attentively. However, something catches Yujun's attention. Chang Xian was already able to use the winds of the tiger. Noticing that his servant had stopped, he orders him to repeat. The repetitions continue for a while until a window announced that he had acquired a new skill, the Flying Tiger Pursuit. Seeing his master's ability to learn, Yujun lowers his head in admiration. The protagonist orders him to leave immediately. With a flash, Yujun disappears from the scene while shouting yes. Due to his rapid training to learn a variation of the Tiger Steps, Chang Xian's level rises, and he thus learns to use Qinggong. In addition, he also acquires stealth and concealment. With everything ready, he jumps very high to test his new movement skill. From afar, the protagonist was gliding near the clouds with lightness, like a leaf carried by the wind. Among the mountain ranges, a living gust of wind was moving. Chang Xian arrives at the desired place with his variation of the Tiger Steps. He was looking for the egg that the Jigwiz lay every century. After a while, he finally finds a giant nest with pink flames in the center. This fire was emitted by the egg of the obstinate specter itself. Getting closer, Chang Xian reveals that these spectral birds had 3 forms, but originally, they were just spiritual beings without bodies. They only took the form of birds because of their ancestors, but they could take any shape depending on the environment. But the protagonist's plans were on a different level. It was possible to tame Jigwiz and use them as familiars. With that in mind, he prepares to store that item within himself. As the little bird was heading toward Chang Xian's pouch, Hyuju shows curiosity about how he would hatch the egg. The deity thinks about what form the Jigwiz should take. Birds are clumsy, so he suggests a tiger. The protagonist finishes the procedure of storing the hatchling. Sag suddenly appears, opposing the tiger submerged in adversities, advising animals that assist hunters. From there, the two gods start arguing like two old ladies fighting over discounted non-stick pans. Well, that fight doesn't matter. The most important thing was the growth of the hatchling inside his womb. Finishing his business with the obstinate specters, it's time to go to the research center. Thus, Chang Xian leaps like the wind, disappearing from sight. Changing locations on a mountain covered with red vegetation, there was a suspicious hangar in the middle of it. In a room full of capsules the size of an adult person, they were aligned in several rows. Someone was asking about the executive director. Then, a tall man wearing glasses and dressed as a scientist slams the table, shouting curses into the air. He was recalling his achievements in creating various weapons, artifacts, and divine authorities with his 5th-rate skills, only for the White Tigers to later send the inspection department after him. He begins to suspect that this was retaliation for diverting some resources for his own benefit. Since then, he had been trying to contact the executive director for help, but was always ordered to wait. Suddenly, he shouts into the air, cursing Siwon for belittling his efforts, scaring the other subordinates. Soon after, he orders them to delete any documents that could raise suspicions about the research center. Realizing he needed a backup plan, he begins planning to use Project Yodel to gain influence in other associations. He would have to move to a group with the same strength as the White Tigers, and that turns a blind eye to his research, such as Osung. Thinking about this, he feels somewhat relieved. The Black Shantra clan is an industrial conglomerate. It was quite possible for him to get rich working for them. Then he looks at the capsule room, wanting to have a good hand for his escape game. He was also interested in 2 participants from this year, Ghostborn Gaian-ol and the super rookie Chang Xian. He wanted to meet those 2 and use them in his experiments. Looking at a body, he feels satisfied at least having someone incredible readily available for the problems that were coming. Then he remembers something. The men he sent to retrieve the Pearl of Illusion had not yet returned. He then orders someone to search for them quickly. Somewhere else, in a forest within the Crimson Mountain ranges, something was moving among the red leaves. Chang Xian was making his move while listening to the endless quarrel between Sag and Hyuju. The prolonged exposure to that chatter drained his strength, and he longed for a silence that never came. Then he arrives at a place full of muddy flowers. Sensing a strange air, it seems he had arrived at the right place. The research center of the White Tigers. Chang Xian observes the hangar that leads to the laboratory. He activates the Flying Tiger Wind to use in stealth mode. Now that the windstorm covered his body and the sound around him was silenced, he heads towards the research center. He passes by 2 guards protecting the entrance. One of them notices a strange breeze passing between them. Both start arguing about whether someone had really infiltrated the facility, but they shrug it off, thinking they're just too stressed because of the inspection department. As he advanced through the research center, Chang Xian used his sharp tiger skills to avoid the traps. Then he combined his Viper's Eye with the Tiger's Wind to ease his passage. Jormungand rejoices as he watches the protagonist using his privileges. But there was something strange happening in that place. The guards were rushing around for some reason. He then sharpens his senses using Beast Sense. After hearing several worried discussions, what caught his attention the most was the conversation involving the Pearl of Illusion. Chang Xian keeps listening to that conversation, focusing even more. Then he discovers where the discussion about the jewels was coming from. Moving so quickly that he looked like a flash of lightning, he swiftly slips between the hurried guards, heading toward the facility that produced those ghostly spheres. Upon entering the room, the door closes with a dry metallic sound as if locking itself. The first thing he felt upon entering that place was the poisonous air from the flowers. As he dodges the desperate men, a window pops up warning that Ho 1000 has started observing him. His authority, immunity to 10 poisons, activates, nullifying the effect of the flowers. After a few steps, he arrives at a locked door that would require an approved ID to open. On it, there was a panel with numbers and elaborate drawings. He'd rather have to guess the password or solve the puzzle to unlock it. Chang Xian scratches his chin and thinks for a moment. He couldn't break the door down and cause a commotion, so he had to figure out the keyword. Then he remembers that he still carries Peter's key on his necklace. He touches it and notices that the object is having a strange reaction, but he doesn't want to use it to avoid attracting Hyuju's attention. However, maybe he can find a way. Chang Xian places his hand on the number panel. The door opens automatically as if it recognizes an ID, startling the protagonist. He wonders what the hell this item is to be able to use something like that so easily. Upon entering the room, the tiger and the serpent have a friendly conversation, expressing their admiration for the protagonist. Chang Xian feels a bit awkward hearing himself called a coral snake and finds it strange that Hyuju didn't notice the key. However, a sight appears before his steps. With a gaze that hid deep revolt, he discovers the victims. 1, 2. No! Many people captured and locked inside capsules to be used as divine warriors. That scene, along with the laughter of his archenemy, only made Chang Xian feel like vomiting. Minerva intervenes and shows her dissatisfaction with the dark acts of the divine feline and confronts him. Then the goddess offers him a quest, promising to bless him. Hearing this, Chang Xian's eyes shine with hesitation. He didn't expect the goddess of justice to create a quest like that just because of a grudge. Regardless, receiving a blessing from Minerva meant there was a possibility of gaining a new authority. However, the protagonist was in serious trouble. Accepting or refusing would mean becoming the enemy of one of the two gods. Trying to come up with a decision that satisfies both at the same time is an Olympic-level headache. His finger itched to press the decline button. However, it seems he managed to come up with something. A very good plan with plenty of profit. So he asked a question to the tiger submerged in adversities. Looking up as if staring directly into the tiger's eyes, Chang Xian makes his request. The feline accepts the request. Upon hearing this, the protagonist asks if the god already knew about his plans in that place. Hyuju reveals that yes, he knew, but he also knew that wasn't the real question to be asked. Then the tyrant asks if he could take everything. Then he explains that if he can't have something, then no one else can. Therefore, he wants to know the Calamity Tiger's opinion on this. Even with such a presumptuous request, Chang Xian knows they won't give up on him so easily. Upon hearing that, the tiger becomes delighted and offers him the tiger's pillage quest. The protagonist is satisfied with this. After receiving the quest, he waits for Minerva's reaction. She responds that she was certain of the tyrant's decision. Chang Xian presses accept on both quests. By doing so, he must destroy the factory and also loot everything he sees. Now that he wasted quite some time negotiating, there was still a next step. Turning off his stealth, the guards quickly spot him. Suddenly, the protagonist unleashes the apocalypse flames from the 8 trigrams urn, burning everything in the facility. Then he equips the Jigui vessel and absorbs the fire onto his back, creating flaming wings. At that moment, he sends a hellish gust of wind toward his enemies. The guards recognize that this power belongs to the obstinate specter and question what it's doing inside the facility. Chang Xian smiles sadistically at them and charges forward with a beastly rush, unleashing an infernal storm. The attack hits both men, and they are turned to ashes instantly. Then the mountain housing the hangar is pulverized in a golden explosion. Voices scream in despair, warning about fires everywhere. The sound of people arguing is interrupted by another blazing explosion. Victims are claimed amid this chaos. The men give up trying to contain the fire using conventional methods. Then they try to resort to freezing magic to hold back the flames. But it's not enough, and the ice barrier shatters from the intense heat. The large scientist with glasses watches the chaos outside, and he doesn't understand what is happening to the research center. So he assumes that those responsible are the men assigned to burn the files. But before he can get a solid answer, an explosion erupts near him, throwing him far away. He survives and immediately asks one of his subordinates how many men they still have. Without getting a clear answer, he demands they respond immediately. Meanwhile, inside the research center, all that could be seen was destruction and chaos in every direction, though some guards had survived. However, hope is ripped from them the moment they are poisoned by fire venom. Already feeling the effects spreading across their skin, despair begins to take over, but there was nowhere left to run. The ghostly fire spreads even further, moving like a living being desiring chaos in the world. Men's screams echo throughout the fire, feeding the embers of fear and chaos. But a man jumps through the flames as if burn wounds don't matter. A metallic clash resonates in the middle of the inferno. Chang Xian is defending himself against a massive sword. The scientist looks at him and asks if he is an agent sent by the High Hoffs and how the hell he is using Jigwa powers. soldiers. The protagonist starts dispelling his flames and his face is revealed to those villains. Now everyone recognizes Li Changxian. Many in the research center couldn't believe that Li Changxian had invaded their hideout. The laboratory director doesn't understand how someone who should be far away from that place is standing right before his eyes. But this was a great opportunity. His body would create an extremely powerful divine warrior. And then within just 5 years, he would build a clan as strong as the White Tigers. Suddenly, the protagonist begins to reactivate the tiger's wind. But the research director didn't want to let this chance to get rich slip away and launches a flying energy slash. Changxian sees the attack coming with a look of surprise, forcing him to deactivate his stealth skill and dodge the strike. The golden projectile hits part of the scenery, causing an explosion. The research director takes advantage of the protagonist's unfavorable position and tries to strike him with the sword, but is blocked. Feeling the weight of the blow, Changxian realizes something very serious about this fight. This man is a divine warrior. While deflecting his opponent's attacks, the protagonist wonders if the other executives of the White Tigers went through the same process. But fighting people cursed by the Pearl of Illusion isn't a bad thing. It's actually an opportunity for experiments. Seeing that he has a certain disadvantage in attributes, he adds more points to his strength parameter and prepares an attack. Closing in on his enemy's attack range, he adds more points to his dexterity and delivers several thrusts aimed at the director's vital points, but all of them are blocked. The scientist retreats, creating good distance between them. Feeling the pressure from him, he can't believe this demon is just a rookie. Changxian gets into a guard stance. The way he positions his hands casts a demonic shadow over his face. The research director gathers ghost energy into his sword, empowering the tiger's death. The fight reaches a new level, forcing the protagonist to increase his concentration. Swinging a massive sword, energy slashes are launched frantically. Each blast of that attack carries overwhelming force, creating a terrible explosion. Changxian escapes to a more advantageous position. During his movement, the soldiers pursue him. They have the same black eyes as the research director. The protagonist starts to worry about having to deal with so many divine warriors at once. Seeing that he was about to be surrounded, he creates a venomous fire barrier to hold off his enemies. The flames envelop Changxian's body in a flaming cage, protecting him against the advancing enemies. Unfortunately, it wasn't strong enough and is easily pierced by several swords, shattering the protection like a glass screen. The protagonist realizes he'll be in serious trouble if he continues fighting at this pace. He changes his tactics and activates the Tiger's Wind to use Qinggong and escape the Divine Warrior's encirclement. While fleeing, he activates Unshakable Heart and Serene Spirit to stay calm and formulate a plan. Reaching a narrow corridor, Changxian stops and waits for his attackers. One of the soldiers shouts in excitement for finally cornering the rat. The protagonist's gaze seemed to be waiting for the perfect opportunity. Seeing that, the research director realizes what he is planning. It was the Thermopylae Gate strategy. By fighting in a tight space, one man can defeat several soldiers lined up in a narrow area. The scientist tries to warn his soldiers to retreat, but it's too late. He's already witnessing the scene of a butcher at slaughter. Changxian draws several lines in the air with his whip. The threads become razor sharp, and with his new authority, perfect aim, they advance, cutting through his enemies. As pieces of flesh are separated, Pabelsa jumps like a little girl watching her idol use her gift. But a massive hand like a tree trunk suddenly appears in the middle of that red rain and grabs him by the neck, lifting him as if pulling a weed. The research director had finally caught him. He reveals that his numbers were far superior to the protagonist's, ordering him to surrender. But Changxian warns him that capturing him won't be enough to stop him. Not understanding, the scientist wonders what the rookie meant by that. Several magical symbols run across the protagonist's arm, tearing his sleeve in the process. The tip of a sword starts emerging from his palm. As this happens, Tiamat's fang also reacts. Suddenly, Changxian lets out a howl. Equipping 2 swords in his hands with energy being released from his body, something was about to happen. The first divine blacksmith, Ao Yezi, gained a huge reputation for producing some masterpieces. In contrast, the demonic blacksmith Todi created various high-quality products to establish his long-standing reputation. Both were excellent craftsmen who could never confront each other due to their circumstances, but now their masterpieces stand side by side. Tiamat's fang glows, wanting to show its true worth, unlocking a seal. The sparks of energy released from the blade force the research director to retreat. He feels a terrible premonition coming from that dagger. Then the weapon emerges from its chrysalis and transforms into an imposing Dao. Just like Yu Chang, the fang of the demonic dragon was both a sword and a dagger in one blade, also possessing divine status with immeasurable damage. Now these 2 legendary weapons were in Changxian's hands. The protagonist crosses them, creating a resonance of twin swords. The skill's sword mastery is activated. He takes a deep breath, gathering focus, and he is ready. The blades release so much power that they electrify the air around them. Changxian adopts a fighting stance reminiscent of a true sword master, leaving the gods in awe of his martial accomplishment. The research director looks at it, perplexed, already trembling as he feels such overwhelming power being unleashed all at once. With his teeth chattering in fear, he knew this would not end happily for him. The protagonist's fists ignite, awakening the dragon and demon slumbering within his blades, launching ruby flames of a furious phoenix, tearing the air from the chest that defies it. The research director raises his sword and hides behind a small steel wall. He manages to endure the first blast, but even so, this spirit hadn't recovered from the moral damage. Then Chang Xian notices something wrong with Yu Cheng. The weapon screams, saying this still isn't enough. Then he notices a reaction from Tai Mat's Fang, telling him to watch what it can do. Chang Xian complies with the request of his allies, generating another flaming strike, but this time on a large scale. The director prepares to take that massive attack. He manages to block the infernal flames, but it was too much for his weapon to handle, shattering it into thousands of pieces. Now he realizes that to survive, he must flee. Meanwhile, the two divine swords argued with each other, disputing which was stronger in a typical shonen rival fight. The director flees as fast as he can, as far away from the protagonist as possible. But the tyrant didn't want to let things end like this, so he crosses the two blades in front of him, and activates his authority at the claw of the mountain god to launch a black slashing attack. The blast of dark energy chases its victim. In an ancestral breath of the night, the energy blast pursues him like a ghost thirsty for souls. The director feels the chill of the Reaper's shadow on his spine, breathing a dark whisper into his ears. Black flames erupt in an inverted infernal vortex, swallowing everything, even the very fate of those hit. The dust settles, leaving only debris and smoke in sight. A dying hand emerges from the rubble. The director crawls, trying to grab hold of and escape from that despair. Chang Xian follows him slowly, like the personification of death, waiting for the right moment to take his soul. But he is impressed to see him moving so desperately towards somewhere. Out of curiosity, he continues following him without delivering the final blow. The hand stops moving, and a window announces the departure of the player Yes Sangwon from this world. The body and Chang Xian are near a closed door. Sheathing Yu Cheng back into his arm, he can't believe the man died just a few centimeters away from opening the next room. Repeating the same method he used on the previous lock, he tries to open it with the help of Peter's key. The protagonist touches the panel controlling the door. After a certain moment, it unlocks on its own. Apparently, this key has the power to open any kind of lock. Upon entering the room, he encounters a futuristic scene. A person was resting on top of a huge robotic platform, connected by countless wires. In her hands, and all over her body, cables were connected to her skin. Chang Xian jumps onto the platform. Upon getting there, he notices someone very familiar. At first, he couldn't remember her name. Ah, of course, the drooling girl. Shin Unso was her name. Then he grabs the girl's hand, analyzing it to check if there was anything abnormal. Ho 1000 stands on guard. She hadn't been turned into a divine warrior, but there was something different about her. Chang Xian thinks for a moment. Demonic beasts, legless ghouls, and jigwis. Thinking about these things, he discovers what executive director Siwon wanted to hide. The divine warriors were merely a prototype to create a being called Gildal. That was the name of the king of the Dakebi goblins from an old folk tale. Activating his beast senses, he learns that the effect of Ho 1000 was at 41%. Even at nearly half completion, the girl's body had enhanced far beyond normal. Chang Xian is relieved that her mind hadn't been attacked yet. Hivaju shows curiosity about the protagonist's next step, while Minerva asks her hero to save the girl. The tyrant decides to save her, interrupting the transformation process into an abomination. Then he opens his mouth, activates the 8 trigrams urn, and releases the apocalypse flames. By doing this, he tries to cleanse the Ho 1000 infection, but the calamity resists and tries to fight back. The battle between the flames and the toxins is grueling. Chang Xian wanted to purge the girl of any guildalification process while keeping only the beneficial effects. Just like what happened with Gaio, the treatment would depend on the girl's will. Hyoju is dissatisfied with what he sees and demands an explanation about this greedy will to take everything he desires. The protagonist says he wouldn't leave empty-handed. Raising both arms, he activates the Soul Collector authority to absorb the ashes of the lives he had taken in the last 24 hours. Sangwon's body begins to integrate, along with the fallen soldiers. Countless ashes move in gigantic dark tentacles responding to the call. The remnants of his enemies reach him and fuse into his being. Ho 1000 is also being absorbed. As Chang Xian gains more power, the tiger submerged in adversities laughs for some reason. The protagonist calls Hyoju crazy for laughing at a situation like this. Then he remembers when he invaded and searched for the source of the pearls, and how the soldiers were desperately commenting about the arrival of the inspection department. Then he starts connecting the dots. If director Kwon Hyo-ho was coming to inspect the place, and Oh Siwon wanted to get rid of this dungeon, something bad was about to happen at that very moment. Chang Xian quickly activates his Jigwit power and picks up the unconscious girl in his arms. Then he jumps as high as he can, trying to leave that place as quickly as possible. The surviving soldiers watch the research center being destroyed from the outside. Suddenly, something glows beneath their feet, and the ground starts to collapse. Those men don't understand what was happening, but before they could realize their situation, the entire mountain explodes. Meanwhile, Chang Xian is already flying far away from the scene. Someone was watching the mountain where the research center was burned from a distance. This was the third-ranked member of the White Tigers, the Fang of the veteran tiger's skin, Kwon Yo-ha. Then 2 people arrive behind him. Seeing his subordinates, he asks if they found out what happened. A group of men in suits and dark sunglasses reports that there were several explosives in the underground. Several traces of incendiary magical artifacts and explosives were discovered. Yoda concludes it was a planned destruction. They also report that the origin of the fire was caused by the spectral fire of a Jigwi. The inspection director looks at all of this with great suspicion. It seemed like a trap set to eliminate him, but it was triggered earlier than expected. This means there was a variable in the plan that not even Director Oh had foreseen. He then orders his men to continue inspecting and withdraws from the area, but he stops in his tracks and looks back, warning that there was a rat leaking information. His subordinates are surprised by the revelation. Immediately afterward, they lower their heads and promise to deal with the pest quickly. Boindo appears, asking if he wants to log out. Yoda asks his patron god for a hint, but the tiger just laughs at the adversities around him. Seeing there's no other way, he prepares to exit, and decides to get rid of Director O in a more direct way, thus satisfying Hyoju. Meanwhile, somewhere else in the Crimson Mountain Range, Gyaol was still undergoing his treatment. Then he slowly opens his eyes to see a very familiar silhouette illuminated by the morning sun carrying someone in his arms. Changxian smiles upon seeing his protege doing well. Gyaol notices a new presence among them and asks if it's Changxian's wife. The ex-Coastborn is answered with a mirror in his face. Since he was already speaking nonsense, the protagonist tells him to look at his own reflection. Gyaol quickly grabs the mirror to see his own face. No marks, no scars, no burns were left on his skin. He was paralyzed by his own transformation. There was no more pain nor shame in himself. He was completely cured of his curse. Changxian congratulates him on his effort, saying he did well to endure until now. Hearing those words, one of the few kind words he had ever heard in his life, the protege sheds a tear of happiness. Suddenly, the girl starts waking up. The tyrant looks at her, asking if it wasn't about time to get up. Without saying anything, she just looks at her savior and recognizes him. With a bunny-like hop, she jumps out of Changxian's arms and lies down again in her underwear on the hard ground made of sharp rocks. Unsiu thought she was still dreaming, so she lay down again. The pair of idiots look at each other, silently calling the girl an airhead. After a few explanations, Changxian is relieved that she didn't retain any memories of being abducted. But she really wanted to know if she was drooling while sleeping, insisting so much on the question that the tyrant started doubting her mental stability. Unsiu is relieved that she didn't make a weird face in front of her idol. Anyway, now that everyone was in good health, they needed to leave that place. But of course, the girl still had important questions, like Changxian's blood type. Answering that silly question, which sounded like it came from a horoscope magazine, he says it's B. Then the questionnaire went on to his favorite food and date of birth. Irritated, he asks why it feels like he's a defendant in a soap opera courtroom. With a suspicious look, Unsiu starts precisely reciting the details of an interview the tyrant did 2 years ago. Changxian looks at her like someone tired of stalkers in his life. The girl wanted to know if her dedication was perfect. Then she gets mad because her idol was a proud jerk and not a knight riding a white horse. The protagonist was seriously regretting having saved her, but the girl suddenly changes her mind and starts believing again that he was the tyrant, although she still finds it strange that his favorite food changed. Gyaol approaches and asks what made her change her mind so quickly. Unsiu immediately reveals the game, saying it was the face. The face of someone who wanted to abandon her in that dangerous place. Changxian hears this and regrets having ever met her. The energetic girl wastes no time and takes the lead of the group even without knowing where to go. The protagonist gives a slight, sincere smile. She was a bit annoying, but he liked her honest way. As the trio walked into a new day, the tyrant had to keep listening to his stalker gods chattering, thinking it was a burden. Someone was moving quickly in the forest. It was Shin Jung-yu searching for his sister. Suddenly, several men jump on him, ordering him to stop. They warn him that this was their hunting ground, and if he trespassed, there would be retaliation. Hyun-seo's twin begs them to let him pass. I'm Johan, leader of the Lords of Lim, steps forward and begins explaining this situation. With a smile, he says that from this point on, it's a dangerous area and promises to search for his sister in his place. Inside, he was irritated to have to deal with intruders in his hunting ground, and by the meteoric rise of Changxian in the dungeon rankings. Wanting to gain points as quickly as possible, he turns around and apologizes for not letting him do what he wanted. With a snobbish mentality inside his mind, Johan calls the twin an inexperienced fool. Jung-yu doesn't buy that nonsense and quickly moves ahead of the arrogant guy. No longer able to contain his anger, veins pop out on the face of the Lords of Lin leader. Seeing someone invading the area he had set aside specifically to level up his ranking ignited a fury inside him. He even tries to show his polite and cordial side, but it's no use. The rage had already taken over his fragile ego. Then he charges forward, drawing his sword. Jung-ju notices the self-proclaimed king approaching, but a girl suddenly appears, jumping onto them, calling Johan a half-chewed dried squid spat into the mud. She lands right between the two of them. The Lords of Lin leader recoils from that unexpected event, screaming out gourmet sins. And so Shin Unseo makes her explosive entrance, protecting her twin brother. Even more irritated by something, Johan asks what she just said. She simply wanted to protect her relative. No, he wanted to know what the girl said after that. With a mischievous smile, Unseo understands exactly what that mollusk meant. Immediately afterward, she jabs the poor man with a barrage of maritime insults, each word like a 2-meter-long needle piercing his emotional pressure points. Unable to take it anymore, with the face of someone who'll never leave the house again and after such psychological suffering, he says he feels offended. The girl tells him to screw off and ties her hair back, then asks what they wanted with her brother. Obviously, they wanted to use their fists for a very polite conversation. Yeon-seo doesn't like that talk much, thinking it's kind of cowardly to call so many people for a solo chat. Then she activates her tiger aura to join the discussion with some good arguments. Gyaol and Changxian watch that violent debate from afar. The ex-Ghostborn considers helping her, but the protagonist tells him to wait. He wanted to observe better what the girl could do with her new power. Apparently, Yunseo dominated them so easily that it felt natural for her, not even realizing the changes in her own body. Besides, he also wanted to learn more about Gildal and its side effects. Then shards of steel break as swords clash against something metallic. The Lords of Limb group couldn't understand how something so massive and solid appeared out of nowhere. They were talking about a tower shield with an intimidating face sculpted on its front. This was Unseo's equipment, which roared as she charged forward with her giant piece of iron. Then she activates the tiger steps, increasing the power of her charge. That metallic door, which looked more like a wall of terror, was now approaching rapidly. The men only had time to watch it come closer and are brutally hit. The impact was so strong it sent them flying far away. So the video ends here. If you don't want to miss the next part, activate the notification bell, and see you next time on Tob's channel.